Playing with Power MTG. Powerful cards, powerful formats. Do you have extra cards lying around that you don't use? Want to buy or trade for some extra cards but don't know how to maximize the value? Then you should try out today's sponsor, Card Conduit. Card Conduit is the best service when it comes to selling your extra cards. Don't waste hours trying to find the best buy list price for your cards online. Simply send them to Card Conduit and let them take care of the rest. I have used Card Conduit multiple times already. I always use them to get the best value for my extra cards. I get fair prices for my cards and they save me tons of time. They have three main services. Their standard service lets you send them your unsorted cards of any value. They will sort, grade, and give you the best price for your cards. Their curated service is similar. Send them your unsorted cards worth over $1 in value. They will charge half the fee of the standard service and charge no fee per card. Their sorted service is a great value as well. Choose cards in advance with their selection tool, send them sorted to Card Conduit, and they will grade and buy list them automatically. Save yourself the time of having to send to multiple sites and let Card Conduit do it instead. Their fee is only 2% with no fee per card. They give you the best price for your cards. They work with competitive buy listing partners, including ones not open to the public. Users get an average of 19% more for their collection than they would from any major retail buy list, even with Card Conduit's fees. Card Conduit also optimizes buy listing for card condition as well. Since vendors have different penalties for wear and tear, Card Conduit will find the best buy list priced against the specific condition of the card. So give Card Conduit a try today. If you sign up with my link in the description below or use the promo code POWER, you will also get 10% off of their fees when you use their service. A big thanks to Card Conduit for sponsoring today's video. Welcome to the definitive CEDH compilation of Kinnan Prodigy. Kinnan's ability to generate mana is unmatched. This mana-munching menace has the ability to go over the top of the table with some of the game's most powerful creatures. Whether it's going infinite with Hullbreaker Horror and Tidespout Tyrant, or simply putting your mana into Kinnan himself to add a surprise Void Winnower to the game, Kinnan always brings the heat. Zach had the best Sunburn Tattoo and gets to start us off. Zach draws a card for turn and plays a Volcanic Island. He casts a turn 1 Mystic Remora. The table sighs, and Zach passes the turn. Jay draws and plays a forest. He casts a Mana Crypt. Remora triggers and Zach draws. He casts his commander, Yisan the Wanderer Bard. Jay passes. Travis draws and plays a Misty Rainforest. He cracks it, pays a life, and fetches up a tropical island onto the battlefield. He casts a Mana Crypt as well. Remora triggers and Zach draws. Travis casts a Rhystic Study and Zach draws from Remora. With two draw engines now on the battlefield, the table straps in and the turn moves to Kevin. Kevin draws and suggests everyone make a fish pack to ensure the draw engines do not get out of hand. The table agrees and Kevin plays a Wooded Foothills. He passes. During his upkeep, Zach pays to keep his Remora. He draws, misses his land drop, and passes, discarding to hand size. During his upkeep, Jay loses his Mana Crypt roll and takes 3 damage. He draws and plays a forest. He ends his turn. During his upkeep, Travis loses his Mana Crypt roll and takes 3 damage. He draws and casts his commander, Rograk, son of Roga. He ships the turn to Kevin. Kevin draws, plays a forest, and passes. During his upkeep, Zach lets his Remora die. He draws and casts a Gamble. Rhystic triggers and, in response, Jay activates Yisan for 1, fetching up an Allosaurus Shepherd onto the battlefield. Then Travis draws from Rhystic and Gamble resolves. Zach fetches up a card into his hand and then randomly discards a Cabal Ritual. He plays a Badlands and passes the turn. During his upkeep, Jay loses his Mana Crypt roll and takes 3 damage. He draws and plays a forest. He casts Manglehorn, paying the Rhystic tax. It enters and destroys Travis's Mana Crypt. He moves to combat and attacks Zach with Yisan and Allosaurus Shepherd. Zach takes it and Jay gives the turn to Travis. Travis draws and pays 2 life to cast Gitaxian Probe, targeting Kevin. He looks at Kevin's hand and draws a card. He casts a Soul Ring. He casts a Lotus Petal. Travis gives the turn to Kevin. Kevin draws and also pays 2 life to cast Gitaxian Probe, targeting Zach. Rhystic triggers and Travis draws. Then Kevin looks at Zach's hand and draws a card. He plays a Breeding Pool into play untapped, paying 2 life. He casts an Incubation Druid and Travis draws from Rhystic. He cracks his Wooded Foothills, pays a life, and fetches up a tropical island onto the battlefield. With nothing else, Kevin passes. Zach draws, takes no actions, and passes. During his upkeep, Jay wins his Mana Crypt roll. He draws and plays a Nykthos, Shrine to Nyx as his land for turn. He activates Yisan for 2, fetching up a Collector Roof onto the battlefield. He casts a Court of Calling, where X equals 5. Rhystic triggers and Travis draws. In response, Zach flashes in a Dress Down, and Travis draws again. Dress Down enters, and Zach draws. With Chord still in the stack, Kevin casts Force of Will, paying a life, exiling Thassa's Oracle, countering Court of Calling. Jay passes, and Dress Down is sacrificed. Travis draws and plays a Bloodstained Mire. He cracks it, pays a life, and fetches up a Volcanic Island onto the battlefield. He passes, discarding to hand size. Kevin draws and casts his commander, Kinnan Prodigy, paying the Rhystic tax. He casts Lightning Greaves, and Travis draws from Rhystic again. He moves to combat and attacks Zach with Kinnan. Zach takes it, and Kevin chips the turn to Zach. Zack draws and plays a Polluted Delta. He cracks it, pays a life, and fetches up an Underground Sea onto the battlefield. He casts a Rhystic Study of his own. Rhystic triggers and Travis draws. Rhystic resolves, the rest of the table gets worried, and Zack passes to Jay. During his upkeep, Jay loses his Mana Crypt roll and takes 3 damage. He draws and activates Yisan for 3, fetching up a Circle of Dreams Druid onto the battlefield. He moves to combat and attacks Kevin with Oof and Manglehorn. Kevin takes it, and Jay ends his turn. Travis draws and plays an Arid Mesa. He cracks it, pays a life, and fetches up a Steam Vents onto the battlefield untapped, paying 2 life. He casts his other commander, Thrasios, Triton Hero. Rhystic triggers and Zack draws. He passes, discarding to hand size. Kevin draws and plays an island. He moves to combat and attacks Zack with Kinnan. Zack takes it, and Kevin ships the turn. During his upkeep, Zack casts Mystical Tutor. Rhystic triggers and Travis draws. Then Zack fetches up a Dam onto the top of his library. He draws and plays a Scrubland. He casts his commander, Timna the Weaver, and Travis draws from Rhystic. With nothing else, Zack passes to Jay. During his upkeep, Jay loses his Mana Crypt roll and takes 3 damage. He draws and plays a Forest for turn. He activates Yisan for 4. In response, Kevin adapts Incubation Druid, adding 3+1/+1 counters. Still in response, Kevin casts Worldly Tutor. Both Rhystic's trigger, and Travis and Zack draw. Then Kevin fetches up a Seedborn Muse onto the top of his library. Then Yisan resolves, and Jay fetches up a Temur Sabertooth onto the battlefield. Next, Jay casts Craterhoof Behemoth. Rhystic triggers, and Travis and Zack draw. Craterhoof enters, and Jay's creatures get +7/+7 and gain trample until the end of turn. He moves to combat and attacks Travis with Craterhoof, Manglehorn, Oof, and Allosaurus Shepherd. In response, Travis casts Chain of Vapor targeting Craterhoof. Rhystic triggers, and Zack draws. Craterhoof bounces, and Travis takes the rest. With nothing else, Jay passes the turn. Travis draws and plays a Training Center. He casts a Mystic Remora. Rhystic triggers, and Zack draws. Remora resolves, and Travis passes, discarding to hand size. Kevin draws and casts Consecrated Sphinx. The table groans, and Kevin passes. During Zack's draw step, Kevin draws 2 through Consecrated Sphinx. Zack plays a Wooded Foothills for turn. He cracks it, pays a life, and fetches up a Plateau onto the battlefield. He casts an Overloaded Dam. Mystic and Rhystic trigger, and Travis declines to draw due to Consecrated Sphinx. In response, Jay activates Temur Sabertooth, bouncing Circle of Dreams Druid, giving Temur Sabertooth indestructible until the end of turn. Then Dam resolves, destroying all creatures. Zack passes, discarding to hand size. During his upkeep, Jay loses his Mana Crypt roll and takes 3 damage. He draws and casts a Jeweled Lotus. Remora and 2 Rhystic's trigger, he pays for both Rhystic's, and Travis draws from Remora. He casts Circle of Dreams Druid, and both draw from Rhystic. He cracks his Lotus to help recast his commander, Yisan, and both draw from Rhystic again. He moves to combat and attacks Travis with Temur Sabertooth. Travis takes it, and Jay passes the turn. During his upkeep, Travis lets his Remora die. He draws and casts Underworld Breach, paying the Rhystic tax. In response, Zack casts Force of Will, paying a life and exiling a blue card, paying for Rhystic. In response, Travis casts Flusterstorm with all copies targeting Force. Rhystic triggers, and Zack draws. Force of Will is countered, and with Breach still in the stack, Zack casts Pact of Negation. In response, Travis casts a Swan Song. Swan Song counters Pact, and Zack creates a 2/2 bird, and Underworld Breach resolves. Travis escapes Mana Crypt, and Zack draws from Rhystic. In response, Alan casts Force of Vigor for its alternate cost, exiling a green card, targeting Underworld Breach and Travis's Rhystic Study. Both Rhystic's trigger, and both draw. In response, Travis casts an Offer You Can't Refuse, and Zack draws from Rhystic. Force of Vigor is countered, Alan creates 2 treasures, and Mana Crypt resolves. Travis casts a Mox Opal, and Zack draws again. He casts a Lion's Eye Diamond, and Zack draws. He casts his commander, Rograk, son of Rogoth, paying the Rhystic tax. He cracks his Lion's Eye Diamond, discards his hand, and adds 3 blue. He escapes Polymorph, and Zack draws. In response, Zack casts Force of Negation, exiling a blue card, countering and exiling Polymorph. Next, Travis escapes LED. He cracks it for 3 blue. He escapes LED again, Zack draws, and then he cracks it for 3 red. He casts Divergent Transformation targeting both Rograk and Jay Yisan, and then Zack draws from Rhystic. Both are exiled, and Jay reveals a Priest of Titania, and Travis reveals a Hullbreaker Horror. Travis escapes LED, and Zack draws. Hullbreaker Horror triggers, bouncing Travis's Rhystic. He cracks it for 3 green. He escapes LED. Hullbreaker Horror triggers, bouncing his Mana Crypt. He casts Mana Crypt, bouncing his Mox Opal. Travis presents a loop of floating mana with both of his rocks and repeatedly bouncing them through Hullbreaker Horror over and over. He then generates infinite mana. He casts his commander, Thrasios, Triton Hero. He activates Thrasios with his infinite mana, drawing his deck and putting all lands onto the battlefield tapped. He casts Lightning Bolt, targeting Jay. He casts Noxious Revival, putting Lightning Bolt back on top of his library. He draws Lightning Bolt with Thrasios and then casts it again, targeting Jay again. He casts Turn the Earth, shuffling both Lightning Bolt and Noxious Revival into his library, then draws both again through Thrasios. He presents another loop of casting Lightning Bolt on each opponent, then looping it with Turn the Earth and Noxious Revival. He does this over and over until the table is dead, and Travis wins the game. Cal won the eBay bid for the Panasonic Q GameCube and gets to start us off. But Mike has a pre-game action and puts Gemstone Caverns onto the battlefield, exiling Mana Confluence. Cal draws a card for turn and plays an Ancient Tomb. He taps it to help cast a Soul Ring. He casts a Lotus Petal. He sacrifices Lotus Petal to help cast Manamorphose, adding a red and a green and drawing a card. He casts his commander, Minsc & Boo, Timeless Heroes. It enters and Cal creates a Boo token. He activates Minsc & Boo's first ability, putting 3+1/+1 counters onto Boo. Cal moves to combat and attacks Brandon with Boo. Brandon takes the hit and Cal passes the turn. Mike draws and plays a Tropical Island. He casts a Soul Ring. He casts a Simic Signet. He casts a Chrome Mox, imprinting Hullbreaker Horror. He casts a Rhystic Study. Mike ships the turn to Brandon. Brandon draws and plays a Volcanic Island. He casts a Soul Ring and Mike draws through Rhystic. He casts an Arcane Signet and Mike draws again. He casts a Jeweled Lotus, paying the Rhystic tax. He ends his turn. Cruz draws and plays an Overgrown Tomb into play untapped, paying 2 life. He casts a Mana Crypt and Mike draws through Rhystic. Cruz passes the turn to Cal. Cal draws and plays a Wooded Foothills. He cracks it, pays a life, and fetches up a Taiga onto the battlefield. He casts Jessica's Will, choosing both modes, targeting Cruz, tapping Ancient Tomb to help pay for Rhystic. In response, Cruz casts Vampiric Tutor, paying the Rhystic tax. He fetches up a card onto the top of his library and loses 2 life. Jessica's Will resolves and Cal adds 4 red and then exiles Shatterskull Smashing, Beseiju Who Endures, and Mana Crypt off of the top of his library. He casts Mana Crypt from exile, paying for Rhystic. He casts Haze of Rage with buyback and Mike draws through Rhystic. In response to the Storm trigger, Cal casts Red Elemental Blast, targeting Rhystic Study, paying the Rhystic tax. Rhystic is destroyed and Haze of Rage and its copies resolve, and Cal returns it to his hand through buyback. Cal moves to combat, attacking Mike with Boo. Mike declares no blocks and takes the damage. In his second main phase, Cal activates Minsc & Boo's second ability, sacrificing Boo, dealing 9 damage to Brandon and drawing 9 cards. He casts a Mox Amber. He casts a Jeweled Lotus. He casts an Orcish Lumberjack. All through, Cal passes, discarding to hand size. Mike draws and casts his commander, Kinnan, Bonder Prodigy. He casts a Felwar Stone. He activates Kinnan, looking at the top 5, failing to find. Mike ships his turn to Brandon. Brandon draws and plays an Arid Mesa. He cracks it, pays a life, and fetches up a Badlands onto the battlefield. He casts Praetor's Grasp, targeting Cal. He fetches up a card from Cal's library into exile face down. He casts Cal's Dockside Extortionist from exile through Praetor's Grasp. It enters, and he creates 9 treasures. Brandon sacrifices Jeweled Lotus to help cast his commander, Crom, Ludovic's Opus. He casts his other commander, Timna the Weaver. He moves to combat and attacks Minsc & Boo with Crom, killing the Planeswalker. In his second main phase, Brandon casts Tainted Pact. He exiles cards from the top of his library until he reveals an Ad Nauseam into his hand. With nothing else, he passes the turn. During his upkeep, Cruz wins his Mana Crypt roll. He draws and plays an Exotic Orchard. He casts Dockside Extortionist. Dockside enters, creating 12 treasures. Cruz casts his commander, Will the Wise. Crom triggers and Brandon draws. Will enters, Cal and Mike each make a clue, Brandon declines and loses a life, and then Cruz creates 3 clues. He pays 2 life to cast Noxious Revival, targeting Vampiric Tutor in his graveyard, putting it on top of his library. He sacrifices the clue and draws a card. He casts Vampiric Tutor, fetching up a card onto the top of his library and losing 2 life. He cracks another clue and draws a card. He then casts Deadly Relic for its alternate cost, exiling Kinnan. Cruz casts Emil the Blessed. Seeing an infinite mana loop in his future, Brandon responds by casting Demonic Consultation, naming Mindbreak Trap as it resolves. He exiles the top 6 and then exiles until he reveals Mindbreak Trap, putting it into his hand. He casts Mindbreak Trap for its alternate cost, exiling Emil. Crisis averted, the table can breathe again. Cruz casts Fiend Artisan. He gives the turn to Cal. During his upkeep, Cal loses his Mana Crypt roll and takes 3 damage. He draws and plays a Scalding Tarn. He cracks it, pays a life, and fetches up a Stomping Ground onto the battlefield untapped, paying 2 life. He casts a Ruby Medallion. He sacrifices Jeweled Lotus to help cast his commander, Minsc & Boo, Timeless Heroes. Crom triggers and Brandon draws. Minsc & Boo enter, and Cal creates a Boo token. He activates Minsc & Boo's first ability, putting 3/1/1 counters onto Boo. He moves to combat and attacks Brandon with Boo, and Brandon takes the damage. In his second main phase, Cal casts Talisman of Impulse. He sacrifices a clue and draws a card, then passes the turn to Mike. Mike draws and recasts his commander, Kinnan, Bonder Prodigy. He activates Kinnan, looking at the top 5, but fails again to find a creature. Dejected, he ships the turn. Brandon draws and plays an Exotic Orchard. He casts Ad Nauseam. It resolves and Brandon reveals a Simian Spirit Guide, Mox Diamond, Tundra, Savine's Reclamation, Imperial Seal, Culling the Weak, Pact of Negation, Windswept Teeth, Spell Pierce, Felwar Stone, Underground Sea, Otawara Soaring City, Mistcast, Talisman of Indulgence, Mana Crypt, Esper Sentinel, March of Swirling Mist, and a Cyclonic Rift, deciding to stop there. He casts Mox Diamond, discarding Windswept Teeth. Brandon moves to combat and attacks Cal with Crom. Cal takes the damage, and in his second main phase, Brandon pays 1 life and draws 1 card through Timna, going down to 2 life. He casts Culling the Weak, sacrificing Crom as an additional cost, adding 4 black. He exiles Simian Spirit Guide from his hand, adding a red. He casts Felwar Stone. He pushes his chips into the middle of the table and casts Final Fortune. He casts Talisman of Indulgence. Brandon moves to his next turn, discarding the hand size. Brandon draws and casts Lion's Eye Diamond. He moves to combat and attacks Minsc and Boo with Tymna. Cal declares no box, and Minsc and Boo take 2. Then Brandon gains 2 life. In his second main phase, Brandon casts Imperial Seal. He fetches up a card onto the top of his library and loses 2 life. He hard cashed Taxian Probe. He looks at Cruz's hand and draws a card. He casts Cyclonic Rift, targeting Minsc and Boo. Brandon holds priority and casts Pact of Negation, targeting his own Cyclonic Rift. He continues to hold priority and casts Spell Pierce, countering his own pact. Rift resolves and bounces Minsc and Boo back to Cal's hand. Now, with everyone wondering why he just did all that, he casts Brain Freeze with a much higher storm count, with all copies targeting himself. With the storm count being high enough, Brandon mills out the rest of his deck. He sacrifices Lion's Eye Diamond to help flash back Savine's Reclamation, targeting Thassa's Oracle in his graveyard. Savine's resolves, creating a copy that targets Ranger Captain of Eos, but none of that really matters as Thassa's Oracle has entered the battlefield. Oracle puts a win the game trigger onto the stack, and the table looks at each other for an answer. But, with none to be found, Brandon wins the game. Mike draws and plays a Verdant Catacombs. He cracks it, pays a life, and fetches up a tropical island onto the battlefield. He casts a Mox Amber. He ships the turn to Brandon. Brandon draws and plays a Command Tower. He casts a Jeweled Lotus. He casts a Crom Mox, imprinting Chain of Vapor. He sacrifices Jeweled Lotus to help cast his commander, Crom, Ludovic's Opus. He moves to combat and attacks Mike with Crom. Mike takes the damage, and Brandon passes the turn. Cruz draws and plays an Arid Mesa. He cracks it, pays a life, and fetches up a Scrubland onto the battlefield. He casts an Esper Sentinel and gives the turn to Cal. Cal draws and plays a Spire Garden. He casts Carpet of Flowers, and Cruz draws through Sentinel. With nothing else, Cal ends his turn. Mike draws and plays a Botanical Sanctum. He casts his commander, Kinnan, Bonder Prodigy. He passes the turn. Brandon draws and plays an Exotic Orchard. He casts his other commander, Tymna the Weaver. He moves to combat and attacks Cal with Crom. Cal takes the damage, and in his second main phase, Brandon pays a life and draws a card through Tymna. All through, he ships the turn to Cruz. Cruz draws and plays a Taiga. He casts an Arbor Elf and passes the turn to Cal. Cal draws, and in his first main phase, he adds 1 red through his Carpet of Flowers. He plays a Taiga for turn. He casts Dockside Extortionist. Dockside enters, and Cal creates 3 treasures. He casts his commander, Minsc and Boo, Timeless Heroes. Brandon draws through Crom, and then Cruz draws through Sentinel. Minsc and Boo enter, and Cal creates a Boo token. He activates Minsc and Boo's first ability, putting 3+1/+1 counters onto Boo. He moves to combat and attacks Brandon with Boo. Brandon takes it, and then Cal gives the turn to Mike. Mike draws and plays a Breeding Pool into play untapped, paying 2 life. He casts a Phantasmal Image. It enters as a copy of Dockside Extortionist, and Mike creates 3 treasures. He casts Basalt Monolith. Brandon draws through Crom, and then Cruz draws through Sentinel. In response, Brandon casts Force of Negation for its alternate cost, exiling a blue card, targeting Basalt Monolith. Sentinel triggers, and Cruz draws. Force resolves, saving the table, countering and exiling Basalt Monolith. Finished up, Mike passes the turn. Brandon draws and moves to combat. He attacks Cruz with Tymna and Minsc and Boo with Crom. Minsc and Boo dies, and Cruz takes the damage. In his second main phase, Brandon pays a life and draws a card through Tymna. He plays an Arid Mesa for turn. He cracks it, pays a life, and fetches up a Badlands onto the battlefield. He casts Demonic Tutor, and Cruz draws through Sentinel. Demonic Tutor resolves, and Brandon fetches up a card into his hand. He casts Underworld Breach. He casts Lion's Eye Diamond. He sacrifices Lion's Eye Diamond, discards his hand, and adds 3 black. He escapes Demonic Tutor from his graveyard. In response, Cruz casts Silence. It resolves, and another win attempt is thwarted. Demonic Tutor resolves, and Brandon fetches up a card into his hand. He moves to his end step, Underworld Breach is sacrificed, and Brandon ends his turn. During his upkeep, Cruz casts Enlightened Tutor, fetching up a Pyre of Heroes onto the top of his library. He draws and casts Crop Rotation, sacrificing Taiga as an additional cost. Crom triggers, and Brandon draws. Cruz fetches up a Gaia's Cradle onto the battlefield. He casts Pyre of Heroes. He plays a Command Tower for turn. Cruz activates Pyre of Heroes, sacrificing Esper Sentinel and fetching up a Drannith Magistrate onto the battlefield. All through, he ships the turn to Cal. Cal draws and plays a Forest. He moves to combat and attacks Mike with Boo. Mike takes it, and Cal passes the turn to Mike. Mike draws and plays a Turn Timber, Serpentine Wood into play untapped, paying 3 life. He cracks his knuckles and casts Nezahal, the Primal Tide. Mike gives the turn to Brandon. Brandon draws and plays an Underground Sea. He moves to combat and attacks Cruz with Crom and Cal with Tymna. They declare no blocks, and both take the damage. In his second main phase, Brandon pays 2 life and draws 2 cards through Tymna. He casts Mystic Remora, and Mike draws through Nezahal. Remora resolves, and Brandon ends the turn. Cruz draws and plays a Cavern of Souls, naming Human as it enters. He casts his commander, Will the Wise. It enters, and Cal, Mike, and Brandon each investigate, and then Cruz creates 4 clues of his own. He activates Pyre of Heroes, sacrificing Will the Wise. Will triggers and Cal, Mike, and Brandon each lose a life, and Cruz creates a clue. Pyre's ability resolves, and Cruz fetches up a Ranger Captain of Eos onto the battlefield. Ranger Captain enters, and Cruz fetches up a Viscera Seer into his hand. He casts Elves of Deep Shadow, and Brandon draws through Crom. He suspends Greater Gargadon with 10 time counters. Cruz passes the turn. At the end of Cruz's turn, Cal sacrifices the clue and draws a card. Cal draws and moves to combat. He attacks Cruz with Boo. Cruz takes it, and with nothing else, Cal ships the turn to Mike. Mike draws and casts out Mana Crypt. Remora triggers, and Brandon draws. Mike activates Kinnan, looks at the top 5, and puts Nyx Bloom Ancient onto the battlefield. He activates Kinnan again, looks at the top 5, and puts a Phyrexian Metamorph onto the battlefield as a copy of Dockside Extortionist. Dockside enters, and in response, Brandon sacrifices 2 clues and draws 2 cards. Cruz also responds by sacrificing 5 clues to Greater Gargadon, removing 5 time counters. Then Mike creates 4 treasures through Dockside. He activates Kinnan, looks at the top 5, but fails to find. He activates Kinnan again, looking at the top 5, and again fails to find. He activates Kinnan, looks at the top 5, and puts a Galecaster Colossus onto the battlefield. Mike sacrifices the clue and draws a card. He moves to combat and attacks Brandon with Nezahal and Kinnan. Brandon declares no blocks and takes the damage. Mike passes the turn to Brandon. During his upkeep, Brandon pays for his Remora. He draws and plays a Flooded Strand. He cracks it, pays a life, and fetches up a Scrubland onto the battlefield. He exiles Simian Spirit Guide from his hand, adding a red. He casts Wheel of Fortune. Mike draws through Nezahal, and then Brandon draws through Remora. In response, Cal casts Force of Vigor for its alternate cost, exiling a green card, targeting Nyx Bloom Ancient and Mystic Remora. Brandon responds by casting Deflecting Swat for its alternate cost, targeting Force of Vigor. Mike draws through Nezahal, then Swat changes the targets of Vigor to Nyx Bloom Ancient and Pyre of Heroes. Then Force of Vigor resolves, destroying both. Then Wheel resolves, and everyone discards their hand and draws 7. Next, Brandon casts Dockside Extortionist. Dockside enters, and Brandon creates 4 treasures. He casts Imperial Seal, and Mike draws through Nezahal. He fetches up a card onto the top of his library and loses 2 life. He moves to combat and attacks Mike with Crom and Cal with Temna. They both take it, and in his second main phase, Brandon pays 2 life and draws 2 cards through Temna. He casts Gamble, and Mike draws through Nezahal. Gamble resolves, and he fetches up a card into his hand and then randomly discards an Esper Sentinel. Brandon casts Thassa's Oracle. Oracle enters, Brandon holds priority and casts Demonic Consultation. Nezahal triggers, and Mike draws. Consultation resolves, and Brandon calls his shot, naming "You Are Already Dead," and exiles his library. In response to the Oracle trigger, Cal casts Unleash Fury targeting Boo, and Mike draws through Nezahal. Cal casts Invigorate for its alternate cost targeting Boo, and Brandon gains 3 life. Nezahal triggers, and Mike draws. Crom triggers, and, unable to draw a card with an empty library, Brandon dies. Little did he know that he was the one that was already dead. The turn ships to Cruz. During his upkeep, Cruz removes a time counter from Greater Gargadon. He draws and exiles Elvish Spirit Guide from his hand, adding a green. He casts Avacyn's Pilgrim. He taps his Gaia's Cradle, then activates Ranger Captain of Eos, sacrificing it. Ranger's ability resolves, and the table holds their breath. Cruz casts Dockside Extortionist. Dockside enters, and Cruz creates 4 treasures. He casts his commander, Max the Daredevil. He pays 2 life to help cast Birthing Pod. He taps Elves of Deep Shadow to help activate Birthing Pod, paying 2 more life and sacrificing Max. He fetches up an Academy Rector onto the battlefield. He sacrifices Academy Rector through Gargadon, removing a time counter from Gargadon. Rector triggers, Cruz exiles it, fetching up a Pattern of Rebirth onto the battlefield, attaching it to Elves of Deep Shadow. He sacrifices Elves of Deep Shadow through Gargadon and removes another time counter. Pattern of Rebirth triggers, and he fetches up a Protean Hulk onto the battlefield. He sacrifices Protean Hulk through Gargadon and removes another time counter. Protean Hulk triggers, and Cruz fetches up a Grand Abolisher, Activated Sleeper, and Carrion Feeder onto the battlefield. Activated Sleeper enters as a copy of Protean Hulk. He then activates Carrion Feeder, sacrificing Protean Hulk. Hulk triggers again, and he fetches up Emil the Blessed and Bloom Tender onto the battlefield. He presents a loop of activating Emil, flickering Dockside, and creating infinite treasures. He casts Will the Wise. He presents a loop of activating Emil, flickering Will to create infinite clues. He sacrifices the clues until he draws Blind Obedience. He casts Blind Obedience. He presents a loop of sacrificing Will the Wise to Carrion Feeder, recasting it with his infinite mana, and extorting through Blind Obedience to kill the table, and Cruz wins the game. Kevin won the Choking Challenge and gets to start us off. Kevin draws a card for turn and plays an Inventor's Fair. He casts a Mana Crypt. He casts a Metal Worker. Kevin passes. Kyle draws and plays a Spire of Industry. He casts a Chrome Mox Imprinting Neoform. He casts an Incubation Druid and ends his turn. Deathcat draws and plays a Plateau. He casts a Lotus Petal. He casts Gamble. He fetches up a card into his hand and then randomly discards an Imperial Seal. Deathcat ends his turn. Catherine draws and plays an Otawara Soaring City as her land for turn. She casts a Mana Vault. She casts an Azorius Signet. She casts a Cursed Totem. Kyle sinks his head as Catherine ends her turn. During his upkeep, Kevin loses his mana crypt roll and takes 3 damage. He draws and plays a Fiery Islet. He casts a Jeweled Lotus. He cracks it and taps his Fiery Islet to help cast his commander, Joyra, Weatherlight Captain. He casts a Lotus Petal. Joyra triggers and he draws. He casts a Mishra's Bauble and draws again. He casts a Mana Vault and draws a card. He casts an Ensnaring Bridge. Joyra triggers and, in response, Deathcat cracks his Lotus Petal to help cast Vampiric Tutor. He fetches up a card onto the top of his library and loses 2 life. Then Kevin draws and Ensnaring Bridge resolves. He cracks his Mishra's Bauble looking at the top card of Deathcat's library. With no other actions, he passes the turn. During Kyle's upkeep, Kevin draws through Mishra's Bauble. Kyle draws and plays a Waterlogged Grove. He taps his Spire of Industry and Waterlogged Grove to help cast his commander, Kinnan, Prodigy. He casts a Llanowar Elves and ships the turn to Deathcat. Deathcat draws and exiles a Simian Spirit Guide from his hand, adding a red. He casts a turn 2 Underworld Breach. With no answers, Breach resolves. He casts Lion's Eye Diamond. He cracks it, discards his hand, and adds 3 blue. He escapes Brain Freeze from his graveyard with all copies targeting himself, milling 9. He escapes LED again and cracks it for 3 more blue. He escapes Brain Freeze again, milling 15. He escapes LED and cracks it for 3 black. He escapes Thassa's Oracle. It enters, and with the trigger on the stack, he escapes Tainted Pact, exiling his library. Oracle's trigger resolves, and Deathcat wins the game. But Deathcat has a pre-game action, putting Gemstone Caverns onto the battlefield, exiling Plateau. Kevin draws and plays a command tower. He casts a Mana Crypt. He casts a turn 1 Rhystic Study. The table sighs, and Kevin passes. Kyle draws and plays a forest. He casts an Elvish Mystic. Rhystic triggers, and Kevin draws. Kyle passes. Deathcat draws and plays a Misty Rainforest. He cracks it, pays a life, and fetches up a Volcanic Island onto the battlefield. He casts a Serra Ascendant. Rhystic triggers, and Kevin draws. He casts a Mystic Remora, and Kevin draws again. With nothing else, Deathcat ships the turn. Catherine draws and plays a Hallowed Fountain into play untapped, paying 2 life. Catherine passes. During his upkeep, Kevin wins his Mana Crypt roll. He draws and plays an Urza Saga as his land for turn, gating its first counter. He casts a Basalt Monolith. Remora triggers and Deathcat draws. Kevin ships the turn to Kyle. Kyle draws and plays an island. He casts his commander, Kinnan, Prodigy. Rhystic triggers and Kevin draws. He casts a Finehorn Elves, paying the Rhystic tax. Kyle ends his turn. During his upkeep, Deathcat pays to keep his Remora. He draws and plays a Marsh Flats. He cracks it, pays a life, and fetches up an Underground Sea onto the battlefield. He moves to combat and attacks Kevin with Serra Ascendant. Kevin takes it, and Deathcat gains 6. Deathcat ends his turn. At the end of Deathcat's turn, Catherine casts an Enlightened Tutor. Mystic and Rhystic trigger, and Kevin and Deathcat draw. Then Catherine fetches up a Blind Obedience onto the top of her library. The turn moves to Catherine. Catherine draws and plays a Polluted Delta. She cracks it, pays a life, and fetches up a Tundra onto the battlefield. She casts Blind Obedience. Mystic and Rhystic trigger, and Kevin and Deathcat draw. Obedience resolves, and Catherine passes to Kevin. During his upkeep, Kevin loses his Mana Crypt roll and takes 3 damage. He draws, and in his first main phase, Urza Saga gets another counter. He plays an island for turn. He casts his commander, Joyra, Weatherlight Captain, into play tapped through Blind Obedience. He casts an Arcane Signet. Remora triggers and Deathcat draws. Joyra triggers and Kevin draws. Then Arcane Signet enters the battlefield tapped. He casts a Soul Ring and both draw again. He casts a Voltaic Key and both draw again. Unfortunately, since Blind Obedience makes all of his artifacts enter tapped, he is unable to continue and passes, discarding to hand size. Kyle draws and casts a Mox Amber. Mystic and Rhystic trigger, and Kyle pays for both. Amber enters tapped through Blind Obedience, and Kyle moves to combat. He attacks Deathcat with Kinnan. Deathcat takes it, and Kyle passes. At the end of Kyle's turn, Deathcat casts Chain of Vapor, targeting Blind Obedience, paying the Rhystic tax. Blind Obedience bounces, and Catherine doesn't continue the chain. The turn moves to Deathcat. During his upkeep, Deathcat casts Mystical Tutor. Rhystic triggers, and Kevin draws. Then Deathcat fetches up a Brain Freeze onto the top of his library. He lets his Mystic Remora die and draws for turn. He plays a Command Tower. He casts a Chrome Mox. Rhystic triggers, and Kevin draws. Chrome Mox resolves, and Deathcat imprints Tasha's Hideous Laughter. He casts Underworld Breach. Rhystic triggers, and Kevin draws. In response, Kevin casts Force of Will, paying a life and exiling a blue card. In response, Deathcat casts Snapback for its alternate cost, exiling a blue card, targeting Joyra. Rhystic triggers, and Kevin draws again. Joyra bounces, and, still in response, Deathcat casts Brain Freeze with all copies targeting himself. Rhystic triggers, and Kevin draws again. With no other answers, Force of Will counters Underworld Breach. Deathcat moves to combat and attacks Kyle with Serra Ascendant. Kyle takes it, and Deathcat gains 6. With nothing else, Deathcat passes the turn. Catherine draws and plays a Mana Confluence. She casts Counterbalance. Rhystic triggers, and Kevin draws. Counterbalance resolves, and Catherine ends her turn. During his upkeep, Kevin loses his Mana Crypt roll and takes 3 damage. He draws, and in his first main phase, Urza Saga triggers. In response, Kevin activates Saga, creating a construct. He then sacrifices Saga and fetches up a Grafdigger's Cage onto the battlefield. He activates Voltaic Key, untapping Basalt Monolith. He recasts Joyra, Weatherlight Captain. Counterbalance triggers, and Catherine reveals a Calamity's Wake. Then Joyra resolves. He casts Mox Opal. Joyra triggers, and Kevin draws. He casts Urza's Bauble and draws again. He casts Cloud Key and draws. It enters and Kevin names artifacts. He casts Chromatic Sphere and draws a card. He casts Jeweled Lotus and draws again. He plays an Ancient Tomb for turn. He taps it to cast Mystic Forge. Joy triggers and he draws. All through, Kevin passes. At the end of Kevin's turn, Kyle casts Chain of Vapor targeting Grafdigger's Cage. Rhystic triggers and Kevin draws. Cage bounces and Kevin doesn't continue the chain. Kevin discards the hand size and the turn moves to Kyle. Kyle draws and casts a Brainstorm. Rhystic triggers and Kevin draws. Then Kyle draws 3 and puts 2 back on top. He plays a Hinterland Harbor as his land for turn. He casts Worldly Tutor. Rhystic triggers and Kevin draws again. Then Kyle fetches up a Seedborn Muse onto the top of his library. He activates Kinnan, looking at the top 5, putting Seedborn Muse onto the battlefield. Ready to get the ball rolling, Kyle gives the turn to Deathcat. Kyle untaps with Deathcat through Seedborn. Deathcat draws and plays a Luxury Suite. He casts a Windfall. Rhystic triggers and Kevin draws. In response, Kyle casts an overloaded Cyclonic Rift. Everyone knows that this game is now in real bad shape if this resolves, and discusses what to do next. Counterbalance triggers and Catherine decides to ignore the trigger. In response, Kevin activates Mystic Forge, exiling the top card of his library. He also cracks his Jeweled Lotus. He cracks his Urza's Bauble, looking at a random card in Kyle's hand. With nothing else, Cyclonic Rift resolves, bouncing opponents' non-land permanents. Then Windfall resolves, everyone discards their hand, and draws 21 cards. Deathcat casts Mox Opal. He casts a Mana Crypt. He casts a Soul Ring. He casts a Rhystic Study. In response, Kyle casts an Offer You Can't Refuse. Rhystic is countered and Deathcat creates 2 treasures. He casts an Esper Sentinel. He casts a Malevolent Hermit. He casts Silence. In response, Catherine taps her Mana Confluence to cast Swan Song, targeting Silence. Esper triggers and Deathcat draws. Silence is countered and Deathcat creates a 2/2 bird. Next, he casts Culling the Weak, sacrificing Malevolent Hermit as an additional cost, adding 4 black. He casts Wheel of Fortune. Everyone discards their hands and draws 7. He casts Mox Diamond, discarding Sea of Clouds. He casts Gamble. He fetches up a card into his hand and then randomly discards an Offer You Can't Refuse. He casts Cabal Ritual with Threshold, adding 5 black. He flashes back Savine's Reclamation, targeting Underworld Breach in his graveyard. Underworld Breach returns to the battlefield. Savine's copies, returning Lion's Eye Diamond to the battlefield. He cracks his LED, discards his hand, and adds 3 blue. He casts Benevolent Geist, force Disturb cost from his graveyard. He escapes LED 5 times, exiling 15 cards and cracking it each time for blue. He escapes Brain Freeze with a high enough storm count to mill out each opponent's library. Since all of his spells can't be countered, Brain Freeze resolves. Deathcat passes, sacrificing Underworld Breach. One by one, each opponent attempts to draw from an empty library, loses, and Deathcat wins the game. Alan remembers the most phases of mitosis and gets to start us off. Alan draws a card for turn and pays 2 life to cast Tajaxian Probe, targeting Kevin. He looks at Kevin's hand and draws a card. He casts a Jeweled Lotus. He plays the Tabernacle at Pendrell Vale and then passes the turn to Damien. Damien draws and plays a Mana Confluence. He casts a Mana Crypt. He ends his turn. Kevin draws and plays an Ancient Tomb. He taps it to cast a Mana Vault. He casts a Talisman of Curiosity. He taps the Talisman to help cast a Time Twister. Everyone shuffles their hand and graveyard into their library and then draws 7. Kevin ships the turn. Catherine draws and plays a Luxury Suite. She passes. Alan draws and plays a Howled Fountain, into play untapped, paying 2 life. He crafts his Jeweled Lotus to help cast his commander, Shorekai, Genesis Engine. He ends his turn. During his upkeep, Damien loses his Mana Crypt roll and takes 3 damage. He draws and plays an Underground Sea. He casts a Jeweled Lotus. He taps his Mana Confluence and cracks his Jeweled Lotus, and then delves away Jeweled Lotus from his graveyard to cast his commander, Tassiger the Golden Fang. He casts an Imperial Seal. He fetches up a card onto the top of his library and loses 2 life. He ships his turn. During his draw step, Kevin takes a damage from his Mana Vault. In his main phase, he taps his Talisman to help cast his commander, Kinnan, Prodigy. He taps his Ancient Tomb to cast a Felwar Stone. He passes. At the end of Kevin's turn, Catherine casts Vampiric Tutor, fetching up a card onto the top of her library and losing 2 life. Catherine draws and plays a Scalding Tarn. She cracks it, pays a life, and fetches up a Badlands onto the battlefield. She casts a Dockside Extortionist. It enters, and Catherine creates 5 treasures. She casts her commander, Prosper Tomebound. She moves to her end step, Prosper triggers, and she exiles a command tower. Catherine passes the turn. Alan draws and plays an Urza's Saga, getting its first counter. He activates Shorekai, drawing 2 cards, discarding 1, and creating a 1/1 pilot. Thanking the magic gods for his luck, he casts a Mana Crypt. The table groans as Alan casts the second Time Twister of the night. In response, Kevin comes to the rescue and casts a Swan Song. Time Twister is countered, and Alan creates a 2/2 bird. Alan sheepishly ends his turn. During his upkeep, Damien wins his Mana Crypt roll. He also pays for Tassiger through Tabernacle. He draws and casts a Soul Ring. He casts Toxic Deluge, paying 4 life as an additional cost. All creatures get -4/-4, wiping most of the board. He ships the turn to Kevin. During his draw step, Kevin takes a damage from his Mana Vault. In his main phase, he plays an Otawara, Soaring City as his land for turn. He taps his Ancient Tomb to help recast Kinnan, Prodigy. He passes. Catherine draws and plays her own Urza Saga, also getting its first counter. She casts a Goblin Engineer. It enters, and she fetches up a Wishclaw Talisman into her graveyard. She ends her turn. During his upkeep, Alan wins his Mana Crypt roll. He draws, and in his first main phase, Urza Saga gets another counter. He plays a Sea of Clouds for turn. He activates Shorkai, drawing 2, discarding 1, and creating a pilot. Alan ends his turn. During his upkeep, Damien wins his Mana Crypt roll. He doesn't pay for Tasigur through Tabernacle, destroying it. He draws and plays a Dark Slick Shores. He taps his Mana Confluence to help cast Ad Nauseam. In response, Kevin casts a Mana Drain, countering Ad Naus. Dejected, Damien ends his turn. At the end of Damien's turn, Kevin casts a Worldly Tutor, fetching up a Seaborn Muse onto the top of his library. Kevin then casts a Nature's Claim, targeting Damien's Mana Crypt. Mana Crypt is destroyed, and Damien gains 4 life. The turn moves to Kevin. During his upkeep, Kevin pays for Kinnan through Tabernacle. During his draw step, Kevin takes a damage from his Mana Vault. In his main phase, he adds 5 colorless through Mana Drain. He casts a Seedborn Muse. He taps his Ancient Tomb and his Talisman of Curiosity to help cast Consecrated Sphinx. He moves to combat and attacks Damien with Kinnan. Damien takes it, and Kevin passes the turn. At the end of Kevin's turn, Alan casts a Chain of Vapor, targeting Kevin's Consecrated Sphinx. Sphinx bounces, and Kevin doesn't continue the chain. The turn moves to Catherine. Kevin untaps with Catherine through Seedborn. During her upkeep, Catherine pays for Goblin Engineer through Tabernacle. She draws, and in her first main phase, Urza Saga gets another counter. She casts a Soul Ring. She activates Goblin Engineer, sacrificing a treasure and returning Wishclaw Talisman from her graveyard to the battlefield. She activates Wishclaw, fetching up a card into her hand and giving Wishclaw to Alan. Catherine ends her turn. At the end of Catherine's turn, Kevin activates Kinnan. He looks at the top 5, putting a Paradise Druid onto the battlefield. The turn moves to Alan. Kevin untaps with Alan through Seedborn. During his upkeep, he wins his Mana Crypt flip and doesn't pay for his pilot through Tabernacle. He draws, and in his first main phase, Urza Saga triggers. He floats mana and sacrifices it, fetching up a Soul Ring onto the battlefield. He plays an Adakar Waste as his land for turn. He uses his floating mana to activate Wishclaw Talisman, fetching up a card into his hand and giving Wishclaw back to Catherine. He casts an Isochron Scepter. In response, Kevin activates Kinnan, looking for an answer. He looks at the top 5 and fails to find. With no other actions from the table, Isochron resolves. Scepter enters and imprints a dramatic reversal. Alan activates Shorkai, drawing 2, discarding 1, and creating a pilot. Alan activates Isochron, casting a copy of Dramatic Reversal, untapping all of his non-land permanents. He presents a loop of casting Dramatic Reversal through Isochron Scepter, netting infinite colorless mana. He casts Tezzeret the Seeker. He activates Tezzeret's second ability, where X equals 1, fetching up a Codex Shredder onto the battlefield. He continues the same Iso Rev loop, this time milling each opponent with Codex Shredder. He does this over and over until everyone has milled their entire library. Alan passes. One by one, each opponent attempts to draw from an empty library, loses, and Alan wins the game. Damien draws and plays a Marsh Flats. He casts a Lotus Petal and passes. Kevin draws and plays a Rejuvenating Springs. He casts his own Lotus Petal. He casts a Chrome Mox, slightly surprising the table by imprinting Thassa's Oracle. He cracks his Lotus Petal to help cast his commander, Kinnan, Bonder Prodigy. He casts a Talisman of Curiosity. He taps his Talisman to help cast Incubation Druid. He ends his turn. Catherine draws and plays a Verdant Catacombs. She cracks it, pays a life, and fetches up a Badlands onto the battlefield. She casts a Jeweled Lotus. She cracks the Lotus to help cast her commander, Prosper, Tomebound. She moves to her end step, Prosper triggers, and she exiles a Magda, Brazen Outlaw. She passes. Alan draws and plays a Cephalid Coliseum. He casts a Chrome Mox, imprinting Brainstorm. He taps Cephalid Coliseum to cast a Cursed Totem. The table says, that's fine, and Alan ends his turn. At the end of Alan's turn, Damien cracks his Marsh Flats, pays a life, and fetches up an Underground Sea onto the battlefield. Damien draws and plays a Morphic Pool. He casts an Imperial Seal, fetching up a card onto the top of his library and losing 2 life. He ships the turn to Kevin. Kevin draws and moves to combat. He attacks Alan with Kinnan. Alan takes it, and Kevin passes. Catherine draws and plays a Blight Step Pathway. She casts Magda, Brazen Outlaw, from exile through Prosper. Prosper triggers, and she creates a treasure. She casts Ragavan, Nimble Pilferer. She moves to her end step, Prosper triggers, and she exiles a Dualcaster Mage. Catherine ends her turn. Alan draws and plays a Plains. He taps Cephalid Coliseum to help cast an Arcane Signet. He passes. Damien draws and casts Mystic Remora. In response, Kevin casts Nature's Claim, targeting Cursed Totem. In response, Alan casts a Mana Drain, countering Nature's Claim. Mystic Remora then resolves, and Damien ends his turn. Kevin draws and casts Mirage Mirror. Mystic Remora triggers, and Damien draws. Kevin moves to combat and attacks Alan with Kinnan. Alan takes it, and Kevin gives the turn to Catherine. Catherine draws and plays the Sulphurous Springs. She moves to combat and attacks Damien with Magda and Ragavan. Magda triggers and creates a treasure. Damien takes the hit, Ragavan triggers, Catherine creates another treasure, and Damien exiles a Fierce Guardianship. In her second main phase, Catherine casts a Sensei's Divining Top. Remora triggers, and Damien draws. She casts a Praetor's Grasp, targeting Damien. Remora triggers, and Damien draws again. In response, Damien casts a Flusterstorm with all copies targeting Praetor's Grasp. In response, Catherine casts Fierce Guardianship from exile for its alternate cost targeting the original Flusterstorm. Remora triggers, and Damien draws. Prosper triggers, and Catherine creates a treasure. Fierce counters Flusterstorm, and then she pays for the copies. With Praetor's Grasp still in the stack, Damien casts an Offer You Can't Refuse targeting Praetor's Grasp. With no other answers, Grasp is countered, and Catherine creates 2 treasures. She activates Sensei's Divining Top, looking at and rearranging the top 3. She moves to her end step, Prosper triggers, and she exiles an Emergence Zone. She ships the turn. Alan draws, and in his first main phase, he has 1 paltry colorless mana from his mana drain. He casts his commander, Shorkai, Genesis Engine. Remora triggers, and Damien draws. Alan activates Shorkai, drawing 2, discarding Tezzeret the Seeker, confusing the table and creating a pilot. He plays an Adakar Wastes and then gives the turn to Damien. During his upkeep, Damien pays to keep his Remora. He draws and casts a Mox Diamond, discarding Inurza's Saga. He passes. Kevin draws and then stares at the Cursed Totem with contempt. He moves to combat, attacking Alan with Kinnan. Alan blocks with a pilot, and Kevin ships the turn. Catherine draws and plays an Emergence Zone from exile. Prosper triggers, and in response, Kevin activates Mirage Mirror, having it become a copy of Mystic Remora until the end of turn. Then Catherine creates a treasure. Catherine moves to combat and attacks Damien with Magda and Ragavan. Magda triggers and creates a treasure. Damien takes it, Ragavan triggers, Catherine creates another treasure, and Damien exiles Wooded Foothills. In her second main phase, Catherine activates Top, looking at and rearranging the top 3. She moves to her end step, Prosper triggers, and she exiles Layla, the Blade Reforged. Catherine ships the turn. During Alan's upkeep, Kevin activates Mirage Mirror, having it become a copy of Mystic Remora until the end of turn. Alan draws and plays a Mana Confluence. He activates Shorkai, and in response, Kevin casts a Worldly Tutor. Damien's Remora triggers, and he draws. Worldly Tutor resolves, and Kevin fetches up a Trophy Mage onto the top of his library. Shorkai's trigger resolves, and Alan draws 2, discards 1, and creates a pilot. He casts Codex Shredder, and Kevin sinks his head. Both Remora's trigger, and Alan pays for Kevin's, and Damien draws. Alan activates Codex Shredder, targeting Kevin. Kevin mills his Trophy Mage, and the table cheers. With nothing else, Alan passes the turn. During his upkeep, Damien lets his Remora die. He draws and casts Teferi, Master of Time. He activates Teferi's first ability, drawing and discarding. He passes, discarding to hand size. Kevin draws, then activates his Mirage Mirror to make it a copy of Shorkai. He activates his copy of Shorkai, drawing 2, discarding 1, and creating a pilot. Kevin asks the table if Teferi's ultimate is bad, and the table responds by screaming at him. Then Kevin moves to combat. He attacks Teferi with Kinnan. In response, Damien activates Teferi's first ability, drawing and discarding. Teferi takes the hit, and Kevin ships the turn. At the end of Kevin's turn, Catherine cracks her Emergence Stone, giving her spells flash until the end of turn. She casts a Wheel of Fortune. In response, Damien casts a Force of Negation, exiling a blue card, targeting Wheel. In response, Catherine activates Top, looking at and rearranging the top 3. She taps Top, drawing a card and putting Top on top. Force resolves, countering and exiling Wheel of Fortune. Unfortunately disrupted, the turn moves to Catherine. Catherine draws and casts Layla, the Blade Reforged, from exile. Prosper triggers, and Catherine creates a treasure. She moves to combat and attacks Teferi with Magda and Layla, and Damien with Ragavan. Magda triggers, and Catherine creates a treasure. Layla triggers, and in response, Damien activates Teferi's first ability, drawing and discarding. Layla's trigger resolves, exiling Rain of Filth from Catherine's library, and Layla gets a +1/+1 counter. Teferi and Damien then take the hit, Teferi dies, Ragavan triggers, Catherine creates a treasure, and Damien exiles a Demonic Tutor. In her second main phase, Catherine casts Demonic Tutor from exile, creating a treasure through Prosper. She fetches up a card into her hand. She casts a Rain of Filth from exile, creating a treasure. She sacrifices 2 of her lands, adding 2 black. She casts a Doomsday. She fetches up 5 cards from her library and graveyard, exiles the rest, reorders the remaining 5, and loses half of her life, rounding up. She moves to her end step, Prosper triggers, and she exiles Final Fortune. Layla triggers and gets a +1/+1 counter. Still in the end step, Catherine casts Final Fortune from exile. Prosper triggers, and she creates a treasure. Final Fortune resolves, and Catherine moves to her extra turn. Catherine draws and plays a Mana Confluence. She moves to combat and attacks Damien with everything. Magda triggers, and Catherine creates a treasure. Layla triggers, exiling a Dark Ritual and getting a 1/1 counter. Damien takes the hit, Ragavan triggers, Catherine creates a treasure, and Damien exiles another Dark Ritual. In her second main phase, Catherine casts Jessica's Will, targeting Damien. She adds 5 red and then exiles Praetor's Grasp and Twin Flame with no other cards remaining in her library. Layla triggers and gets a 1/1 counter. Catherine taps Mana Confluence to cast Dark Ritual from exile, creating a treasure through Prosper, adding 3 black. She casts Damien's Dark Ritual from exile, creating another treasure through Prosper and adding 3 more black. She casts a Praetor's Grasp from exile, targeting Damien. She creates a treasure, and Catherine searches Damien's library for a card, exiling it face down. She then casts what she tutored, Thassa's Oracle. It enters, triggers, and Catherine wins the game. Zach wins the one-legged race and gets to start us off. Zach draws a card for turn and plays a Beseju, who endures. He casts a Wild Growth. He passes to Brandon. Brandon draws and plays a Scalding Tarn. He cracks it, pays a life, and fetches up an Underground Sea onto the battlefield. He casts a Soul Ring. He ships the turn. Mike draws and plays a Tropical Island. He casts a Mox Diamond, discarding Mana Confluence. He casts his commander, Kinnan, Bonder Prodigy. He casts a Mox Amber. He casts a Lotus Petal. He casts a Mystic Remora. In response, Cruz pays 2 life to cast Mental Misstep, countering Mystic Remora. Mike ends his turn. Cruz draws and plays a Scalding Tarn. He cracks it, pays a life, and fetches up an Underground Sea onto the battlefield. He casts a Mana Crypt. He casts a Mox Diamond, discarding Watery Grave. He casts a Soul Ring. He casts its commander, Tymna the Weaver. He gives the turn to Zach. Zach draws and plays a Cavern of Souls, naming Elf as it enters. He casts a Soul Ring. He casts a Manglehorn. Manglehorn resolves and destroys Cruz's Soul Ring. He ships the turn. Brandon draws and plays a Bloodstained Mire. He cracks it, pays a life, and fetches up a Badlands onto the battlefield. He pays 2 life to cast Taxian Probe. He looks at Mike's hand and draws a card. He casts a Grim Monolith. Unfortunately, he forgot about Manglehorn, so Grim Monolith enters tapped. A very sad Brandon ends his turn. Mike draws and plays a Command Tower. He does nothing else and passes. During his upkeep, Cruz loses his Mana Crypt roll and takes 3 damage. He draws and plays an Exotic Orchard. He moves to combat and attacks Brandon with Tymna. Brandon takes the hit, and in his second main phase, Cruz pays a life and draws a card through Tymna. He casts his other commander, Thrasios, Triton Hero. He ships the turn. Zach draws and casts his commander, Selvala, Heart of the Wilds. He ends his turn. Brandon draws and plays a Watery Grave into play untapped, paying 2 life. He casts his commander, Crom, Ludovic's Opus. Brandon passes. At the end of Brandon's turn, Mike flashes in a Hullbreaker Horror. The table gets a massive sense of horror as Brandon passes the turn. Mike draws and casts Phantasmal Image. Hullbreaker Horror triggers and Mike bounces Selvala. Phantasmal Image resolves, entering as a copy of Crom. He moves to combat and attacks Cruz with Crom. In response, Cruz casts Swift Reconfiguration targeting Mike's Crom. Crom triggers and sacrifices itself through Phantasmal Image. In his second main phase, he channels Colossal Sky Turtle, return Mystic Remora from his graveyard to his hand. He casts the Remora, Hullbreaker Horror, and Crom trigger. Brandon draws a card and Mike bounces Crom. In a repeat of turn 1, Brandon pays 2 life to cast Mental Misstep, countering the Remora. Mike goes to scream into a pillow and ships the turn to Cruz. During his upkeep, Cruz wins his Mana Crypt roll. He draws and moves to combat. He attacks Brandon with Tymna. Brandon takes it, and in his second main phase, Cruz pays a life and draws a card through Tymna. He casts a Mystic Remora of his own. He passes to Zach. Zach draws and recasts Selvala. He casts Finehorn Elves. He attacks Brandon with Manglehorn. He gives the turn to Brandon. Brandon draws and plays a Flooded Strand. He cracks it, pays a life, and fetches up a Tundra onto the battlefield. He casts a Toxic Deluge, paying 8 life. Mystic Remora triggers and Cruz draws. In response, Cruz activates Thrasios, scrying 1 and revealing an Ancient Tomb onto the battlefield tapped. With no other answers, Deluge resolves, wiping the board. Next, Brandon casts Time Twister and Cruz draws through Remora. Each player shuffles their hand and graveyard into their library and draws 7. He casts a Mox Diamond and Cruz draws again. Diamond resolves and Brandon discards a Polluted Delta. He ends his turn. Mike draws and plays an Exotic Orchard. For the 3rd time, he casts Mystic Remora. Remora triggers and Cruz draws. Finally, with no answers, Mike's Remora resolves. He casts a Finehorn Elves. He ships the turn. During his upkeep, Cruz wins his Mana Crypt roll and then pays for his Mystic Remora. He draws and plays an Arid Mesa. He cracks it, pays a life, and fetches up a Tundra onto the battlefield. He recasts Thrasios. He passes. At the end of Cruz's turn, Zach casts Force of Vigor for its alternate cost, exiling a green card, targeting both Mystic Remoras. Both Remoras trigger, and Mike and Cruz draw. In response, Cruz casts Fierce Guardianship for its alternate cost, targeting Force of Vigor. Mike's Remora triggers, and he draws. Fierce counters Force, and Cruz passes, discarding to hand size. Zach draws and plays a Snow-Covered Forest. He recasts Selvala. He casts a Mana Crypt, letting Louise and Mike draw through Remora. He gives the turn to Brandon. Brandon draws and plays an Exotic Orchard. He casts a Gamble, letting Cruz and Mike draw. He fetches up a card into his hand and then randomly discards a Brain Freeze. He casts Ad Nauseam, and Cruz and Mike draw. In response, Cruz taps Ancient Tomb to help cast Intuition, targeting Mike. Remora triggers and Mike draws. Intuition resolves and Cruz reveals a Savine's Reclamation, Grand Abolisher, and a Force of Negation. Mike gives him Force of Negation. Still in response to Ad Nauseam, Cruz casts Force of Negation, exiling a blue card, targeting Ad Naus. Force resolves, countering and exiling Ad Nauseam. Brandon passes the turn. At the end of Brandon's turn, Mike casts Worldly Tutor. Remora triggers and Cruz draws. Mike fetches up a Seedborn Muse onto the top of his library. During his upkeep, Mike lets his Remora die. He draws and plays a Bark Channel Pathway. He recasts Kinnan. He casts Seedborn Muse. Mike ships the turn. At the end of Mike's turn, Cruz casts Snapback, exiling a blue card, bouncing Seedborn Muse. Mike discards the hand size, and the turn moves to Cruz. During his upkeep, Cruz loses his Mana Crypt roll and takes 3 damage. In response to his Mystic Remora, he casts Mystical Tutor. He fetches up a Silence onto the top of his library and then lets his Remora die. Still in Cruz's upkeep, Zach casts Beast Within, targeting Cruz's Ancient Tomb. Ancient Tomb is destroyed and Cruz creates a 3/3 beast. He draws and casts Silence. In response, Brandon flashes in a Dress Down. Dress Down enters and Brandon draws. Then Silence resolves, locking out opponents from casting spells this turn. Cruz casts Culling Ritual. It resolves, destroying all non-land permanents with mana value 2 or less, and Cruz adds 8 black and 6 green. He casts a Praetor's Grasp. He searches Brandon's library for a card into exile face down. He casts a Demonic Tutor through Praetor's Grasp, fetching up a card into his hand. He casts Peer into the Abyss. He draws half of his library and loses half of his life, rounded up. He plays a Command Tower for turn. He casts a Jeweled Lotus. He casts a Mox Opal. He casts a Soul Ring. He holds priority and then pays 2 life to cast Mental Misstep targeting Soul Ring. Still holding priority, he casts an Offer You Can't Refuse targeting Mental Misstep. Misstep is countered and Cruz creates 2 treasures. Soul Ring resolves and Cruz casts Demonic Tutor. He fetches up a card into his hand. He casts Thassa's Oracle. Oracle enters and in response, he casts Tainted Pact, exiling his library. Oracle's trigger resolves, and Louise wins the game. But Mike has a pre-game action, putting Gemstone Caverns onto the battlefield, exiling Yavimaya Coast. Brandon draws for turn and plays a Mana Confluence. He taps it to help cast a Mana Vault. He passes. Mike draws and plays a Misty Rainforest. He cracks it, pays a life, and fetches up a Tropical Island onto the battlefield. He casts a Bloom Tender. He ships the turn. Cruz draws and plays a Bloodstained Mire. He cracks it, pays a life, and fetches up an Underground Sea onto the battlefield. He casts Imperial Seal. He fetches up a card onto the top of his library and loses 2 life. He ends the turn. Zach draws and plays a Snow-Covered Forest. He casts a Finehorn Elves. He passes to Brandon. Brandon draws and plays a Misty Rainforest. He cracks it, pays a life, and fetches up an Underground Sea onto the battlefield. He casts his commander, Crom, Ludovic's Opus. He moves to Crombat and attacks Cruz with Crom. Cruz takes it, and Brandon gives the turn to Mike. Mike draws and plays a Verdant Catacombs. He cracks it, pays a life, and fetches up a forest onto the battlefield. He casts his commander, Kinnan, Bonder Prodigy. He casts a Springleaf Drum. Crom triggers and Brandon draws. He casts an Arcane Signet. He ends his turn. Cruz draws and plays a Mana Crypt. He casts a Time Twister. Crom triggers and Brandon draws. In response, Brandon casts Force of Negation, exiling a blue card, targeting Time Twister. Force counters and exiles Twister, and Cruz passes. Zach draws and plays a Snow-Covered Forest. He casts Wild Growth, enchanting his forest. He casts his commander, Selvala, Heart of the Wilds. He ships the turn to Brandon. During his draw step, Brandon takes the damage to his Mana Vault. He plays a Volcanic Island for turn. He taps his Mana Confluence to help cast his other commander, Timna the Weaver. He moves to combat and attacks Mike with Crom. Mike takes the hit, and in his second main phase, Brandon pays a life and draws a card through Timna. Brandon ends his turn. Mike draws and plays a Treasure Vault. He casts Wandering Archaic. He passes to Cruz. During his upkeep, Cruz wins his Mana Crypt roll. He draws and casts a Felwar Stone. He casts his commander, Thrasios, Triton Hero. Crom triggers and Brandon draws. He ships the turn. Zach draws and casts a Relic Golem. Selvala triggers and Zach draws. He taps Selvala for 6 green. He casts Survival of the Fittest and Brandon draws through Crom. In response, Brandon casts Pact of Negation, targeting Survival. Wandering Archaic triggers and Mike copies Pact, targeting Survival. Mike's Pact resolves, countering Survival, then the original Pact fizzles. Zach casts a Boreal Druid. He casts Wirewood Symbiote. He activates Wirewood Symbiote, bouncing Finehorn Elves to untap Selvala. He recasts Finehorn Elves. He plays a Snow-Covered Forest and gives the turn to Brandon. During his draw step, Brandon takes the damage through his Mana Ball. He draws and plays a Command Tower. He attacks Cruz with Crom. Cruz takes the hit, and in his second main phase, Brandon pays a life and draws a card through Timna. He casts an Arcane Signet. Brandon passes. At the end of Brandon's turn, Mike sacrifices his Treasure Vault, creating 2 treasures. During his upkeep, Mike pays for his Pact of Negation. He draws and activates Kinnan. He looks at the top 5 cards and puts a Nezahal, Primal Tide, onto the battlefield. Selvala triggers and Mike draws. He ends his turn. During his upkeep, Cruz wins his Mana Crypt roll. He draws, plays a City of Brass, and gives the turn to Zach. Zach draws, takes no actions, and passes. At the end of Zach's turn, Brandon casts Enlightened Tutor, Nezahal and Archaic trigger, and then Brandon taps Mana Confluence to pay for Archaic, and then Mike draws. He fetches up an Underworld Breach onto the top of his library. Still in Zach's end step, Zach activates Relic Golem, milling Brandon for 2. The table goes wild as Brandon takes his turn. During his draw step, Brandon takes the damage through his Mana Vault. He plays a Forbidden Orchard for turn. He moves to combat and attacks Mike with Crom. Mike takes it, and in his second main phase, Brandon pays a life and draws a card through Timna. He casts Rite of Flame. Nezahal and Archaic trigger, Mike draws and then copies Rite of Flame, adding 2 red. Then Brandon adds 2 red. He casts Dockside Extortionist. In response, Cruz activates Thrasios, scrying 1 and revealing a Flusterstorm into his hand. Still in response, Mike casts Force of Will, paying a life and exiling a blue card. In response, Brandon hard casts Mindbreak Trap, targeting Force of Will. This is when Brandon remembers the Wandering Archaic on the battlefield. Archaic and Nezahal trigger, Mike draws, and then Mike copies Mindbreak Trap, targeting Mindbreak Trap and Dockside. Trap resolves, exiling both spells. Brandon ends his turn. Mike draws and casts a Void Winnower. Selvala triggers and Mike draws a card. He casts a Mana Crypt and Brandon draws through Crom. He plays a Seagate Reborn into play untapped, paying 3 life. He casts Seedborn Muse. He attacks Cruz with Nezahal and Wandering Archaic. Cruz takes it and Mike passes. At the end of Mike's turn, Cruz taps his City of Brass to help cast a Mystical Tutor. Nezahal and Archaic trigger, Mike copies Mystical Tutor, fetching up a Cyclonic Rift onto the top of his library. He then draws through Nezahal. Then Cruz fetches up a Windfall onto the top of his library. Mike untaps his permanents with Cruise through Seedborn Muse. During Cruise's upkeep, Mike casts an overloaded Cyclonic Rift. In response, Cruise floats a black and 2 colorless. Zach activates Selvala, floating 6 green. Still in response, Zach activates Wirewood Symbiote, bouncing Finehorn Elves to untap Selvala. He then taps Selvala for another 6 green. Cyclonic Rift resolves, bouncing all non-land permanents. Cruise draws, takes no actions, and passes. At the end of Cruise's turn, Zach casts Nature's Claim, targeting Mike's Mana Crypt. Mike draws through Nezahal and then chooses not to copy it. Nature's Claim resolves, Mana Crypt is destroyed, and Mike gains 4 life. Still in the end step, Mike activates Kinnan. He looks at the top 5 cards of his library, failing to find. The turn moves to Zach. Mike untaps his permanents with Zach through Seedborn. Zach draws and casts a Wild Growth, enchanting his snow-covered forest. Nezahal triggers and Mike draws. He recasts Boreal Druid. He recasts Finehorn Elves. He recasts Wirewood Symbiote. Zach ends his turn. At the end of Zach's turn, Mike activates Kinnan. He looks at the top 5, putting Tidespout Tyrant onto the battlefield. Mike untaps his permanents with Brandon through Seedborn Muse. During Brandon's upkeep, Mike activates Kinnan, looking at the top 5, putting Hullbreaker Horror onto the battlefield. Brandon draws and then casts Toxic Deluge, paying 9 life. Nezahal triggers and Mike draws. In response to Deluge, Mike casts Unsubstantiate, targeting Wirewood Symbiote, triggering Tidespout Tyrant and Hullbreaker Horror. He bounces Cruise's Underground Sea and then Toxic Deluge. Brandon taps Forbidden Orchard to help cast Mana Vault, giving Cruise the Spirit. He taps his Mana Confluence to help recast Toxic Deluge, paying 9 life again. Nezahal triggers and Mike draws a card. In response, he discards 3 cards into exile through Nezahal. Toxic Deluge resolves, killing all creatures. Brandon ships the turn. At the end of Brandon's turn, Nezahal returns to the battlefield. Mike draws and plays an Ancient Tomb. He taps Ancient Tomb to recast Kinnan. He casts Rhystic Study. He moves to combat and attacks Brandon with Nezahal. Brandon takes it, and Mike gives the turn to Cruise. Cruise draws and replays his Underground Sea. He casts a Mana Crypt. Rhystic and Nezahal trigger, and Mike draws 2. He casts a Felwar Stone, and Mike draws 2 again. He taps the City of Brass to help cast Windfall, triggering Nezahal and Rhystic Study. Mike draws from Nezahal and then declines to draw through Rhystic. Windfall resolves, and each player discards their hand and draws 7. He casts a Mox Diamond, and Mike draws 2 through Nezahal and Study. Diamond resolves, and Cruise discards a Scalding Tarn. He casts a Mystic Remora, and Mike draws 2 again. He gives the turn to Zach. Zach draws and plays a Snow-Covered Forest. He recasts Selvala, and Mike draws through Rhystic. He passes the turn. During his draw step, Brandon takes the damage through his Mana Vault. He draws and casts a Jeweled Lotus. Cruise draws through Mystic Remora, and Mike draws 2 through Nezahal and Study. He plays an Exotic Orchard. He sacrifices Jeweled Lotus to help recast Tymna, letting Mike draw. He taps his Mana Confluence, going to 1 life to help cast Thassa's Oracle. He pays 1 for Rhystic. Thassa's Oracle resolves, and Brandon looks at the top 2 cards of his library. He puts one on top and the other on bottom. He ships the turn to Mike. At the end of Brandon's turn, Mike channels Colossal Sky Turtle, returning Force of Will to his hand. Mike draws and plays a Command Tower. He casts a Soul Ring, letting Cruise draw. He casts Basalt Monolith, and Cruise draws again. He taps the Monolith for 4 colorless through Kinnan, and then untaps it for 3. He repeats this process for infinite colorless mana. He casts a Mirage Mirror, paying for Remora. He presents a loop of holding priority, activating Mirage Mirror, targeting his Command Tower and Basalt Monolith, and then is able to tap it for any color, and then untapping it, generating infinite mana of all colors. He activates Kinnan, putting all non-humans from his library onto the battlefield, including a Thrasios Triton hero. He activates Thrasios, putting all lands onto the battlefield tapped and the remaining cards into his hand. He casts a Finale of Devastation where X equals 420,069, giving all of his creatures haste. He moves to combat, attacks for lethal, and Mike wins the game. Peter had the coolest sleeves at the table, so he gets to start us off. Peter draws a card for turn and plays a Swamp. He casts a Jeweled Lotus. He sacrifices it and pays 6 life to help cast his commander, Kirik, son of Yawgmoth. Off to a good start, he ships the turn to Cal. Cal draws and plays a Steam Vents into play untapped, paying 2 life. He casts Ragavan, Nimble Pilferer. He passes the turn to Sean. Sean draws and plays a Taiga. He casts a Soul Ring. He casts a Mox Amber. He gives the turn to Alex. Alex draws and plays a Windswept Teeth. He cracks it, pays a life, and fetches up a tropical island onto the battlefield. He casts a Finehorn Elves. He casts Mox Amber. He passes the turn. Peter draws and plays a Crystal Vein. He pays 2 life to help cast Buried Alive. Kirik triggers, and in response, Alex casts Daze for his alternate cost, bouncing his tropical island, countering Buried Alive. Then Kirik gets a +1/+1 counter, and Peter moves to combat. He attacks Alex with Kirik. Alex takes the hit, Peter gains 3, and ends his turn. Cal draws and plays a Windswept Teeth. He cracks it, pays a life, and fetches up a tropical island onto the battlefield. He casts a Soul Ring. He casts his commander, Malcolm, Keen-Eyed Navigator. He moves to combat and attacks Peter with Ragavan. Peter takes it, and Ragavan and Malcolm trigger. Cal creates a treasure through Malcolm, then another through Ragavan, and then Peter exiles Chain of Smog. With 1 combo piece removed, Cal passes the turn to Sean. Sean draws and plays a Verdant Catacombs. He cracks it, pays a life, and fetches up a tropical island onto the battlefield. He casts a Chrome Mox, imprinting Eldritch Evolution. He casts his commander, Thrasios, Triton Hero. He casts Invasion of Ikoria, where X equals 2, targeting Peter. Invasion of Ikoria enters, and Sean fetches up a Dockside Extortionist onto the battlefield. Dockside enters, and in response, Cal sacks his 2 treasures. Then Sean creates 2 of his own. He sacrifices his treasures and his Chrome Mox as an additional cost to help cast his commander, Dargo the Shipwrecker. All through, he ships the turn. Alex draws and plays a tropical island. He casts his commander, Kinnan, Bonder Prodigy, and then passes the turn. Peter draws, plays a swamp, and gives the turn to Cal. Cal draws and moves to combat. He attacks Peter with Malcolm and Alex with Ragavan. They both take the damage, and Ragavan and Malcolm trigger. Cal creates 2 treasures through Malcolm, then another through Ragavan, and then Alex exiles Basalt Monolith. Cal lets out a series of hoots with another combo piece removed, and he moves to his second main phase. He casts a Spellskite. He passes the turn to Sean. Sean draws and plays a command tower. He moves to combat and attacks Peter with Dargo. Peter takes the hit, and Sean ships the turn to Alex. Alex draws and plays an Ancient Tomb. He taps it to help cast Rhystic Study. He casts Glenelendra Archmage. In response, Sean activates Thrasios, scrying 1 and revealing a Pact of Negation into his hand. Glenelendra resolves, and Alex passes the turn. Peter draws and plays a Swamp. He casts a Lotus Petal, paying the Rhystic tax. He gives the turn to Cal. Cal draws and moves to combat. He attacks Peter with Malcolm and Alex with Ragavan. Alex blocks Ragavan with Glenelendra. Peter takes the hit, Glenelendra and Ragavan trade, then Malcolm and Glenelendra trigger. Alex returns Glenelendra to the battlefield through Persist, and Cal creates a treasure through Malcolm. Cal, having nothing better to do, thinks about casting Tana, but decides to pass the turn. Sean draws and plays a Mana Confluence. He moves to combat and attacks Peter with Dargo. In response, Peter casts Saw in Half, targeting Dargo, and Alex draws through Rhystic. Kirik triggers and gets a 1/1 counter. Then Saw in Half resolves, destroying Dargo, and Sean creates 2 miniaturized Dargo tokens, sacking 1 to the legendary rule. All through, Sean ships this wreck to Alex. Alex draws, plays an island, and passes the turn to Peter. Peter draws, takes no actions, and gives the turn to Cal. Cal draws and moves to combat. He attacks Peter with Malcolm. Peter takes the hit, Cal creates a treasure through Malcolm, and then he passes his turn. At the end of Cal's turn, Sean activates Thrasios, scrying 1 and revealing a City of Brass onto the battlefield tapped. Sean draws and plays a Bloodstained Mire. He cracks it, pays a life, and fetches up a Volcanic Island onto the battlefield. With nothing else, he ends his turn. At the end of Sean's turn, Alex taps his Ancient Tomb to help activate Kinnan. He looks at the top 5, but fails to find. Alex draws and plays a Waterlogged Grove. He casts a Lotus Petal. He activates Kinnan, looks at the top 5, and puts Phantasmal Image onto the battlefield. Phantasmal Image enters as a copy of Dockside Extortionist. Dockside triggers, and in response, Peter sacrifices his Lotus Petal, and Cal sacrifices his 5 treasures. Then Alex creates 4 treasures through Dockside. Alex casts Wandering Archaic. In response, Peter casts Vampiric Tutor, paying the Rhystic tax. Kirik triggers and gains a counter. In response, Sean activates Thrasios, scrying 1 and revealing a Dispel into his hand. Sean then casts Dispel, countering Vampiric Tutor, and Alex draws through Rhystic. With Archaic still in the stack, Sean puts on his Table Police badge and casts Pact of Negation, targeting Wandering Archaic. Rhystic triggers and Alex draws. In response, Alex taps Waterlogged Grove to help cast Crop Rotation, sacrificing Grove as an additional cost, fetching up a Gaia's Cradle onto the battlefield. Then Pact resolves, countering Wandering Archaic. Alex activates Kinnan, looks at the top 5, and puts a Consecrated Sphinx onto the battlefield. Sitting pretty, he ships the turn. At the end of Alex's turn, Cal casts Veil of Summer, paying for Rhystic. Cal draws a card, then Alex draws 2 through Consecrated Sphinx, and then they move to Peter's turn. Peter draws, and Alex draws 2 through Consecrated Sphinx. He does nothing else and gives the turn to Cal. Cal draws, and Alex draws 2 through Sphinx. Cal moves to combat and attacks Sean with Malcolm. Sean takes it, Malcolm triggers, and Cal creates a treasure. In his second main phase, Cal casts Corridor Monitor, paying for Rhystic. In response, Peter sacrifices his Crystal Vein to hard cast Snuff Out, targeting Consecrated Sphinx, paying the Rhystic tax. Kirik triggers and gets a counter. Alex, not wanting to lose his Golden Goose, casts Fierce Guardianship for its alternate cost, targeting Snuff Out. In response, Sean taps his City of Brass and his Mana Confluence to help activate Thrasios, scrying 1 and revealing a Swan Song into his hand. Sphinx triggers and Alex draws 2. In response to Fierce Guardianship, Cal casts Spell Pierce, targeting Fierce. Rhystic triggers and Alex draws. Then Spell Pierce counters Fierce, Snuff Out destroys Consecrated Sphinx, and Corridor Monitor resolves. Monitor enters and Cal untaps his Sol Ring. All through, Cal passes the turn to Sean. During his upkeep, Sean pays for his Pact of Negation. He draws and plays a Windswept Teeth. He cracks it, pays a life, and fetches up a Stomping Ground onto the battlefield untapped, paying 2 life. He sacrifices his Dargo token, Thrasios, Mox Amber, and Sol Ring as an additional cost, and recasts his commander, Dargo. Rhystic triggers and Alex draws. Sean casts Life's Legacy, sacrificing Dargo as an additional cost. Rhystic triggers and Alex draws again. In response, Alex sacrifices Glenelendra, countering Life's Legacy. Sean, not wanting Dargo's cost reduction to go to waste, again casts Dargo the Shipwrecker, and Alex draws through Rhystic. He gives the turn to Alex. During Alex's upkeep, Cal casts March of Swirling Mist where X equals 1, targeting Kinnan, paying the Rhystic tax. In response, Alex activates Kinnan, looks at the top 5, and puts Jin-Gitaxias, Progress Tyrant, onto the battlefield. March resolves and Kinnan phases out. Alex draws for turn and plays a command tower. He casts a Mystic Remora. He casts Lawan, Cephalid Empress. Empress enters, bouncing Malcolm and Corridor Monitor back to Kyle's hand. Alex passes, discarding to hand size. Peter draws, takes no actions, and ships the turn. Cal draws and pays 2 life to cast Gitaxian Probe, targeting Alex. Jin-Gitaxias, Rhystic, and Mystic all trigger. Alex draws through Mystic and Rhystic, then Jin-Gitaxias counters Gitaxian Probe. Cal, getting ready to be roasted in the comments, gives the turn to Sean. Sean draws and moves to combat. He attacks the invasion of Ikoria with Dargo. He defeats it, the invasion is exiled, and then Sean casts the backside, Zilortha, Apex of Ikoria, paying for Rhystic. He passes the turn to Alex. Before Alex is untapped, Kinnan phases back in. During his upkeep, he pays for his Mystic Remora. He draws and plays Nykthos, Shrine to Nyx. He taps his Ancient Tomb to help activate Nykthos, adding 7 blue. He casts Finale of Devastation where X equals 10. Jin-Gitaxias triggers and creates a copy of Finale. In response, Sean casts Swansong, targeting the original Finale of Devastation. Jin-Gitaxias, Rhystic, and Mystic all trigger. Alex draws through Mystic, Sean pays for Rhystic, and Jin-Gitaxias counters Swansong. Sean then taps his City of Brass and his Mana Confluence to help hardcast Mindbreak Trap, targeting both finales. Rhystic and Mystic both trigger, and Alex draws. In response, Alex casts Delay, targeting Mindbreak Trap. Cal, wanting to make up for his previous play, casts an Offer You Can't Refuse, targeting Delay, paying for Rhystic. Mystic triggers, and Alex draws. Alex refuses the offer and pays 2 life to cast Mental Misstep, targeting an Offer You Can't Refuse. The table, out of answers, resigns to their fate. Misstep counters Offer, Delay counters and suspends Mindbreak Trap with 3 time counters, then the first copy of Finale of Devastation resolves. Alex fetches up a Hullbreaker Horror onto the battlefield. The original Finale resolves, and he fetches up a Deadeye Navigator onto the battlefield. Deadeye enters and soul bonds with Phantasmal Image. Alex presents a loop of activating Phantasmal Image's new ability to exile it, return to the battlefield as a Dockside Extortionist, create 2 treasures, then crack a treasure to create 2 mana through Kinnan to again blink Phantasmal Image. He does this until he has infinite treasures. Alex then activates Kinnan until he puts Thrasios Triton Hero onto the battlefield. He uses his infinite treasures to draw his deck. He casts Thassa's Oracle. Oracle enters, and Alex wins the game. Sean had the most banned cards in the command zone and gets to start us off. Sean draws a card for turn and plays a Tarnished Citadel. He casts a Mana Crypt. He taps his Citadel to help cast Wishclaw Talisman. He passes. Ryan draws and plays a Mana Confluence. He casts a Black Lotus. He cracks his Lotus to cast his commander, Thada Adel, Acquisitor. He taps Mana Confluence to cast Grafdigger's Cage. He ends the turn. Nick draws and plays a Forbidden Orchard. He casts Mox Diamond, discarding Bloodstained Mire. He taps Forbidden Orchard, giving John a 1/1 Spirit to help cast Cursed Totem. He ships the turn. John draws and plays a Rejuvenating Springs. He moves to combat and attacks Sean with the Spirit. Sean takes it, and John passes the turn. During his upkeep, Sean loses his Mana Crypt flip and takes 3 damage. He draws and plays a Volcanic Island. He activates Wishclaw, fetching up a card into his hand and giving Wishclaw to John. He casts Wheel of Fortune. Each player discards their hand and draws 7. He casts Mox Pearl. He casts Black Lotus. He ships the turn to Ryan. Ryan draws and plays an Ancient Tomb. He moves to combat and attacks Sean with Thada Adel. Sean takes it, and Thada triggers. Ryan searches Sean's library and exiles a Time Vault. He taps his Ancient Tomb to cast Time Vault. He ends his turn. Nick draws and casts Mox Opal. He pays 2 life to cast Gitaxian Probe, targeting Ryan. He looks at Ryan's hand and draws a card. He casts Demonic Tutor, fetching up a card into his hand. He plays Tolarian Academy. He casts Time Walk, getting an extra turn. He passes the turn to himself. Nick draws and taps Forbidden Orchard, giving John a Spirit to help cast Praetor's Grasp, targeting Sean. He fetches up a card from Sean's library into exile face down. He ships the turn. John draws and activates Wishclaw, fetching up a card into his hand and giving Wishclaw to Nick. He casts a Mana Crypt. He moves to combat and attacks Nick with the Spirit. Nick takes it, and in his second main phase, John casts Amulet of Vigor. He passes. At the end of John's turn, Sean flashes in a Hull Breacher. During his upkeep, Sean wins his Mana Crypt flip. He draws and plays a Forbidden Orchard. He casts Defense Grid. In response, Nick flashes in a Hull Breacher of his own. Then Defense Grid resolves. Sean casts Crop Rotation, sacrificing Volcanic Island as an additional cost, fetching up a Tolarian Academy onto the battlefield. He casts Windfall. With no answers, Windfall resolves. Here's the problem. There are 2 Hull Breachers on the battlefield. So in this case, due to how Hull Breacher works, Sean gets Nick's treasures and Nick gets Sean's. And each other player chooses who gets their treasure. So Ryan and John each choose to divide the treasures equally. Each player discards their hands, no one draws any cards, and Sean and Nick each create 14 treasures. Next, Sean casts his commander, Golos, Tireless Pilgrim. Golos enters, and Sean fetches up a Caracas onto the battlefield tapped. He pays 3 and puts his companion, Lutri the Spellchaser, into his hand. After an interesting turn of events, Sean passes the turn. Ryan draws and moves straight to combat. He attacks John with Thada Adel. John blocks with the Spirit token, and Ryan ends his turn. Nick draws and activates Wishclaw Talisman. He fetches up a card into his hand and gives Wishclaw to Sean. He casts Mnemonic Betrayal. Each opponent exiles their graveyards. He casts a Black Lotus from exile. He casts another Black Lotus from exile. He casts Voltaic Key from exile. He casts Whir of Invention from exile, where X equals 2, fetching up a Time Vault onto the battlefield. He activates Voltaic Key, untapping Time Vault. He activates Time Vault to take an extra turn. He presents a loop of using Key to untap Vault and then using Vault to take extra turns. He keeps taking turns until he casts Laboratory Maniac, then attempts to draw from an empty library, and Nick wins the game. Ryan draws and pays 2 life to cast Jataxian Probe, targeting Sean. He looks at Sean's hand and draws a card. He plays an Ancient Tomb for turn. He casts a Mox Sapphire. He taps Ancient Tomb to cast Arcane Signet. He casts a Manifold Key. He ships the turn. Nick draws and plays an Underground Sea. He casts Mystic Remora. He ends his turn. John draws and plays a City of Brass. He taps it to help cast Amulet of Vigor. Remora triggers and Nick draws. John passes the turn. Sean draws and plays a City of Brass. He casts Mox Emerald and Nick draws through Remora. He casts a Mana Vault and Nick draws again. Sean ends his turn. Ryan draws and plays a Misty Rainforest. He cracks it, pays a life, and fetches up a snow-covered island onto the battlefield. He casts the One Ring, and Nick draws through Remora. The One Ring enters, and Ryan gains protection from everything until his next turn. He activates the One Ring, adding a burden counter and drawing a card. He activates Manifold Key, untapping the One Ring. He activates the One Ring, adding a burden counter and drawing 2 cards. All through, he ships the turn. During Nick's upkeep, Mystic Remora triggers. In response, Sean taps City of Brass to cast Ancestral Recall. Nick draws through Remora, and then Sean draws 3. Then Nick pays to keep his Mystic Remora. He draws and casts Mox Diamond, discarding Godless Shrine. He plays an Exotic Orchard for turn. He casts a Mana Vault. He casts a Rhystic Study. He casts a Manifold Key. Finished up, he passes the turn to John. John draws and plays an Otawara, Soaring City. He taps his City of Brass to help cast his commander, Kinnan, Prodigy. Rhystic triggers and Nick draws. He casts Mox Amber. Rhystic and Mystic trigger and Nick draws 2. John ships the turn. Sean draws and plays a Forbidden Orchard. He taps the City of Brass and his Forbidden Orchard, giving Nick a Spirit to help cast Lotho, Corrupt Sheriff, paying the Rhystic tax. He ends his turn. During his upkeep, Ryan loses 2 life from the One Ring. He draws and plays an Academy Ruins. He activates the One Ring, adds a burden counter, and draws 3 cards. He taps his Ancient Tomb to help cast Acquire, targeting Sean. Mystic and Rhystic trigger, and Nick draws 2. In response, John casts an Offer You Can't Refuse, targeting Acquire, and Nick draws 2 again. In response, Ryan casts Force of Will for its alternate cost, paying a life and exiling a blue card, targeting Offer. Rhystic, Mystic, and Lotho trigger. Sean loses a life and creates a treasure, and Nick draws 2. In response, John casts Flusterstorm, with all copies targeting Acquire. Rhystic, Mystic, and Lotho trigger. Sean loses a life and creates a treasure, and Nick draws 2 more. Flusterstorm resolves, Acquire is countered, and Force counters Offer. Next, Ryan activates Voltaic Key, targeting the One Ring, untapping it. He activates the One Ring, adding a burden counter and drawing 4 cards. All through, he passes the turn. During his upkeep, Nick pays to keep his Remora. During his draw step, he takes a damage through his Mana Vault. He draws and casts a Mox Pearl. He plays a Tolarian Academy for turn. He casts Voltaic Key. Lotho triggers and Sean loses a life and creates a treasure. Nick activates Manifold Key, untapping his Mana Vault. He taps his Vault and adds 3 colorless, then untaps it with Voltaic Key. He taps it for 3 more to help cast an overloaded Cyclonic Rift. In response, Sean sacrifices his treasures and floats mana. Then Cyclonic Rift resolves, and each of Nick's opponents bounce all of their non-land permanents. Next, Nick casts Time Walk. In response, Sean casts an Offer You Can't Refuse. Rhystic and Remora trigger, and Nick draws 2. In response, Nick casts Dispel, targeting Offer. In response, John pays 2 life to cast Mental Misstep, targeting Dispel. Rhystic and Remora trigger, and Nick draws 2. With nothing else, Misstep counters Dispel, Offer counters Time Walk, and Nick creates 2 treasures. He moves to combat and attacks Sean with the Spirit. With nothing else, Nick passes, discarding to hand size. John draws and plays an Urza Saga, getting its first counter. He taps the City of Brass to cast his commander, Kinnan, Prodigy, paying the Rhystic tax. He casts a Mox Amber, and Nick draws from Rhystic and Remora. He casts an Amulet of Vigor. Remora and Rhystic trigger, John pays for Rhystic, and Nick draws from Remora. John ends his turn. Sean draws and casts Mox Emerald, Mystic and Rhystic trigger, and Nick draws 2. Sean casts Mana Vault, and Nick draws 2 more. Sean taps his Forbidden Orchard, giving Ryan a Spirit to cast Dark Ritual. Nick draws 2 from Rhystic and Remora, and then Sean adds 3 black. He exiles Selfish Spirit Guide from his hand, adding a green. He casts Wishclaw Talisman, and Nick draws 2. He activates Wishclaw, fetching up a card into his hand and giving Wishclaw to John. He casts Entomb, and Nick draws 2. Then Sean fetches up a Grizzlebrand into his graveyard. He taps the City of Brass to help cast Time Walk. Mystic and Rhystic trigger, Sean pays for Rhystic, and Nick draws from Remora. In response, Nick casts Spell Pierce, countering Time Walk. Denied an extra turn, Sean passes the turn to Ryan. Ryan draws and casts Cyclonic Rift, targeting Rhystic Study. Mystic and Rhystic trigger, and Nick draws 2. In response, Nick casts Silence. Silence resolves, locking out opponents from casting spells this turn. Then Cyclonic Rift resolves, and Nick bounces Rhystic Study to his hand. Locked out of casting anything else, Ryan ships the turn. During his upkeep, Nick lets his Remora die. During his draw step, he takes a damage from his Mana Vault. In his main phase, he casts a Chrome Mox, imprinting Rhystic Study. He casts Ranger Captain of Eos, declining to search as it enters. He sacrifices Ranger Captain, locking out opponents from non-creature spells this turn. He casts a Time Vault. He activates Voltaic Key, untapping his Time Vault. He activates Time Vault, getting an extra turn. He presents a loop of using Key to untap Vault and taking extra turns. He does this over and over, drawing his deck. He casts Thassa's Oracle. Oracle enters, and Nick wins the game. Nick draws and plays a Flooded Strand. He cracks it, pays a life, and fetches up a Tundra onto the battlefield. He casts a Mystic Remora. In response, not wanting a repeat of last game, John pays 2 life to cast Mental Misstep, countering Remora. Nick ends his turn. John draws and casts Mox Emerald. He plays a Yavimaya Coast as his land for turn. He exiles Elvish Spirit Guide from his hand, adding a green. He taps Yavimaya Coast to help cast his commander, Kinnan, Bonder Prodigy. He ships the turn. Sean draws and plays a Mana Confluence. He casts Chrome Mox, imprinting Reanimate. He passes to Ryan. Ryan draws and plays a Snow-Covered Island. He casts Black Lotus. He cracks the Lotus to help cast his commander, Thada Adel, Acquisitor. He casts a Soul Ring. He casts a Mana Vault. He ends the turn. Nick draws and plays an Underground Sea. He casts Witchclaw Talisman. He passes. John draws and taps Yavimaya Coast to cast Brainstorm. He draws 3 and puts 2 back on top. He plays a Windswept Heath for turn. He cracks it, pays a life, and fetches up a tropical island onto the battlefield. He casts a Time Twister. Each player shuffles their hand and graveyard into their libraries and draws 7. He casts a Mox Diamond, discarding Verdant Catacombs. He moves to combat and attacks Sean with Kinnan. Sean takes it, and John passes. Sean draws and plays a Volcanic Island. He casts a Time Vault. In response, Ryan casts Commandeer for its alternate cost, exiling 2 blue cards, targeting Time Vault. Commandeer resolves, and Ryan gains control of Time Vault. With Time Vault still in the stack, John casts Rapid Hybridization, targeting Thada Adel. Thada is destroyed, and Ryan creates a 3/3 Frog Lizard. Then Time Vault resolves. Sean casts a Mana Crypt. He casts a Mana Vault. He casts his commander, Golos, Tireless Pilgrim. Golos triggers, and Sean fetches up a Tolarian Academy onto the battlefield tapped. He ends the turn. Ryan draws and plays an Inventor's Fair. He casts Voltaic Key. In response, Sean pays 2 life to cast Mental Misstep, countering the key. The table narrowly missed disaster, and Ryan follows up with a Manifold Key. All out of interaction, Key resolves. Ryan activates Key, untapping Time Vault. He taps Time Vault to take an extra turn. He presents a loop of using Manifold Key to untap Time Vault and activating Time Vault to take an extra turn. During his extra turns, he recasts his commander, Thada Adel. And since each opponent has an island, he attacks his opponents each turn. They all eventually take 21 commander damage, die, and Ryan wins the game. John draws and plays a command tower. He casts Black Lotus. He casts Mox Diamond, discarding Urza Saga. He exiles Elvish Spirit Guide from his hand, adding a green. He casts a Soul Ring. He cracks Black Lotus to help cast a turn 1 Nezahal Primal Tide. Off to an amazing start. John passes. Sean draws and plays a Forbidden Orchard. He casts a Mana Crypt. Nezahal triggers, and John draws a card. Sean taps Forbidden Orchard, giving Ryan a spirit to cast Demonic Consultation. Nezahal triggers, and John draws. Consultation resolves, and Sean names Black Lotus. He exiles the top 6, then exiles, and exiles, and exiles until he reveals Black Lotus, putting it into his hand. He casts Black Lotus, and John draws from Nezahal. He casts Necropotence, and John draws again. Sean activates Necropotence 21 times, paying 21 life and exiling 21 cards, going down to 1 card in his library. He moves to his end step and puts the exiled cards into his hand. He passes, discarding to hand size, exiling the discarded cards. Ryan draws and plays a Tolarian Academy. He casts Mox Sapphire, and John draws from Nezahal. He casts Cyclonic Rift, targeting Nezahal. Nezahal triggers, and John draws. In response, John activates Nezahal, discarding 3 cards. Nezahal is exiled, and Cyclonic Rift fizzles. Ryan moves to combat and attacks Nick with his spirit. Nick takes it, and Ryan passes. At the end of Ryan's turn, Nezahal re-enters the battlefield tapped. Nick draws, plays an Underground Sea, and passes. John draws and moves straight to combat. He attacks Sean with Nezahal. Sean takes it, and in his second main phase, John casts Ancestral Recall, targeting Sean. In response, Sean pays 2 life to cast Mental Misstep, targeting Ancestral. Nezahal triggers, and John draws. In response, Nick casts Dispel, targeting Mental Misstep. Nezahal triggers, and in response, Sean casts Force of Negation for its alternate cost, exiling Swansong, targeting Ancestral. Nezahal triggers, and John draws again. In response, John casts Brainstorm. He draws 3 and puts 2 back on top. Still in response, Nick casts Force of Will, paying a life and exiling a blue card, targeting Force of Negation. Nezahal triggers, and John draws again. With no other answers, Force of Will counters Force of Negation, Dispel counters Mental Misstep, John draws from Nezahal, then Ancestral Recall resolves. Sean attempts to draw from an empty library and loses the game. The table admires Sean's Power 9 on display, and then John passes the turn. Ryan draws and moves to combat. He attacks Nick with his spirit. Nick takes it, and Ryan ships the turn. Nick draws and plays a City of Traitors. He casts Wishclaw Talisman, and John draws from Nezahal. He casts Grafdigger's Cage, and John draws again. Nick ends his turn. John draws and moves to combat. He attacks Nick with Nezahal. Nick takes the hit, and John passes the turn. Ryan draws and plays a snow-covered island. He casts his commander, Thada Adel Acquisitor. He passes. Nick draws and activates Wishclaw Talisman, fetching up a card into his hand and giving Wishclaw to Ryan. He casts a Mystic Remora, and John draws from Nezahal. In response, John hard casts Fierce Guardianship, countering Remora. Nick passes the turn. John draws and moves straight to combat. He attacks Nick with Nezahal. Nick takes it, and in his second main phase, John casts Mox Opal. He floats mana and then casts Dramatic Reversal, untapping his non-land permanents. He casts Capture of Jing Shao, getting an extra turn. He casts his commander, Kinnan, Bonder Prodigy. He passes the turn to himself. John draws and moves to combat. He attacks Nick with everything. Nick takes it, and in his second main phase, John plays a Yavimaya Coast. He casts Paradox Engine. He casts Whir of Invention, where X equals 2. Paradox Engine triggers, and John untaps his non-land permanents. Whir resolves, and John fetches up a Time Vault onto the battlefield. He casts Tezzeret the Seeker. Engine triggers, and John untaps. He activates Time Vault to take an extra turn. He presents a loop of using Tezzeret's first ability or Paradox Engine to untap Time Vault and take infinite turns. He attacks his opponents over and over with Nezahal until they die, and John wins the game. Corey had the most expensive shoes and gets to start us off. Corey draws for turn and plays a Flooded Strand. He casts a Jeweled Lotus. He sacrifices it to help cast his commander, Malcolm, Keen-Eyed Navigator. He cracks his Flooded Strand, pays a life, and fetches up a Volcanic Island onto the battlefield. He casts a Gamble. He fetches up a card into his hand and then randomly discards a Niv Mizzet Perun. He casts a Mana Crypt. He ships the turn to Ryan. Ryan draws and plays a Polluted Delta. He cracks it, pays a life, and fetches up an Underground Sea onto the battlefield. He casts Imperial Seal. He fetches up a card onto the top of his library and loses 2 life. He passes. Mike draws and plays a Flooded Strand. He cracks it, pays a life, and fetches up a Tropical Island onto the battlefield. He gives the turn to Zach. Zach draws and plays a Forest. He casts a Mana Crypt. He casts a Soul Ring. He casts a Chrome Mox, imprinting Unexpectedly Absent. He casts his commander, Arden, Intrepid Archaeologist. He casts a Null Rod. He ends his turn. During his upkeep, Corey loses his Mana Crypt roll and takes 3 damage. He draws and moves to combat. He attacks Zach with Malcolm. Zach takes it, Malcolm triggers, and Corey creates a treasure. He passes. Ryan draws and plays a Scalding Tarn. He casts a Mana Crypt. He ships the turn. Mike draws and plays a Yavimaya Coast. He taps it to help cast his commander, Kinnan, Bonder Prodigy. He casts a Mox Amber. He ends the turn. During his upkeep, Zach loses his Mana Crypt roll and takes 3 damage. He draws and moves to combat. He attacks Corey with Arden. Corey takes it, and in his second main phase, Zach plays a Sacred Foundry into play tapped. He gives the turn to Corey. During his upkeep, Corey loses his Mana Crypt roll and takes 3 damage. He draws and pays 2 life to cast Ditaxian Probe, targeting Ryan. He looks at Ryan's hand and draws a card. He moves to combat and attacks Ryan with Malcolm. Ryan takes it, Malcolm triggers, and Corey creates a treasure. He ships the turn. At the end of Corey's turn, Ryan cracks his Scalding Tarn, pays a life, and fetches up a Volcanic Island onto the battlefield. He casts a Vampiric Tutor. He fetches up a card onto the top of his library and loses 2 life. The turn moves to Ryan. During his upkeep, Ryan loses his Mana Crypt roll and takes 3 damage. He draws and plays an Exotic Orchard. He casts a Demonic Tutor. He fetches up a card into his hand. After 3 tutors over 3 turns, Ryan ships the turn to Mike. Mike draws and moves to combat. He attacks Ryan with Kinnan. Ryan takes it, and Mike passes. During his upkeep, Zach wins his Mana Crypt roll. He draws and moves to combat. He attacks Corey with Arden. Corey takes it, and in his second main phase, Zach casts Birds of Paradise. He gives the turn to Corey. During his upkeep, Corey loses his Mana Crypt roll and takes 3 damage. He draws and moves to combat. He attacks Ryan with Malcolm. Ryan takes it, Malcolm triggers, and Corey creates a treasure. He passes the turn. During his upkeep, Ryan wins his Mana Crypt roll. He draws and plays a Wooded Foothills. He cracks it, pays a life, and fetches up a Tropical Island onto the battlefield. He casts Thassa's Oracle. Oracle enters, and in response, Ryan casts a Mana Consultation. In response, Corey pays 2 life to cast Mental Misstep, countering Consultation. Oracle's trigger resolves, and Ryan looks at the top 2, putting 1 on top and the rest on bottom. With his win countered, Ryan ships the turn. At the end of Ryan's turn, Mike casts a Veil of Summer, drawing a card. Mike draws and plays a Command Tower. He moves to combat and attacks Corey with Kinnan. Corey takes it, and Mike ends his turn. During his upkeep, Zach loses his Mana Crypt roll and takes 3 damage. He draws and casts a Sword of Fire and Ice. In response, Mike casts Mana Drain, countering Sword. Zach moves to combat and attacks Mike with Arden. Mike takes it, and Zach passes. During his upkeep, Corey loses his Mana Crypt roll and takes 3 damage. He draws and moves to combat. He attacks Ryan with Malcolm. Ryan takes it, Malcolm triggers, and Corey creates a treasure. Still unable to cast any spells, he ships the turn. During his upkeep, Ryan wins his Mana Crypt roll. He draws and casts a Wheel of Fortune. In response, Corey casts Mystical Tutor. In response, Mike casts Swan Song, targeting Tutor. Mystical Tutor is countered, and Corey creates a 2/2 bird. Then Wheel of Fortune resolves, and each player discards their hand and draws 7. Ryan plays a Tundra for turn. He casts Mox Diamond, discarding Forbidden Orchard. He casts a Deathrite Shaman. He passes. Mike draws, and in his first main phase, he adds 3 colorless through Mana Drain. He plays a Rejuvenating Springs for turn. He casts Seedborn Muse. He moves to combat and attacks Zach with Kinnan. Zach takes it, and Mike ends his turn. Mike untaps with Zach through Seedborn. During his upkeep, Zach loses his Mana Crypt roll and takes 3 damage. He draws and plays a Wooded Foothills. He cracks it, pays a life, and fetches up a Savannah onto the battlefield. He casts Yasharn, Implacable Earth. Yasharn enters and Zach fetches up a plains and a forest into his hand. He passes, discarding to hand size. Mike untaps with Corey through Seedborn. During his upkeep, Corey loses his mana crypt roll and takes 3 damage. He draws and plays a Taiga. He casts Curiosity, targeting Malcolm. He moves to combat and attacks Mike with Malcolm. Mike takes it, Malcolm and Curiosity trigger, Corey draws and then creates a treasure. In his second main phase, Corey casts Chrome Mox, imprinting Imperial Recruiter. He gives the turn to Ryan. Mike untaps with Ryan through Seedborn. During his upkeep, Ryan wins his mana crypt roll. He draws and plays a Bayou. He pays 3 to put Lurrus of the Dream Den into his hand. He casts Lurrus. He ends his turn. At the end of Ryan's turn, Mike casts Worldly Tutor, fetching up a Thrasios Triton Hero onto the top of his library. Mike draws and plays a Verdant Catacombs. He casts Thrasios Triton Hero. He ships the turn to Zach. Mike untaps with Zach through Seedborn. During his upkeep, Zach wins his mana crypt roll. Still in his upkeep, he casts Enlightened Tutor, fetching up a Colossus Hammer onto the top of his library. He draws and plays a Plains. He casts Colossus Hammer. He moves to combat and Arden triggers. Zach attaches Colossus Hammer to Arden. He attacks Mike with Arden and Yasharn. Mike takes it all, and Zach passes. At the end of Zach's turn, Mike activates Thrasios, scrying 1 and revealing a Summoner's Pact into his hand. Mike untaps with Corey through Seedborn. During his upkeep, Corey continues his losing streak by losing another mana crypt roll and taking 3 damage. He draws and moves to combat. He attacks Mike with Malcolm. Mike takes it, Malcolm and Curiosity trigger, Corey draws a card and creates a treasure. In his second main phase, Corey plays a Fiery Islet. He casts a Mystic Remora. He ships the turn. At the end of Corey's turn, Mike activates Thrasios, scrying 1 and revealing a Turn Timber Symbiosis into his hand. Mike untaps with Ryan through Seedborn. During his upkeep, Ryan wins his mana crypt roll. He draws and casts Gamble. Mystic Remora triggers and Corey draws. Ryan fetches up a card into his hand and then randomly discards a Chrome Mox. He casts Underworld Breach and Corey draws through Remora. In response, Mike casts an Offer You Can't Refuse, targeting Underworld Breach. Remora triggers and Corey draws again. Breach is countered and Ryan creates 2 treasures. He activates Deathrite Shaman's first ability, exiling a land and adding a red. He recasts Underworld Breach through Lurrus. Corey draws and in response, Corey casts Veil of Summer. Veil resolves and Corey draws. Underworld Breach resolves and Ryan escapes Demonic Consultation, exiling 3 cards from his graveyard. Corey draws and in response, Zach casts Nature's Claim, targeting Underworld Breach. Breach is destroyed and Ryan gains 4 life. Demonic Consultation resolves and Ryan names Chain of Vapor. He exiles the top 6 and then exiles all but the last 3 cards of his library, putting Chain of Vapor into his hand. He casts Chain of Vapor, targeting Thassa's Oracle. In response, Corey casts Deflecting Swat for its alternate cost, targeting Chain of Vapor. Swat resolves, and Corey changes the target of Chain of Vapor to Yasharn. Yasharn is bounced, and Zach sacrifices a land to continue the chain, targeting Seedborn Muse. In response, Mike cracks his Verdant Catacombs, pays a life, and fetches up a forest onto the battlefield. Seedborn is bounced, and Mike sacrifices a land, continues the chain, targeting Nullrod. Nullrod is bounced, and Zach ends the chain. After all of that, Ryan moves to his end step, Mike activates Thrasios, and in response, Zach casts Red Elemental Blast, targeting Kinnan. Remora triggers, and Zach pays. Kinnan is destroyed, and Thrasios' ability resolves. Mike scries 1 and reveals a Grim Monolith into his hand. The turn moves to Mike. Mike draws and plays a Turn Timber Serpentine Wood into play untapped, paying 3 life. He recasts his commander, Kinnan Bonder Prodigy. He casts Basalt Monolith. Remora triggers, and Corey draws. In response, Corey taps Fiery Islet to help channel Otawara, Soaring City, bouncing Kinnan back to Mike's hand. Basalt then resolves, and Mike passes the turn. During his upkeep, Zach loses his mana crypt roll and takes 3 damage. Zach draws and plays a forest. He recasts Yasharn. It enters, and he fetches up a plains into his hand. He casts Helm of the Host, and Corey draws. He moves to combat, Arden triggers, equipping Helm of the Host to Yasharn. Helm triggers, creating a copy of Yasharn. He attacks Corey with the Yasharn token and Mike with Arden. Corey blocks with the bird and Mike blocks with Thrasios. Both blockers die, and in his second main phase, Zach recasts Nullrod. Remora triggers and Corey draws. Zach ends his turn. During his upkeep, Corey finally wins his mana crypt roll and then lets his Remora die. Still in his upkeep, he casts Noxious Revival, putting Glenhorn Buccaneer from his graveyard onto the top of his library. He draws and plays a command tower. He moves to combat and attacks Zach with Malcolm. Zach takes it, Malcolm and Curiosity trigger, Corey draws and then creates a treasure. In his second main phase, he casts Phantasmal Image. It enters as a copy of Thassa's Oracle. Oracle enters, and Corey looks at the top 4, putting 1 on top and the rest on bottom. He gives the turn to Ryan. During his upkeep, Ryan wins his mana crypt roll. He draws and plays a City of Traders. He recasts Underworld Breach through Lurrus. Breach resolves, and he escapes Snap, targeting Thassa's Oracle. Oracle is bounced, and Ryan untaps 2 lands. He recasts Thassa's Oracle. In response, Mike casts Summoner's Pact. He fetches up an Endurance into his hand. He evokes Endurance, exiling a green card. Endurance enters and targets Ryan. In response, Ryan escapes Demonic Consultation, exiling 3 cards. He names Demonic Consultation, exiling his library. Still in response, he taps Deathrite Shaman, exiling a land and adding a black. He escapes Demonic Consultation again, exiling the remainder of his graveyard through his escape cost. He then names You Are Already Dead through Consultation and exiles nothing because his library is already empty. Endurance's trigger resolves, and Ryan puts Consultation onto the bottom of his library. Thassa's Oracle enters, and with more blue devotion than cards in his library, Ryan wins the game. Alex spun the card on his finger the longest and gets to start us off. Alex draws a card for turn and plays a command tower. He casts a Mystic Remora. He passes. Brandon draws and plays an Ancient Tomb. He taps it to cast Talisman of Creativity. Remora triggers and Alex draws. Brandon then taps his Talisman to cast a Mystic Remora of his own. Alex draws off of Remora and in response, not wanting to share the fun, pays 2 life to cast Mental Misstep, countering Brandon's Remora. Brandon grumbles and ships the turn to Ashani. Ashani draws and plays an Ancient Tomb. He casts his commander, Rograk, son of Roga. He casts Mox Amber. Remora triggers and Alex draws. Ashani taps his Ancient Tomb to cast Trinisphere. Remora triggers and Alex draws again. Trinisphere resolves, much to the dismay of the table. All through, Ashani passes to Emma. Emma draws and plays a Tropical Island. She passes. During his upkeep, Alex lets his Remora die. He draws and plays an Ancient Tomb. The table jokes about how the game has become a burial ground, and then Alex taps his Ancient Tomb to cast Chromox, imprinting Nezahal Primal Tide. Finished up, Alex passes. Brandon draws and taps his Ancient Tomb to help cast Sol Ring. Brandon passes to Ashani. Ashani draws and plays a Black Cleave Cliffs. He taps Ancient Tomb to help cast Karn, the Great Creator. Alex and Brandon sigh, and Ashani activates Karn's first ability targeting Chromox, killing it. With a commanding board state, Ashani ends his turn. Emma draws and plays a Guy's Cradle. She does nothing else and ships the turn to Alex. Alex draws and plays a Yavimaya Coast. He taps Ancient Tomb and Yavimaya Coast to help cast his commander, Kinnan, Bonder Prodigy. He ends his turn. Brandon draws, does nothing, and passes. Ashani draws and plays a Mana Confluence. He taps Ancient Tomb and Mana Confluence to help cast his other commander, Tevesh Zot, Doom of Fools. He activates Tevesh's first ability, creating 2 Thralls. He activates Karn's first ability with no targets, and then gives the turn to Emma. Emma draws and plays an Underground Sea. She passes. Alex draws and plays a Tropical Island. He moves to combat and attacks Tevesh Zot with Kinnan. Ashani blocks with a Thrall, and Alex ends his turn. Brandon draws, glares at Ashani's board, and passes. Ashani draws and plays a Beseju, who shelters all into play tapped. He activates Tevesh's first ability, creating 2 more Thralls. He activates Karn's first ability with no targets. All through, Ashani ships the turn to Emma. Emma draws, glares at Trinisphere, and passes, discarding to hand size. Alex draws and plays an island. He taps Ancient Tomb to help cast Spellskite. He moves to combat and attacks Tevesh Zot with Kinnan. Ashani chumps with a Thrall, and Alex ends his turn. Brandon draws and plays a Watery Grave into play untapped, paying 2 life. He passes. Ashani draws and plays a Swamp. He activates Tevesh Zot's first ability, creating 2 more Thralls. He activates Karn's first ability with no targets. Slowly growing his board and now threatening Tevesh's ultimate, Ashani passes to Emma. Emma draws, sighs, and passes, discarding to hand size. Alex draws and plays the Yavimaya, Cradle of Growth, as his land for turn. He taps Ancient Tomb to help cast Reclamation Sage. It enters, destroying Trinisphere. Brandon and Emma cheer at possibly getting to play Magic again, and Alex moves to combat. He attacks Tevesh with Kinnan. Ashani chump blocks with a Thrall, and Alex passes. At the end of Alex's turn, Brandon casts Mystical Tutor, fetching up a Chain of Vapor onto the top of his library. Brandon draws and casts Lotus Petal. He casts his commander, Rograk, son of Roga. He casts Chain of Vapor, targeting Tevesh Zot. Tevesh Zot is bounced, and Ashani does not continue the chain. All through, Brandon passes to Ashani. Ashani draws and activates Karn's first ability, targeting Lotus Petal, killing it. He taps Ancient Tomb to recast Tevesh Zot. In response, Alex hard casts Force of Negation, countering and exiling Tevesh. Ashani plays a Snow-Covered Swamp and ships the turn to Emma. Emma draws and casts Rhystic Study. She passes. Alex draws and plays a Snow-Covered Forest. He taps Ancient Tomb to help cast Nyx Bloom Ancient. Rhystic triggers and Emma draws. Finished up, Alex ends his turn. Brandon draws, does nothing, and passes. At the end of Brandon's turn, Ashani taps Beseju, who shelters all, and pays 4 life to help cast a very painful Dismember, targeting Nyx Bloom Ancient, paying the Rhystic tax. Nyx Bloom dies, and the turn moves to Ashani. Ashani draws and plays a Luxury Suite. He taps his Ancient Tomb to help recast Tevesh Zot, tapping Mana Confluence to pay for Rhystic. He activates Tevesh's second ability, sacrificing a Thrall and drawing 2 cards. He activates Karn's first ability with no targets. All through, Ashani passes to Emma. Emma draws and casts Noble Hierarch. She passes. Alex draws and taps Ancient Tomb to help activate Kinnan. He looks at the top 5, putting Perplexing Chimera onto the battlefield. He moves to combat and attacks Tevesh with his Reclamation Sage and Kinnan. Ashani blocks each with a Thrall, and finished up, Alex ends his turn. Brandon draws, does nothing, and passes. Ashani draws and casts Demonic Tutor. Rhystic triggers and Emma draws. Then Ashani fetches up a card into his hand. He then taps Ancient Tomb and Beseju to help cast an uncounterable Yockelhops. Rhystic triggers and Emma draws. Yockelhops resolves, leaving just Karn, Tevesh Zot, and Rhystic Study on the battlefield. The table discusses for a minute and decides that they'd rather not suffer a slow and grindy death, concede, and Ashani wins the game. Drake had the highest self-esteem and gets to start us off. Drake draws a card for turn and plays a Polluted Delta. He cracks it, pays a life, and fetches up an Underground Sea onto the battlefield. He casts a Mana Vault. He casts a Helm of Awakening. He casts a Talisman of Progress. He casts a Sensei's Divining Top. He activates top, looking at and rearranging the top 3. All through, he passes. Mike draws and plays a Command Tower. He casts a Lotus Petal. He casts a Bloom Tender. He casts a Grim Monolith. Thanking Drake for his Helm of Awakening, Mike passes. Alana draws and plays a Marsh Flats. She cracks it, pays a life, and fetches up a Tundra onto the battlefield. She casts a Mox Diamond, discarding Underground Sea. She casts Ranger Captain of Eos. Ranger enters, and Alana fetches up a Ragavan, Nimble Pilfer, into her hand. She casts a Mana Vault and ends her turn. Zach draws and plays an Underground Sea. He casts a Lotus Petal. He casts a Gamble. He fetches up a card into his hand and then randomly discards a Felwar Stone. He casts a Talisman of Indulgence. He casts an Arcane Signet. He casts a Mystic Remora. Zach gives the turn to Drake. During his draw step, Drake takes the damage through his Mana Vault. In his main phase, he plays a Godless Shrine into play untapped, paying 2 life. He taps his Talisman to help cast his commander, Zur the Enchanter. Finished up, Drake passes. Mike draws and plays a Yavimaya Coast. He taps it to help cast his commander, Kinnan, Prodigy. He casts a Simic Signet. Remora triggers and Zach draws. He activates Kinnan, looking at the top 5 and putting an Elvish Mystic onto the battlefield. A bit disappointed at his flip, Mike ends his turn. Alana draws and plays a Bloodstained Mire. She cracks it, pays a life, and fetches up a Taiga onto the battlefield. She casts Deafening Silence. Remora triggers and Zach draws. She casts Ragavan, Nimble Pilferer. She moves to combat and attacks Zach with Ranger Captain. Zach takes it, and Alana gives the turn to Zach. During his upkeep, Zach pays to keep his Remora. He draws and plays a City of Brass. He casts his commander, Armix, Filigree Thrasher. He passes. During his draw step, Drake takes a damage from his Mana Vault. In his main phase, he plays a Watery Grave into play untapped, paying 2 life. He moves to combat and attacks Zach with Zur. Zur triggers, and Drake fetches up a Necropotence onto the battlefield. Then Zach takes it, and in his second main phase, Drake activates Necropotence 12 times, paying 12 life, exiling 12 cards. He moves to his end step and puts the Necro cards into his hand. Still in the end step, he casts Chain of Vapor, targeting his own Mana Vault. Remora triggers and Zach draws. Mana Vault bounces, and Drake sacrifices the land, copying the chain, targeting Deafening Silence. In response, Alana sacrifices Ranger Captain of Eos, locking out opponents from casting non-creature spells this turn. Then Deafening Silence bounces back to Alana's hand, and she doesn't continue the chain. Drake moves to cleanup, discards to hand size, and Necropotence triggers. Notably, now that Drake has moved through cleanup, Deafening Silence's ability has worn off. So in response, Drake casts Tainted Pact. Remora triggers and Zach draws again. Pact resolves and Drake exiles until he reveals a Born Upon a Wind, putting it into his hand. He taps his Talisman to cast Born Upon a Wind, and Zach draws from Remora. In response, Zach casts Pact of Negation. In response, Drake activates his top, looking at and rearranging the top 3. With no answers, Pact counters Born, Drake exiles his discarded cards, and the turn moves to Mike. Mike draws and activates Kinnan. He looks at the top 5, putting Phantasmal Image onto the battlefield. It enters as a copy of Zur the Enchanter. Mike passes. Alana draws and moves to combat. She attacks Zach with Ragavan. Zach takes it, Ragavan triggers, Alana creates a treasure, and Zach exiles a Badlands off at the top of its library. In her second main phase, she casts her own Kinnan, Prodigy. She recasts Deafening Silence. Remora triggers and Zach draws. She casts a Favorable Elder. Alana passes. At the end of Alana's turn, Zach taps his City of Brass to cast Blue Elemental Blast, destroying Ragavan. During his upkeep, Zach's Remora and Pact of Negation go onto the stack. Zach doesn't have the mana to pay for Pact. In response, he taps his Talisman to cast Cabal Ritual, adding 3 black. Everyone sighs, and Zach pays for his Pact of Negation. He then lets his Remora die. He draws and plays a Mana Confluence. He moves to combat and attacks Mike with Armix. Armix triggers, and Zach discards Witchclaw Talisman, targeting Phantasmal Image. Image triggers, and Mike sacrifices it. Then Mike takes it, and Zach ships the turn to Drake. Drake skips his draw step due to Necropotence. He moves to combat and attacks Zach with Zur. Zur triggers, and Drake fetches up an Out of Time onto the battlefield. Out of Time enters, everyone untaps and faces out all of the creatures they control, then Out of Time gets 7 counters. In his second main phase, Drake casts an Imperial Seal. He fetches up a card onto the top of his library and loses 2 life. He activates Necropotence 5 times, paying 5 life, exiling 5 cards. He moves to his end step and puts the Necro cards into his hand. Still in his end step, he flashes in a Shimmermere. He discards the hand size, exiling the discarded cards. Mike draws, does nothing, and passes. At the end of Mike's turn, Drake flashes in a Mana Vault. Alana draws and casts her commander, Sisay, Weatherlight Captain. She passes. At the end of Alana's turn, Drake flashes in a Lotus Petal. Zach draws and plays a Gemstone Caverns. He casts his other commander, Crom, Ludovic's Opus. He moves to Crombat and attacks Drake with Crom. Drake takes it, and in his second main phase, Zach taps his Mana Confluence to cast Demonic Tutor. In response, Drake casts Flusterstorm with all copies targeting Tutor, countering the spell. Zach passes the turn. During his upkeep, Drake removes a counter from Out of Time. He skips his draw step due to Necropotence. In his main phase, he taps his Talisman to help cast Laboratory Maniac. He casts Witchclaw Talisman. Crom triggers and Zach draws. He activates Witchclaw, fetching up a card into his hand and giving Witchclaw to Zach. He activates Necropotence 5 times, paying 5 life, exiling 5 cards. He activates his Sensei's top, looking at and rearranging the top 3. He moves to his end step and puts the Necro cards into his hand. He passes, discarding the hand size, exiling the discarded cards. Mike draws, takes no actions, and passes. At the end of Mike's turn, Drake flashes in a Felwar Stone. Alana draws, also takes no actions, and passes. At the end of Alana's turn, Drake flashes in a Dress Down, drawing a card as it enters. Zach draws and moves to combat. He attacks Drake with Crom. Since Crom no longer has flying due to Dress Down, Drake blocks with Shimmer Mirror. In his second main phase, Zach activates Witchclaw, fetching up a card into his hand and giving Witchclaw to Mike. Zach passes, and Dress Down is sacrificed. During his upkeep, Drake removes a counter from Out of Time. He skips his draw step due to Necropotence. In his main phase, he activates Necropotence 1 time, paying a life and exiling a card. He moves to his end step and puts the Necro card into his hand. Still in the end step, Mike flashes in an Endurance. It enters, and Zach puts his graveyard onto the bottom of his library in a random order. The turn moves to Mike. Mike draws and moves to combat. He attacks Drake with Endurance. Drake blocks with Laboratory Maniac. Before damage, Drake casts Demonic Consultation. In response, Zach casts Red Elemental Blast, destroying Laboratory Maniac. With Consult still in the stack, Alana casts Worldly Tutor. She fetches up a Dockside Extortionist onto the top of her library. Then Consult resolves, and Drake names Snapcaster Mage. He reveals the top 6, which contains the Snapcaster Mage, and Drake exiles his entire library. In his second main phase, Mike activates Witchclaw Talisman. In response, Drake flashes in an Opposition Agent. Crom triggers and Zach draws. In response, Mike casts Delay, targeting Agent. Agent is countered and exiled with 3 time counters on it, then Witchclaw's ability resolves. Mike fetches up a card into his hand and then gives Witchclaw to Alana. Mike casts Gilded Drake. It enters and exchanges control of Alana's Sisei. With nothing else, Mike ships the turn. Alana draws and casts Dockside Extortionist. It enters and Alana creates 10 treasures. She casts Aminatou the Fate Shifter. Crom triggers and Zach draws. Knowing that this is probably game over, the table thinks of a way out. So in response, Zach casts Demonic Consultation. It resolves and Zach names Otawara Soaring City. He exiles the top 6 and then exiles until he finds Otawara, putting it into his hand. He tasks Mana Confluence to channel Otawara, targeting Sisei. In response, Drake casts Silence, locking out opponents from casting spells this turn. Then Sisei bounces back to Alana's hand. Then Aminatou resolves. Alana activates Aminatou, flickering Dockside, creating 10 more treasures. Unfortunately locked out, Alana ends her turn. Zach draws and plays a Command Tower. He casts a Windfall. Windfall resolves, everyone discards their hand and draws 4. Drake attempts to draw from an empty library and loses the game. Out of Time leaves the battlefield and everyone's creatures phase back in. Zach moves to combat and attacks Mike with Armix and Aminatou with Crom. And before you ask, yes, he can attack with Armix because phasing allows him to. Armix triggers, Zach discards a card and targets Kinnan. In response, Mike invokes Court of Calling where X equals 3. In response, Alana activates Kinnan. She looks at the top 5, failing to find. She activates Kinnan again, failing to find. She activates Kinnan, failing to find again. She activates Kinnan, putting Ignoble Hierarch onto the battlefield. Then Alana flashes in and Urtai resurrected. Urtai enters, Court of Calling is countered, and Mike draws a card. Alana activates Kinnan one more time, putting Lotho, Corrupt Sheriff, onto the battlefield. Then Armix's ability resolves, and Kinnan dies. Then Mike takes a hit, and Aminatou dies. Finished up, Zach passes to Mike. During his upkeep, Mike pays 2 life to cast Noxious Revival, putting Phantasmal Image onto the top of his library. He draws and plays a Gaia's Cradle. He recasts his commander, Kinnan, Bonder Prodigy. Crom triggers and Zach draws. Lotho triggers and Alana loses a life and creates a treasure. He casts Phantasmal Image. It enters as a copy of Dockside. In response, Alana cracks one of her treasures. Then Mike creates 8 treasures. He activates Kinnan, looking at the top 5, failing to find. He activates Kinnan, putting Wandering Archaic onto the battlefield. Mike ends his turn. During her draw step, Alana takes a damage from her Mana Vault. In her main phase, she casts Finale of Devastation where X equals 4. Wandering Archaic triggers and Alana pays. In response, Zach hard casts Force of Negation, targeting Finale. Archaic triggers and Mike copies it, also targeting Finale. Force resolves and Finale is countered and exiled. Next, Alana casts Skrelv, Defector Might. Lotho triggers and Alana loses a life and creates a treasure. Crom triggers and Zach draws. She recasts her commander, Sisei, Weatherlight Captain. Finished up, Alana passes to Zach. Zach draws and moves to combat. He attacks Alana with Crom and Mike with Armix. Armix triggers, Zach discards a card, targeting Wandering Archaic, killing it. Mike blocks Armix with Endurance and Armix dies. Then Alana takes the hit, and in his second main phase, Zach plays a Luxury Suite. He recasts his commander, Armix. He casts Imperial Seal. Lotho triggers, and Alana loses a life and creates a treasure. Then Zach fetches up a card onto the top of his library and loses 2 life. With nothing else, Zach gives the turn to Mike. Mike draws and activates Kinnan. He looks at the top 5, putting Phyrexian Metamorph onto the battlefield. It enters as a copy of Dockside. In response, Alana cracks her treasure. Then Mike creates 8 treasures. Mike activates Kinnan, putting Nyx Bloom Ancient onto the battlefield. His treasures now crack for 4 each, so Mike activates Kinnan. He puts a Spellskite onto the battlefield. He activates Kinnan, putting Void Winnower onto the battlefield. He activates Kinnan, putting Seedborn Muse onto the battlefield. He activates Kinnan, putting Jin-Jitaxi's Core Augur onto the battlefield. Next, Mike untaps his Grim Monolith. He taps it for 10 and then untaps it for 4. He then presents infinite colorless mana through Grim Monolith. He casts Mirage Mirror. In response, Alana casts Fierce Guardianship for its alternate cost, targeting Mirror. In response, Mike activates Kinnan, failing to find. He activates Kinnan, putting Birds of Paradise onto the battlefield. He activates Kinnan, failing to find. He activates Kinnan, putting Manglehorn onto the battlefield. Manglehorn enters, destroying Skrelv. Then Fierce counters Mirage Mirror. Mike moves to his end step, Jin-Jitaxi's triggers, and Mike draws 7. The turn moves to Alana. Mike untaps with Alana through Seedborn. During her upkeep, Mike taps his Grim Monolith for 10. He activates Grim Monolith to attempt to untap it. In response, Alana activates Sisay. In response, Mike attempts to untap Grim Monolith. In response, Alana attempts to activate Sisay again. In response, Mike attempts to untap Grim Monolith. With no other answers, Grim Monolith untaps. Then Mike presents infinite colorless mana with Grim Monolith. Mike activates Kinnan, failing to find. He activates Kinnan, failing to find again. He activates Kinnan, failing to find again. He activates Kinnan a 4th time, putting Tidespout Tyrant onto the battlefield. He activates Kinnan, failing to find. He channels Boseiju, who endures, targeting Deafening Silence. Deafening Silence is destroyed, and Alana fetches up a Bayou onto the battlefield. Mike taps Yavimaya Coast to activate Kinnan, putting Thrasios, Triton Hero, onto the battlefield. Mike presents a loop of activating Thrasios, putting all lands onto the battlefield and the rest of his library into his hand. He casts an overloaded Cyclonic Rift. Chrom triggers and Zac draws. Tidespout triggers, bouncing Endurance back to his hand. In response, Zac casts Swansong, targeting Rift. In response, Mike casts Fierce Guardianship for its alternate cost, targeting Swansong. Tidespout triggers, targeting Zac City of Brass. Then Fierce counters Swansong, and Cyclonic Rift resolves, bouncing Mike's opponent's non-land permanents. With everything still in the stack, Mike flashes in an Endurance. Tidespout triggers, bouncing Alana's Bayou. Endurance enters, putting Mike's graveyard onto the bottom of his library. He casts Snap, targeting Endurance. Tidespout triggers, bouncing Alana's Tundra. Endurance bounces, and Mike untaps his Gaia's Cradle and another land. Mike presents a loop of flashing in Endurance, shuffling in Snap, drawing it with Thrasios, then using Snap to bounce Endurance, and generating infinite mana. With each cast, he bounces his opponent's lands. With no board state and nothing meaningful to do, each player passes the turn back to Mike. Mike draws, presents infinite mana, and then casts all of the creatures in his deck. He casts Finale of Devastation, where X equals a whole bunch. He moves to combat, attacks each player with his creatures, and Mike wins the game. Ryan got the best time in the Halo speedrun and gets to start us off. Ryan draws a card for turn and casts a Mana Crypt. He casts an Arcane Signet. He casts a turn 1, Mystic Remora. The table size, and Ryan passes. TK draws and plays an Urborg, Tomb of Yawgmoth. With Remora completely changing his plans, TK passes. Alex draws and plays an island. He casts a Mana Crypt. Remora triggers and Ryan draws. He casts a Trinisphere and Ryan draws again. In response, TK casts Dark Ritual and Ryan draws from Remora. He adds 3 black and then flashes in an Opposition Agent. Agent resolves, then Trinisphere resolves, the table straps in, and Alex ends his turn. Chris draws and plays a Timber Crown Pathway. He stares at his hand of now useless cards and ships the turn to Ryan. During his upkeep, Ryan loses his Mana Crypt flip and takes 3 damage. He also pays to keep his Remora. He draws and plays a Polluted Delta. He taps his Delta 4 black through Urborg to help cast Mox Diamond, discarding Bloodstained Mire. Ryan passes the turn. TK draws, plays a Flooded Strand, and passes. During his upkeep, Alex loses his Mana Crypt roll and takes 3 damage. He draws and pays 2 life to cast Phyrexian Metamorph. It enters as a copy of Arcane Signet. Alex ends his turn. Chris draws and plays a Shatter Skull to hammer pass and to play untapped, paying 3 life. He exiles Elvish Spirit Guide from his hand, adding a green. He casts a Birds of Paradise. Chris passes to Ryan. During his upkeep, Ryan wins his Mana Crypt flip. He also pays to keep his Remora. He draws and plays a Verdant Catacombs. He casts a Birds of Paradise of his own. Ryan sends the turn to TK. TK draws and plays a City of Traders. He casts a Cursed Totem. Remora triggers and Ryan draws. TK passes to Alex. During his upkeep, Alex loses his Mana Crypt roll and takes 3 damage. He draws and casts the One Ring. Remora triggers and Ryan draws. Ring enters and Alex gains protection from everything until his next turn. He activates the One Ring, adding a burn encounter and drawing a card. Alex gives the turn to Chris. Chris draws, takes no actions, and passes. During his upkeep, Ryan wins his Mana Crypt flip. He also pays to keep his Remora. He draws and plays a Marsh Flats. He casts a Fiend Artisan. He passes. TK draws and casts a Spellskite. He ends his turn. During his upkeep, Alex loses his mana crypt roll and takes 3 damage. He also loses a life to the One Ring. Still in his upkeep, he activates the One Ring, adding a counter and drawing 2 cards. He draws and casts his commander, Kinnan, Prodigy. He passes, discarding to hand size. Chris draws, still does nothing, and passes. During his upkeep, Ryan loses his mana crypt flip and takes 3 damage. He also pays to keep his Remora again. He draws and casts Priest to Fell Rites. He ends his turn. TK draws and casts an Arcane Signet. Remora triggers and Ryan draws. TK passes. During his upkeep, Alex loses his mana crypt roll and takes 3 damage. He also loses 2 life from the One Ring. Still in his upkeep, he activates the One Ring, adding a counter and drawing 3 cards. He draws and plays an Exotic Orchard. He casts Jin-Jitaxias, Progress Tyrant. Everyone realizes that they've reached that stage of the game, and Alex passes, discarding to hand size. Chris draws and plays a Mountain. He casts a Tinderwall. Feeling like he finally got to do something this game, he passes the turn. During his upkeep, Ryan loses his mana crypt flip and takes 3 damage. He also finally lets his Remora die. He draws and casts Sylvan Library. Ryan ends his turn. TK draws, takes no actions, and passes. At the end of TK's turn, Ryan channels Ottawara, Soaring City, bouncing Jin-Jitaxias back to Alex's hand, preventing any free copying on his turn. During his upkeep, Alex loses his mana crypt roll and takes 3 damage. He also loses 3 life to the One Ring. Still in his upkeep, he activates the One Ring, adding a counter and drawing 4 cards. He draws and plays an island. He casts Seedborn Muse. The table sees that the end is probably near, and Alex passes, discarding to hand size. Alex untaps with Chris through Seedborn. Chris draws and asks TK if he can help him out of this situation. TK agrees, and Chris casts Green Sun Zenith, where X equals 2, knowing about Opposition Agent. It resolves, and TK fetches up a Collector Oof into exile through Oppo Agent. Then Chris shuffles Green Suns back into his library. Chris passes. At the end of Chris's turn, Alex activates the One Ring. In response, TK flashes in his commander, Nimrus, Una's Trickster. In response, Alex flashes in a Hullbreaker Horror. Horror and Nimrus resolve, then Alex adds a counter to the One Ring and draws 5 cards. The turn moves to Ryan. Alex untaps with Ryan through Seedborn. During his upkeep, Ryan loses his mana crypt flip and takes 3 damage. During his draw step, he draws 2 extra through Sylvan Library, paying 4 life to keep 1 extra. He plays a Forbidden Orchard for turn. He passes. At the end of Ryan's turn, Alex activates the One Ring, adding a counter and drawing 6 cards. Alex untaps with TK through Seedborn. TK draws and casts Collector Roof. In response, Alex casts Force of Will, paying a life and exiling blue card, and paying 3 through Trinisphere, targeting Oof. Hullbreaker Horror triggers, targeting Alex's own Trinisphere. In response, Ryan pays 3 to cast an Offer You Can't Refuse, targeting Force. In response, Alex activates the One Ring, adding a counter and drawing 7 cards. Then Force is countered, and Alex creates 2 treasures. Then Hullbreaker bounces Trinisphere, and then with the Oof still in the stack, Alex casts Veil of Summer. Hullbreaker Horror triggers, bouncing Oof from the stack back to Chris's hand. Then Veil resolves, Alex draws a card, and with nothing else, TK passes the turn. During his upkeep, Alex loses his mana crypt roll and takes 3 damage. He also loses 7 life to the One Ring. Still in his upkeep, he activates the One Ring. In response, TK casts Mystical Tutor. Nimrus triggers, TK looks at the top 2, putting 1 into his hand and the other into his graveyard. Then Tutor resolves, and TK fetches up a Shadow of Doubt onto the top of his library. Then Alex adds a counter to the One Ring and draws 8 cards. He draws and plays a Manamo, School at Water's Edge. He casts Mox Amber. Hullbreaker Horror triggers, and Alex bounces his Mana Crypt back to his hand. He taps his Mox Amber for double blue, then casts Mana Crypt, bouncing Mox Amber back to his hand. He presents a loop of tapping his rocks for mana, then bouncing them back and forth through Hullbreaker Horror. He makes infinite mana, then bounces the One Ring. He recasts the One Ring. Hullbreaker triggers, bouncing Mana Crypt. The One Ring enters, and Alex gets protection from everything. He presents another loop of tapping the One Ring, drawing a card, then bouncing the One Ring through Hullbreaker Horror and recasting it over and over. With this loop, he draws his entire deck. He casts Thassa's Oracle. Oracle enters, and Alex wins the game. But Chris has a pre-game action and puts Gemstone Caverns onto the battlefield, exiling Momentous Fall. TK draws and plays a Watery Grave into play untapped, paying 2 life. He casts a Mystic Remora. He casts a Chrome Mox, imprinting Pact of Negation. He casts a Jewel Lotus. He casts a Lotus Petal. After a fantastic turn 1, TK passes. Alex draws and plays a Yavimaya Coast. He taps it to cast Birds of Paradise. Alex passes. Chris draws and plays a Thran Quarry. He casts Scrib Ranger. He ends his turn. Ryan draws and plays a Forbidden Orchard. He taps it, giving TK a spirit to cast Imperial Seal. Remora triggers and TK draws. Then Ryan fetches up a card onto the top of his library and loses 2 life. Ryan passes. At the end of Ryan's turn, TK flashes in his commander, Nimrus, Una's Trickster. During his upkeep, TK pays to keep his Remora. He draws and plays a Bloodstained Mire. He cracks it, pays a life, and fetches up an Underground Sea onto the battlefield. He casts Ledger Shredder. He ships the turn to Alex. Alex draws and plays an island. He taps his Yavimaya Coast to help cast his commander, Kinnan, Prodigy. He casts Llanowar Elves. Shredder triggers, and TK connives a dress down, giving Shredder a counter. Alex passes the turn to Chris. Chris draws and plays a Forbidden Orchard. He taps it, giving Ryan a spirit to help cast Heron Blade Elite. Chris ends his turn. Ryan draws and plays a Taiga. He casts a Mana Crypt. Remora triggers, and TK draws. He casts a Felwar Stone. Ledger Shredder triggers and TK connives a Vampiric Tutor, giving Shredder a counter. Remora triggers and TK draws as well. Next, Ryan casts Ragavan Nimble Pilferer. He taps Forbidden Orchard, giving TK a spirit to help cast his commander, Jensen Carthalion, Druid Exile. With nothing else, Ryan passes to TK. During his upkeep, TK pays to keep his Remora. He draws, holds up a mana, and passes. Alex draws and plays a Mana Confluence. He taps it to help cast Gilded Drake. It enters and targets Nimrus. In response, TK casts Deadly Relic for its alternate cost, targeting Drake. Nimrus triggers and TK looks at the top two, putting one into his hand and the other into his graveyard. Then Gilded Drake is exiled and the exchange does not happen. Next, Alex casts Seedborn Muse. Ledger Shredder triggers and TK connives a Windfall, giving Shredder a counter. In response, TK casts Force of Will, paying a life, exiling a blue card, countering Seedborn Muse. With nothing else, Alex ends his turn. Chris draws and taps his Forbidden Orchard, giving TK a spirit to help cast his commander, Ragadraga, Gorguts Boss. Heron Blade triggers and gets a +1/+1 counter. Chris passes. During his upkeep, Ryan wins his Mana Crypt flip. He draws and plays a Tundra. He moves to combat and attacks Alex with Ragavan. Alex takes it, Ragavan triggers, Ryan creates a treasure, and Alex exiles Priest of Titania. In his second main phase, Ryan casts Priest of Titania from exile through Ragavan. Ryan passes. At the end of Ryan's turn, TK casts Consider. Nimrus triggers, and TK looks at the top two, putting one into his hand and the other into his graveyard. Then Consider resolves, and TK surveils one, leaving it on top. The turn moves to TK. During his upkeep, TK lets his Remora die. He draws and plays a Forbidden Orchard. He casts Cabal Ritual with Threshold, adding 5 black. He casts Mnemonic Betrayal. Ledger Shredder triggers and TK connives a Grafdigger's Cage, giving Shredder a counter. Then Betrayal resolves and each opponent exiles their libraries and TK exiles Betrayal. He casts Grim Monolith. He casts Seedborn Muse from exile. He moves to combat and attacks Ryan with Ledger Shredder. Ryan takes 5, TK passes, and all cards are returned to their owners' graveyards. TK untaps with Alex through Seedborn. Alex draws and casts an Arcane Signet. He casts the One Ring. Ledger Shredder triggers and TK connives a Spire of Industry. It enters and Alex gains protection from everything. He activates the One Ring, adding a counter and drawing a card. He taps his Yavimaya Coast to cast Finehorn Elves. Alex ends his turn. Chris draws and taps his Forbidden Orchard, giving TK a spirit to cast Allosaurus Shepherd. He casts Eldritch Evolution, sacrificing Scrib Ranger as an additional cost. Shredder triggers and TK connives Time Twister, giving Shredder a counter. Then Eldritch resolves and Chris fetches up a Dockside Extortionist onto the battlefield. Dockside enters and in response, TK casts Stifle, targeting the Dockside trigger. Nimrus triggers, TK looks at the top two, putting one into his hand and the other into his graveyard. In response, Chris casts Red Elemental Blast, countering Stifle. Then Chris creates 6 treasures. Next, Chris casts Regal Force. Ragadraga triggers, Chris untaps Heron Blade Elite, and it gets +7/+7. Then Regal Force enters and Chris draws 4 cards. He taps Heron Blade, adding 11 green. He casts Life's Legacy, sacrificing Regal Force, drawing 5 cards. He casts a Mana Crypt. He casts a Wandering Archaic. He casts Last March of the Ents. Ragadraga triggers, Chris untaps Heron Blade, and it gets +7/+7. Last March resolves, and Chris draws 18 cards. Then puts Viridian Joiner, Circle of Dreams Druid, Temur Sabertooth, Finehorn Elves, and a Thorn Mammoth onto the battlefield. Mammoth triggers and fights Nimrus, killing it. Next, Chris exiles Elvish Spirit Guide from his hand, adding a green. He taps Heron Blade for 18 and then casts an Entwine to the Nail. Ragadraga triggers, giving Heron Blade +7/+7, and Chris untaps it. Then Tooth and Nail resolves. Chris fetches up an Eternal Witness and fetches up a Void Winnower into his hand. He then puts both onto the battlefield. Eternal Witness enters and Chris returns Regal Force from his graveyard to his hand. Thorn Mammoth triggers twice, fighting Jensen and Kinnan, killing them both. Next, Chris casts Regal Force. Ragadraga triggers, giving Heron Blade +7/+7, and Chris untaps it. Then Regal Force enters, and Chris draws 10 cards. He casts Great Oak Guardian. It enters, Chris untaps his creatures, and they get +2/+2 until the end of turn. He casts a Tuk Tuk Rebel Fort. Chris presents a loop of floating mana, returning Great Oak Guardian to his hand through Temur Sabertooth, then recasting it, untapping his creatures. Using this loop, he generates infinite mana. He casts Valakut Awakening. He puts the cards in his hand onto the bottom of his library and draws that many +1. He presents another loop of bouncing and recasting Eternal Witness through Sabertooth, returning Valakut Awakening to his hand and recasting it to filter through his entire deck. He does this until he finds Spine of Ish-Sah. He casts Spine of Ish-Sah. It enters and destroys one of Ryan's permanents. Chris casts Force of Vigor, destroying Spine. Spine triggers and Chris returns it to his hand. He bounces and recasts Eternal Witness to get Force of Vigor back to his hand. He presents a loop of casting and destroying Spine of Ish-Sah to destroy all of his opponent's permanents. All permanents are destroyed except Alex's The One Ring. Chris moves to combat and attacks Ryan and TK with his massive army, killing them since Alex still has protection from the One Ring. In his second main phase, Chris casts Great Oak Guardian one more time to untap his creatures. Chris passes to Alex. During his upkeep, Alex loses a life to the One Ring. He also activates the One Ring, adding a counter and drawing 2. Alex sees that he has nothing to survive, concedes, and Chris wins the game. Alex had the best altered commander and gets to start us off. But Ryan has a pre-game action, putting Gemstone Caverns onto the battlefield, exiling Snow-Covered Mountain. Alex draws a card for turn and plays a Misty Rainforest. He cracks it, pays a life, and fetches up a tropical island onto the battlefield. He casts a Soul Ring, he casts a Felwar Stone, and Alex is super grateful to Ryan for his Gemstone Caverns. He casts a Chrome Mox, imprinting Consecrated Sphinx. He casts his commander, Kinnan, Bonder Prodigy. After completely dumping out his hand, Alex passes. Chris draws and plays a Windswept Heath. He cracks it, pays a life, and fetches up a Tundra onto the battlefield. He casts a Mystic Remora. Chris passes. Ryan draws and plays an Urza Saga, getting its first counter. He casts a Mana Vault. Remora triggers and Chris draws. Ryan ends his turn. TK draws and plays a Taiga. He casts a Tinder Wall and passes to Alex. During his upkeep, Alex activates Kinnan. He looks at the top 5, putting Elvish Mystic onto the battlefield. He draws and plays a Mana Confluence. He moves to combat and attacks Ryan with Kinnan. Ryan takes it, and Alex ships the turn. During his upkeep, Chris pays to keep his Remora. He draws and plays a Wooded Foothills. He cracks it, pays a life, and fetches up a tropical island onto the battlefield. Chris ends his turn. Ryan draws, and in his first main phase, Urza Saga gets another counter. He plays a Snow-Covered Mountain and sends the turn to TK. TK draws and plays an Underground Sea. He sacrifices Tinder Wall, adding 2 red. He casts his commander, Najeela the Blade Blossom. TK ends his turn. Alex draws and casts Glen Elendra Archmage. He casts Perplexing Chimera. He moves to combat and attacks Ryan with Kinnan. Ryan takes it, and Alex gives the turn to Chris. During his upkeep, Chris pays to keep his Remora. He draws, takes no actions, and passes. At the end of Chris's turn, Ryan activates Urza Saga, creating a construct. Then Chris discards the hand size, and the turn moves to Ryan. Ryan draws, and in his first main phase, Urza Saga triggers. In response, Ryan activates Urza Saga, creating another construct. Then Ryan sacrifices Saga, fetching up a Grafdigger's Cage onto the battlefield. The table sighs, and Ryan casts Mox Opal. Remora triggers, and Chris draws. Ryan moves to combat and attacks Alex with a construct. Alex takes 5, and then Ryan passes to TK. TK draws and plays a Bayou. He moves to combat and attacks Chris with Najeela. Najeela triggers, and TK puts a 1/1 warrior onto the battlefield, tapped and attacking Chris. Chris takes it all, and TK passes to Alex. Alex draws and plays a Treasure Vault. He moves to combat and attacks Ryan with Glen Elendra and Chris with Perplexing Chimera and Kinnan. They both take it, and Alex passes. During his upkeep, Chris lets his Remora die. He draws and casts a Drannith Magistrate. Chris ends his turn, discarding to hand size. Ryan draws and casts Honor War and Shaku. He moves to combat and attacks Alex with his construct. Alex takes 6, and Ryan passes. TK draws and plays a Volcanic Island. He moves to combat and attacks Alex with Najeela and a warrior. Najeela triggers, creating 2 more warriors tapped and attacking Alex. Alex takes it all, and TK passes. Alex draws and plays an island. He holds up blockers against the onslaught and then sends the turn to Chris. Chris draws, plays a command tower, and passes. Ryan draws and moves to combat. He attacks TK with a construct. TK takes 6, and in his second main phase, he casts Goblin Engineer. Perplexing Chimera triggers, and Alex exchanges control of it and Goblin Engineer. With Engineer still in the stack, Chris casts Stern Scolding, targeting Engineer. In response, Alex activates Glen Elendra, sacrificing it, countering Stern Scolding. Glen Elendra's Persist triggers, but doesn't re-enter due to Grafdigger's Cage. Then Goblin Engineer enters under Alex's control, and he fetches up a Mirage Mirror into his graveyard. Finished up, Ryan passes. At the end of Ryan's turn, TK casts Intuition. He fetches up a Samut, Vizier of Noctamoon, Derevi Imperial Tactician, and a Druid's Repository. Chris gives him Samut, the rest go to his graveyard, and the turn moves to TK. TK draws and plays an Ancient Tomb. He casts Samut, Vizier of Noctamoon. Perplexing Chimera triggers, and Ryan exchanges control of it. Then Samut resolves. TK moves to combat and attacks Chris with 3 warriors. Najeela triggers, creating 3 more warriors tapped and attacking Chris. Chris blocks 1 with Drannith and then takes the rest. TK passes. At the end of TK's turn, Alex activates Treasure Vault, where X equals 5, sacrificing it. In response, Chris casts Vampiric Tutor. He fetches up a card onto the top of his library and loses 2 life. Then Alex creates 5 treasures, and the turn moves to Alex. Alex draws and plays a Gemstone Caverns. He activates Goblin Engineer, sacrificing a treasure, returning Mirage Mirror to the battlefield. Alex ends his turn. During Chris's upkeep, Alex activates Mirage Mirror, having it become a copy of Perplexing Chimera. Chris draws and casts Out of Time. It enters, untaps and phases out all creatures, and Out of Time gets 15 counters. After wiping the board, or more appropriately phasing the board, Chris passes. Ryan draws and plays a Snow-Covered Mountain. He casts Chrome Mox, imprinting a Braid. He casts his commander, Godo, Bandit Warlord. In response, TK casts Force of Will, paying a life, exiling a blue card, countering Godo. Ryan ends his turn. TK draws and taps his Ancient Tomb to cast Talisman of Dominance. He passes. Alex draws, takes no actions, and passes the turn. During his upkeep, Chris removes a counter from Out of Time. He draws and plays a Polluted Delta. He cracks it, pays a life, and fetches up an Underground Sea onto the battlefield. Chris ends his turn. During Ryan's upkeep, Chris casts Silence, locking out opponents from spells this turn. Ryan draws, can't do anything, so he passes. TK draws and plays an Arid Mesa. He cracks it, pays a life, and fetches up a Savannah onto the battlefield. He ships his turn. Alex draws and casts Transmute Artifact. He sacrifices Felwar Stone, fetching up the One Ring onto the battlefield, paying the difference. He activates the One Ring, adding a burden counter and drawing a card. He plays a Breeding Pool into play tapped, and then gives the turn to Chris. During his upkeep, Chris removes the counter from Out of Time. He draws and casts Grand Abolisher. In response, Alex taps Mana Confluence to hard cast Mindbreak Trap. In response, Chris casts Swan Song. Trap is countered, Alex creates a 2/2 bird, and then Grand Abolisher resolves. With nothing else, Chris sends the turn to Ryan. Ryan draws, casts a Grim Monolith, and passes. TK draws and plays a Flooded Strand. He cracks it, pays a life, and fetches up a Tundra onto the battlefield. He casts an Esper Sentinel and passes to Alex. During his upkeep, Alex loses a life from the One Ring. He also activates the One Ring, adding a counter and drawing 2 cards. He draws and then casts a Lotus Petal. He taps Mana Confluence to cast a Void Winnower. He pays 2 life to help cast Phyrexian Metamorph. It enters, as a copy, a Void Winnower. He moves to combat and attacks Ryan with his bird. Ryan takes it and Alex passes. During his upkeep, Chris removes the counter from Out of Time. He draws and casts Eternal Scourge. Chris passes. Ryan draws, takes no actions, and passes. TK draws, also takes no actions, and ends his turn. During his upkeep, Alex loses 2 life from the One Ring. He then activates the One Ring, adding a counter and drawing 3. He moves to combat and attacks Chris with everything. Chris blocks one of the Winnowers with Eternal Scourge and takes the rest. In his second main phase, Alex casts a Tritosphere. All through, Alex passes. During his upkeep, Chris removes a counter from Out of Time. He draws and passes the turn. Ryan draws, plays a snow-covered mountain, and ships the turn to TK. TK draws and, being locked out by the Void Winnowers, also does nothing and passes to Alex. During his upkeep, Alex loses 3 life through the One Ring. He also activates the One Ring, adding a counter and drawing 4 cards. He draws and plays a Command Tower. He moves to combat and attacks Chris with Void Winnower. Since Chris can't block with even creatures, he takes it all and dies. Out of Time leaves the battlefield and all creatures phase back in. In his second main phase, Alex casts Mox Opal. Esper Sentinel triggers and Alex pays. Alex passes the turn. Ryan draws and moves to combat. He attacks Alex with both constructs. Alex blocks with his bird and his Elvish Mystic. Both creatures die, and in his second main phase, Ryan casts Rolling Earthquake, where X equals 12. Alex, knowing he is dead if this resolves, thinks of a plan. He activates Mirage Mirror, making it a copy of the One Ring, sacrificing the original. He activates the One Ring, adding a counter and drawing a card. He casts Whir of Invention, where X equals 4, improvising Tritosphere to help cast it, shutting off Tritosphere. Unfortunately, Perplexing Chimera triggers. TK then exchanges control of Whir and Chimera. Whir resolves and TK fetches up the One Ring onto the battlefield. With no other answers and nothing else to do, Earthquake resolves. Each creature and each player takes 12. All creatures die, and Alex dies too. With nothing else, Ryan passes. At the end of Ryan's turn, TK activates the One Ring, adding a counter and drawing a card. During his upkeep, TK loses a life to the One Ring. He also activates the One Ring, adding a counter and drawing 2 cards. He draws and plays a City of Brass. He casts a Mana Crypt. He casts Grand Abolisher. He taps his Ancient Doom to help recast his commander, Najeela the Blade Blossom. TK ends his turn. During his draw step, Ryan takes a damage through his Mana Vault. In his main phase, he recasts his commander, Godo, Bandit Warlord. It enters, and Ryan fetches up a Hammer of Nazan onto the battlefield. Hammer triggers, and in response, TK taps his City of Brass to cast Swords of Plowshares targeting Godo. Godo is exiled, and Ryan gains 3 life. Ryan ships the turn. During his upkeep, TK loses his Mana Crypt flip and takes 3 damage. He also loses 2 life to the One Ring. He draws and activates the One Ring, adding a counter and drawing 3 cards. He casts Dark Ritual, adding 3 black. He casts Diabolic Intent, sacrificing Najeela as an additional cost, fetching up a card into his hand. He casts Thassa's Oracle. Oracle enters, and with a trigger on the stack, TK casts Demonic Consultation, exiling his library. Oracle's trigger resolves, and TK wins the game. Ashani had the only Jund deck at the table, so they felt sorry for him and let him go first. Ashani draws a card for turn and plays a Command Tower. He casts a Tinderwall and passes the turn. Mike draws and plays a Tropical Island. He casts a Mox Diamond, discarding an Ancient Tomb. He casts his commander, Kinnan, Bonder Prodigy. Mike passes. Zach draws and plays a Savannah. He casts a Llanowar Elves and ends his turn. Nabil draws and plays a Windswept Heath. They crack it, pay a life, and fetch up a Savannah onto the battlefield. They cast Deafening Silence, much to the laughter of the table. Nabil passes. Ashani draws and plays a Verdant Catacombs. He casts a Jeweled Lotus. Ashani ships the turn. Mike draws and plays an Otawara, Soaring City as his land for turn. He casts a Mana Vault. Mike activates Kinnan, looking at the top 5, putting a Colossal Sky Turtle onto the battlefield. The table loves what's happening right now, and Mike gives the turn to Zach. Zach draws and plays a Battlefield Forge. He casts Ethersworn Canoness. Ashani regrets his deck choice as Zach passes to Nabil. Nabil draws and plays a Marsh Flats. They crack it, pay life, and fetch up a Bayou onto the battlefield. Nabil passes. Ashani draws, plays a Bloodstained Mire, and passes the turn. During his draw step, Mike takes a damage through his Mana Vault. In his main phase, he exiles Elvish Spirit Guide from his hand, adding a green. He casts Tezzeret the Seeker. Surprisingly, it resolves. He activates Tezzeret's first ability, untapping Mox Diamond and Mana Vault. The table breathes a sigh of relief and Mike passes to Zach. At the end of Mike's turn, Zach taps his Battlefield Forge to cast Swords to Plowshares targeting Kinnan. Kinnan is exiled, Mike gains 2 life, and the turn moves to Zach. Zach draws and plays a Stomping Ground, into play untapped paying 2 life. He casts Finale of Devastation where X equals 2. Everyone, ready for Dockside, let it resolve. Then Zach fetches up a Collector Roof onto the battlefield, and the rest of the table sinks their head. Zach passes. At the end of Zach's turn, Nabil casts Whirly Tutor, fetching up a Wall of Roots onto the top of their library. Nabil draws and plays an Ancient Tomb. They tap it to cast Wall of Roots. In response, Ashani cracks his Bloodstained Mire, pays a life, and fetches up a Blood Crypt onto the battlefield tapped. He cracks his Verdant Catacombs, pays a life, and fetches up an Overgrown Tomb onto the battlefield tapped. Then Wall of Roots resolves. Nabil passes. Ashani draws and casts Necropotence. The table braces for impact as it resolves. Ashani activates Necropotence 7 times, paying 7 life, exiling 7 cards. He moves to his end step and puts the Necro cards into his hand. He passes, discarding to hand size, exiling the discarded cards. Mike draws and plays a City of Brass. He activates Tezzeret's second ability where X equals 2, fetching up a Spellskite onto the battlefield. He moves to combat and attacks Ashani with Colossal Sky Turtle. Ashani takes it, and Mike passes. At the end of Ashani's turn, Nabil puts a counter onto Wall of Roots, adding a green. Zach draws and moves to combat. He attacks Tezzeret with Ethersworn and Collector Roof. Mike blocks Canonist, and Tezzeret takes 2. In his second main phase, Zach casts Eldritch Evolution, sacrificing Ethersworn Canonist as an additional cost. He fetches up a Yasharn, Implacable Earth, onto the battlefield. Ashani attempts to concede, but Zach lets him know that he is stuck with him whether he likes it or not. Yasharn enters, and Zach fetches up a forest and fetches up a plains into his hand. He plays a forest for turn and passes to Nabil. At the end of Zach's turn, Nabil adds a counter to Wall of Roots, adding a green. Nabil draws and plays a Polluted Delta. They tap Ancient Tomb and add a counter to Wall of Roots, adding a green to help cast their commander, Tyam, Luminous Enigma. Nabil ships the turn to Ashani. Ashani skips his draw step due to Necropotence. In his main phase, he plays a Taiga for turn. He casts Burgi, God of Storytelling. Without anything else to do, Ashani passes to Mike. Mike draws and activates Tezzeret's first ability with no targets. Locked out of anything else, Mike passes. Zach draws and taps his Battlefield Forge to help cast Grand Abolisher. He casts a Wild Growth. He plays a Plains for turn. He casts his commander, Tana the Bloodsower. With nothing else, Zach passes. Nabil draws and activates Wall of Roots, adding a counter and adding a green. They tap Ancient Tomb, then activate Tyam, milling 3 and returning Gaia's Cradle from their graveyard to the battlefield. Nabil ships the turn. Ashani skips his draw step due to Necropotence. In his main phase, he casts Praetor's Grasp, targeting Zach. Burgi triggers and Ashani adds a red. He fetches up a card from Zach's library into exile face down. Ashani passes. At the end of Ashani's turn, Nabil activates Wall of Roots, adding a counter and adding a green. Still in the end step, Mike casts Mystical Tutor, fetching up a Snap onto the top of his library. The turn moves to Mike. Mike draws and casts Snap, targeting Collector Oof. Oof bounces, and Mike untaps 2 lands. He recasts his commander, Kinnan, Bonder Prodigy. He activates Tezzeret's first ability, untapping Mana Vault and Mox Diamond. Then he activates Kinnan. He looks at the top 5, putting Hullbreaker Horror onto the battlefield. He casts a Gilded Drake. Hullbreaker Horror triggers, and Mike bounces Burgi back to Ashani's hand. Gilded Drake enters and targets Tyam. In response, Nabil adds a counter to Wall of Roots, adding a green. Then Nabil casts Vampiric Tutor. Nabil fetches up a card onto the top of their library and loses 2 life. Then Nabil activates Tyam, removing 3 counters from Wall of Roots. Nabil mills 3, then returns Hexdrinker to the battlefield. Then Mike exchanges control of Gilded Drake and Tyam. All through, Mike passes to Zach. Zach draws and casts Helm of the Host. He casts his commander, Arden, Intrepid Archaeologist. He moves to combat and Arden triggers. Zach equips Helm of the Host to Yasharn. Then Helm of the Host creates a copy of Yasharn. Yasharn enters, and Zach fetches up a plains and fetches up a forest into his hand. He attacks Ashani with Tana, Grand Abolisher, and the Yasharn token. Ashani takes it, Tana triggers, and Zach creates 2 Saproleans. In his second main phase, he plays a forest. Zach gives the turn to Nabil. Nabil draws and puts a counter onto Wall of Roots, adding a green. Nabil casts Tyvar, Jubilant Brawler. They activate Tyvar's second ability, milling 3 and not returning anything. Nabil taps Ancient Tomb and Gaia's Cradle to activate Hexdrinker, leveling it up 5 times. Nabil ships the turn. Ashani skips his draw step due to Necropotence. In his main phase, he casts Finale of Devastation where X equals 2. He fetches up a Dockside Extortionist onto the battlefield. Dockside enters, and Ashani creates 7 treasures. Ashani passes to Mike. During his draw step, Mike takes the damage through his Mana Vault. In his main phase, he activates Tezzeret's second ability where X equals 3, fetching up a Basalt Monolith onto the battlefield. Mike taps Basalt, adding 4 colorless mana through Kinnan. He activates Basalt to untap it. In response, Zach casts Nature's Claim, targeting Basalt. In response, Mike casts Mental Misstep, targeting Nature's Claim. Hullbreaker Horror triggers, bouncing Gilded Drake back to Mike's hand. Then Mental Misstep counters Nature's Claim, and Basalt Monolith untaps. Mike presents a loop of tapping Basalt for 4, then untapping it for 3, netting infinite colorless mana. He casts Gilded Drake. Drake enters and exchanges control of Nabil's Hexdrinker. Mike then uses his infinite colorless mana to level up Hex Drinker infinite times, giving it infinite level up counters. Then Mike activates Time, which he still has control of, milling 3 and returning permanents from his graveyard to the battlefield. He does this over and over until he finds Thrasios, Triton Hero, putting it onto the battlefield. He activates Thrasios, putting all lands onto the battlefield tapped and all cards into his hand. He casts Thassa's Oracle. Oracle enters, and Mike wins the game. Ashani won the Nymar challenge and gets to start us off. Ashani draws a card for turn and plays a Misty Rainforest. He passes. Alex draws and plays an island. He casts a Mana Crypt. He casts a Felwar Stone. He casts a Mox Amber. He passes. Peter draws and plays a Swamp. He casts a Mana Crypt. He casts an Imperial Seal. He fetches up a card onto the top of his library and loses 2 life. Peter ends his turn. Ryan draws, plays a Snow-Covered Mountain, and passes. At the end of Ryan's turn, Ashani cracks his Misty Rainforest, pays a life, and fetches up an Underground Sea onto the battlefield. He casts a Vampiric Tutor. He fetches up a card onto the top of his library and loses 2 life. The turn moves to Ashani. Ashani draws and plays a Mana Confluence. He casts a Mana Crypt. He casts a Mystic Remora. Ashani ends his turn. During his upkeep, Alex loses his Mana Crypt roll and takes 3 damage. He draws and plays a Waterlogged Grove. He taps it to help cast his commander, Kinnan, Prodigy. Alex ships the turn. At the end of Alex's turn, Peter pays 4 life to cast Dismember, targeting Kinnan. Remora triggers and Ashani draws. In response, Alex casts Crop Rotation, sacrificing an island as an additional cost. Remora triggers and Ashani draws again. Then Alex fetches up a City of Traders onto the battlefield. He casts Flusterstorm, with all copies targeting Dismember. Ashani draws from Remora, and Flusterstorm counters Dismember. Still in the end step, Alex activates Kinnan. He looks at the top 5, putting an Elvish Mystic onto the battlefield. The turn moves to Peter. During his upkeep, Peter wins his Mana Crypt roll. He draws and plays a Crystal Vein. He casts Heartless Summoning. Remora triggers and Ashani draws. He cracks Crystal Vein and pays 6 life to help cast his commander, Kirik, son of Yawgmoth. He pays 4 life to transmute Dimir Houseguard. In response, Ashani taps Mana Confluence to help flash in an Opposition Agent. It resolves, then Ashani fetches up the One Ring from Peter's library into exile. Unfortunately blown out, Peter ships the turn to Ryan. Ryan draws and plays an Urza Saga, getting his first counter. He passes. During his upkeep, Ashani pays to keep his Remora. He also wins his Mana Crypt roll. He draws and plays a Scrubland. He moves to combat and attacks Ryan with Opposition Agent. Ryan takes it, and in his second main phase, Ashani taps his Mana Confluence to cast an Overloaded Dam. All creatures are destroyed, and Peter puts Kirik into the graveyard. Ashani ends his turn. During his upkeep, Alex wins his Mana Crypt roll. He draws and taps his Waterlogged Grove to help recast his commander, Kinnan. He casts Wandering Archaic. Alex passes. During his upkeep, Peter loses his Mana Crypt roll and takes 3 damage. He draws and plays a Swamp. He casts Diabolic Tutor. Remora and Wandering Archaic trigger. Alex copies Diabolic Tutor, fetching up a card into his hand. Then Ashani draws from Remora, then Peter fetches up a card into his hand. Peter ships the turn to Ryan. Ryan draws, and in his main phase, Urza Saga gets another counter. He plays a City of Traders for turn. He casts the One Ring. Remora triggers and Ashani draws. It resolves and Ryan gains protection from everything. He activates the One Ring, adding a burn counter and drawing a card. Ryan passes. During his upkeep, Ashani lets his Remora die. He also loses his Mana Crypt roll and takes 3 damage. He draws and plays a Verdant Catacombs. He taps Mana Confluence to help cast Ranger Captain of Eos. It enters, and Ashani fetches up an Esper Sentinel into his hand. He cracks his Verdant Catacombs, pays a life, and fetches up a Godless Shrine onto the battlefield untapped, paying 2 life. He casts Esper Sentinel. Ashani passes, discarding to hand size. During his upkeep, Alex wins his Mana Crypt roll. Also in Alex's upkeep, Ashani sacrifices Ranger Captain, locking out opponents from non-creature spells this turn. Alex draws and pays 2 life to cast Phyrexian Metamorph. It enters as a copy of the One Ring, and Alex gains protection from everything. Alex activates the One Ring, adding a counter and drawing a card. He moves to combat and attacks Peter with Wandering Archaic. Peter takes it, and Alex ends his turn. During his upkeep, Peter loses his Mana Crypt roll and takes 3 damage. He draws and casts Jeweled Lotus, paying the Esper tax. He casts Flesh Writher. Peter ends his turn. During his upkeep, Ryan loses a life to the One Ring. He draws, and in his first main phase, Urza Saga triggers. He floats a mana, then sacrificing it, fetching up a Grafdigger's Cage onto the battlefield. He activates the One Ring, adding a counter and drawing 2 cards. He casts Chrome Mox, paying for Esper. It enters, and Ryan imprints Anya's Ravager. He casts a Soul Ring. He casts a Felwar Stone. He casts a Goblin Matron. It enters, and Ryan fetches up a Dockside Extortionist into his hand. All through, Ryan passes. During his upkeep, Ashani loses his Mana Crypt roll and takes 3 damage. He draws and plays a Cavern of Souls, naming Rogue as it enters. Ashani passes. At the end of Ashani's turn, Alex flashes in a Frilled Mystic. During his upkeep, Alex loses his Mana Crypt roll and takes 3 damage. He loses a life to the One Ring, then activates the One Ring, adding a counter and drawing 2 cards. He draws and taps Waterlogged Grove to help cast Deadeye Navigator. It enters and Soul Bonds to Frilled Mystic. The table straps in, and Alex passes to Peter. During his upkeep, Peter loses his Mana Crypt roll and takes 3 damage. He draws, takes no actions, and passes. During his upkeep, Ryan loses 2 life to the One Ring. He draws and activates the One Ring. He adds a counter and draws 3. He casts Hammer of Nazan. Esper triggers and Ashani draws. It enters and equips the Goblin Matron. Ryan plays a snow-covered mountain, sacrificing City of Traders as it enters. He casts Conqueror's Flail. It enters, Hammer triggers, and Ryan equips Flail to Goblin Matron. Finished up, Ryan passes. During his upkeep, Ashani loses his mana crypt roll and takes 3 damage. He draws and casts Lotus Petal. He casts Portable Hole. It enters and exiles Kinnan. Next, Ashani uses Cavern of Souls to cast an uncounterable Tivit, Seller of Secrets. It enters and Ashani creates 2 treasures and 3 clues. Ashani ships the turn. During his upkeep, Alex wins his mana crypt roll. He also loses 2 life from the One Ring. Still in his upkeep, he activates the One Ring, adding a counter and drawing 3. He draws and casts a Springleaf Drum. Esper triggers and Ashani draws. He taps Waterlogged Grove to help recast his commander, Kinnan, Bonder Prodigy. After some deliberation among the table, Kinnan resolves. Next, Alex casts Spellskite. After some more deliberation, Spellskite resolves. He plays a Treasure Vault for turn, sacrificing City of Traders as it enters. He casts a Simic Signet. Alex passes. At the end of Alex's turn, Peter hardcasts Deadly Rollick, targeting Spellskite. Esper and Wandering Archaic trigger. Alex creates a copy, targeting Goblin Matron. Matron is exiled, then Ashani draws through Esper, then Spellskite is exiled. The turn moves to Peter. During his upkeep, Peter wins his mana crypt roll. He draws and casts Grey Merchant of Asphodel. It enters, each opponent loses 5, and Peter gains 15. He ends his turn. At the end of Peter's turn, Ryan casts Lightning Bolt, targeting Frilled Mystic, paying the Esper tax. Wandering Archaic triggers, Alex copies it, targeting Esper Sentinel, killing it. In response, Alex activates Deadeye's ability, flickering Frilled Mystic, countering Lightning Bolt. The turn moves to Ryan. During his upkeep, Ryan loses 3 life to the One Ring. He draws and activates the One Ring. He adds a counter and draws 4 cards. He plays a Snow-Covered Mountain for turn. He casts Dockside Extortionist. It enters, and Ryan creates 17 treasures. He activates Conqueror's Flail, targeting Dockside. In response, Ashani improvises Whir of Invention. Wandering Archaic triggers, and Alex copies it. Then Alex fetches up an Arcane Signet onto the battlefield. Then Ashani fetches up an Imposter Mech onto the battlefield. It enters as a copy of Dockside Extortionist. Dockside triggers, and Ashani creates 33 treasures. With the equip still on the stack, Ashani casts Mystical Tutor. Archaic triggers, and Ashani pays. Then Ashani fetches up a Silence onto the top of his library. He cracks a clue and draws a card. Then Ashani casts Silence. Archaic triggers, and Ashani pays. With no answers, Silence resolves. With the equip still on the stack, Ashani casts Enlightened Tutor, paying for Archaic. He fetches up a Time Sieve onto the top of his library. Then with nothing else, the equip resolves. Ryan equips Hammer of Nazan onto Dockside. Locked out of doing anything else, Ryan passes. At the end of Ryan's turn, Ashani channels Otawara, Soaring City, bouncing Wandering Archaic back to Alex's hand. Still in the end step, he cracks 2 clues and draws 2 cards. The turn moves to Ashani. During his upkeep, Ashani wins his mana crypt roll. He draws and plays a Tundra. He moves to combat and attacks Ryan with Tivit. Ryan takes it, Tivit triggers, and Ashani creates 2 clues and 3 treasures. In his second main phase, Ashani casts Chain of Vapor, targeting Imposter Mech. Mech is bounced, Ashani sacks a land, copying the chain, targeting Deadeye Navigator. Deadeye is bounced, Alex sacks a land, copying the chain, targeting Dockside, so Ashani cannot copy it again. Dockside is bounced, Ryan sacks a land, copying the chain, targeting Tivit. Ward triggers, and Ryan pays 3. Tivit is bounced, and Ashani stops the chain. Next, Ashani casts Imposter Mech. It enters as a copy of Kinnan. He casts Transmute Artifact. He sacrifices Portable Hole, fetching up a Witchclaw Talisman onto the battlefield, paying the difference. He activates Witchclaw, fetching up a card into his hand and giving Witchclaw to Peter. He casts Grand Abolisher. With no answers, Abolisher resolves. Ashani taps Mana Confluence to cast Time Sieve. He recasts his commander, Tivit. It enters, and Ashani creates 2 clues and 3 treasures. Ashani activates Time Sieve, sacrificing his Mana Crypt and 4 treasures, getting an extra turn. Ashani presents a loop of taking extra turns, attacking with Tivit, creating artifacts, then sacking them to Time Sieve to take another turn. He does this over and over until the table is dead, and Ashani wins the game. Chris won the Celeb Lookalike contest and gets to start us off. But Brandon has the pregame action, putting Gemstone Caverns onto the battlefield, exiling Mox Opal. Chris draws a card for turn and plays a mountain. He casts Strike It Rich, creating a treasure. Chris passes. Mike draws and plays a Snow-Covered Island. He casts a Mox Diamond, discarding Snow-Covered Forest. He casts his commander, Kinnan, Bonder Prodigy. In response, Brandon casts Enlightened Tutor, fetching up Heuristic Study onto the top of his library. Kinnan resolves, and Mike casts Chromox, imprinting Gilded Drake. He casts Mox Opal. He casts a Green Sun Zenith, where X equals 3. In response, Brandon casts Force of Negation, exiling a blue card, countering and exiling Green Sun Zenith. All through, Mike ends his turn. Brandon draws and plays an Ancient Tomb. He taps it to help cast Heuristic Study. Brandon passes to Alana. Alana draws and plays a Blood Crypt, into play untapped, paying 2 life. She casts a Chromox. Heuristic triggers, and Brandon draws. Chromox resolves, and Alana imprints Time Twister. She casts an Arcane Signet, and Brandon draws again. She casts a Ragavan Nimble Pilferer, and Brandon draws again. Alana ships the turn. Chris draws, plays a mountain, and passes. Mike draws, plays an Exotic Orchard, and also passes. Brandon draws and plays a Marsh Flats. He cracks it, pays a life, and fetches up an Underground Sea onto the battlefield. He taps his Ancient Tomb to help cast the One Ring. It enters, and Brandon gains protection from everything. Brandon activates the One Ring. In response, Mike activates Kinnan. He looks at the top 5, putting a Tidespout Tyrant onto the battlefield. Then Brandon adds a burden counter and draws a card. Brandon ships the turn. Alana draws and moves to combat. She attacks Chris with Ragavan. Chris takes it, Ragavan triggers, Alana creates a treasure, and Chris exiles a mountain off of the top of his library. In her second main phase, she casts Rhystic Study. Rhystic triggers and Brandon draws. She casts her commander, Rograk, son of Rogah, and Brandon draws again. Alana passes. At the end of Alana's turn, Chris casts Pyrokinesis for its alternate cost, exiling a red card, targeting Kinnan, Rograk, and Ragavan, paying for both Rhystics. They all die, and the turn moves to Chris. Chris draws and dashes in a Ragavan. Both Rhystics trigger, and Alana and Brandon draw. He moves to combat and attacks Alana with Ragavan. Alana takes it, Ragavan triggers, Chris creates a treasure, and Alana exiles, calling the weak. Chris passes, and Ragavan returns to his hand. Mike draws and plays a forest. He casts Flesh Duplicate. Tidespout triggers, and Mike bounces Mox Opal to his hand. Both Rhystics trigger, and Alana and Brandon draw. Flesh Duplicate enters as a copy of Tidespout Tyrant. He casts Mox Opal, 2 Tidespouts and both Rhystics trigger. Mike pays for both Rhystics, then the Tidespout spawns Alana's Rhystic and Mike's Chrome Mox. He casts Chrome Mox, 2 Tidespouts and Rhystic trigger. Mike pays for Rhystic, then the Tidespouts bounce Brandon's Rhystic and Mike's Mox Opal. Chrome Mox enters and Mike doesn't imprint. Mike presents a loop of casting each artifact, bouncing the other, and bouncing an opponent's permanent. He does this over and over until everyone's permanents are bounced. Unfortunately, he cannot tap these artifacts for mana due to their restrictions, so Mike moves to combat and attacks Alana with Tidespout. Alana takes it, and Mike ends his turn. Brandon draws and plays an Underground Sea. He passes, discarding to hand size. Alana draws and plays an Ancient Tomb. She taps it to cast an Arcane Signet. She casts a Chrome Mox, imprinting Yawgmoth's Will. She passes. Chris draws and plays a Mountain. He casts a Gamble. He fetches up a card into his hand and then randomly discards a Mountain. Chris passes. At the end of Chris's turn, Alana casts Snap, targeting Tidespout Tyrant. Tidespout bounces, and Alana untaps her Ancient Tomb and Chris's Mountain in order to ensure everyone has interaction for Mike's turn. Still in the end step, Chris casts Red Elemental Blast, targeting Mike's other Tidespout. Tidespout is destroyed, and the turn moves to Mike. Mike draws and casts Chrome Mox, imprinting Nyx's Bloom Ancient. He recasts his commander, Kinnan. Mike chips the turn. Brandon draws and plays an Ancient Tomb. He taps it to help cast Rhystic Study. Brandon ends his turn. Alana draws and plays a Blood Crypt into play untapped, paying 2 life. She taps Ancient Tomb to recast Rhystic Study. Rhystic triggers and Brandon draws. She recasts her commander, Rograk, and Brandon draws again. Alana passes the turn. Chris draws and casts Ragavan, Nimble Pilferer. Both Rhystics trigger and both players draw. Chris ends his turn. Mike draws and casts Basalt Monolith. Rhystic's trigger, and Alana and Brandon draw. In response, Brandon casts Force of Will, paying a life and exiling Pact of Negation. Rhystic triggers, and Alana draws a card. Basalt is countered, and Mike moves to combat. He attacks Brandon with Kinnan. Brandon takes it, and Mike passes the turn. Brandon draws and plays a Flooded Strand. He cracks it, pays a life, and fetches up a Tundra onto the battlefield. He taps Ancient Tomb to cast Drannith Magistrate, paying for Rhystic. Brandon ships the turn. Alana draws and plays a Badlands. She taps Ancient Tomb to cast Talisman of Indulgence. Rhystic triggers, and Brandon draws. Alana passes. Chris draws and moves to combat. He attacks Alana with Ragavan. Alana takes it, Ragavan triggers, Chris creates a treasure, and Alana exiles a Swan Song. Chris passes. Mike draws, holds open mana, and passes the turn. Brandon draws and plays a Windswept Teeth. He cracks it, pays a life, and fetches up a Scrubland onto the battlefield. He taps Ancient Tomb to cast the One Ring. Rhystic triggers, and Alana draws. It enters, and Brandon gains protection from everything. Brandon passes to Alana. Alana draws and plays a Watery Grave into play untapped, paying 2 life. She taps Ancient Tomb to help cast a Windfall. Rhystic triggers, and Brandon draws. In response, Brandon casts Swan Song. Rhystic triggers, and Alana draws. In response, Alana casts Daze for its alternate cost, bouncing Watery Grave, targeting Swan Song. Rhystic triggers, and in response, Chris casts Pyroblast, targeting Windfall. Both Rhystics trigger, and both players draw. In response, Alana casts Force of Will, paying a life and exiling a blue card, targeting Pyroblast. Rhystic Study triggers, and Brandon draws a card. In response, Brandon activates the One Ring, adding a burden counter and drawing a card. With nothing else, Force counters Pyroblast, Brandon draws from Rhystic, Daze counters Swan Song, and with Windfall still in the stack, Alana casts Cabal Ritual. Rhystic triggers, and Brandon draws a card. Alana adds 3 black, and with Windfall still in the stack, Mike activates Kinnan. He looks at the top 5, putting an Elvish Spirit Guide onto the battlefield. Still in response, Mike casts Swan Song, targeting Windfall. Both Rhystics trigger, Mike pays for Alana's, and Brandon draws a card. Then Swan Song counters Windfall, and Alana creates a 2/2 bird. Next, Alana casts a Mana Crypt, and Brandon draws. She casts a Wheel of Fortune, and Brandon draws from Rhystic. With no interaction left, Wheel resolves. Everyone discards their hand and draws 7. She casts Talisman of Creativity, and Brandon draws a card. She casts the One Ring. Brandon draws from Rhystic, and the One Ring resolves. It enters, and Alana gains protection from everything. Alana ships the turn to Chris. Chris draws and casts Pyretic Ritual. Rhystic triggers and both players draw. Chris adds 3 red, then casts Overmaster. Rhystic triggers and both players draw again. Chris draws from Overmaster, then plays a Sekinsan, Crucible of Defiance for turn. He casts a Soul Ring and both players draw a card. He casts Rending Volley targeting Drannith and both players draw. Drannith dies and Chris casts Bergi, God of Storytelling. Rhystic trigger and both players draw a card. Chris passes to Mike. Mike draws and plays a Windswept Teeth. He cracks it, pays a life, and fetches up a tropical island onto the battlefield. He casts a Soul Ring. Rhystic Study triggers and both players draw a card. He casts Copy Artifact and both draw again. It enters as a copy of the One Ring, and Mike gains protection from everything. He activates the One Ring, adding a counter and drawing a card. He casts a Spellskite and both draw from Rhystic. Mike ships the turn to Brandon. During his upkeep, Brandon loses a life to the One Ring. He draws and activates the One Ring, adding a counter and drawing 2 cards. He plays a Command Tower for turn. He casts Silence. Rhystic triggers and Alana draws. In response, Alana casts Force of Negation, exiling a blue card targeting Silence. In response, Brandon casts Spell Pierce targeting Force. Rhystic triggers and Alana draws a card. Spell Pierce counters Force, and with Silence still in the stack, Alana casts Fierce Guardianship for its alternate cost targeting Silence. In response, Brandon casts Flusterstorm with all copies targeting Fierce. Rhystic triggers and Alana draws. In response, Mike pays 2 life to cast Mental Misstep targeting Silence. Rhystic triggers and both players draw again. Silence is countered and Brandon casts Chrome Mox. Alana draws from Rhystic and then Brandon imprints a Windfall. He taps Ancient Tomb to help cast a Brain Freeze with all copies targeting himself. He mills 27 cards. He casts Lion's Eye Diamond and Alana draws a card. He cracks LED, discards his hand, adding 3 white. He flashes back Savine's Reclamation targeting Underworld Breach in his graveyard. Rhystic triggers and Alana draws. In response, Mike activates Kinnan, looking at the top 5, putting Seedborn Muse onto the battlefield. With Savine still in the stack, Mike casts Mindbreak Trap for its alternate cost, targeting Savine's Reclamation. Both Rhystic's trigger and both players draw. With no answers, Mindbreak Trap exiles Savine's Reclamation. With nothing to do, Brandon passes to Mike. At the end of Brandon's turn, Alana exiles Savine's Spirit Guide from her hand, adding a red. She casts Red Elemental Blast targeting Kinnan. Rhystic triggers and Brandon draws a card. Kinnan is destroyed and the turn moves to Alana. Mike untaps with Alana through Seedborn. During her upkeep, the One Ring and Mana Crypt trigger. In response, Mike activates the One Ring, adding a counter and drawing 2 cards. He casts March of Swirling Mist targeting Rograk. Both Rhystic's trigger, Mike pays for Alana's, and then Brandon draws. Rograk phases out, and Alana loses her Mana Crypt roll and takes 3 damage, then loses a life to the One Ring. She draws and activates the One Ring, adding a counter and drawing 2. She casts Gamble. Rhystic triggers and Brandon draws. Then Alana fetches up a card into her hand and then randomly discards a Scalding Tarn. She plays a Mana Confluence for turn. She taps it to help cast Tidal Barracuda. In response, Mike casts Mana Drain. Both Rhystic's trigger and both players draw a card. In response, Alana casts Pyroblast, targeting Mana Drain. Rhystic triggers and Brandon draws again. Pyroblast counters Mana Drain, and then Tidal Barracuda resolves. Next, she casts a Mana Vault. She casts a Grim Monolith. She casts a Springleaf Drum. She taps her Talisman to cast Rite of Flame, adding 2 red. She taps her other Talisman to cast Praetor's Grasp, targeting Mike. Which she isn't supposed to do because Mike has protection from everything from the One Ring. The table missed it, but magic is hard. Anyway, Alana fetches up a card from Mike's library into exile, face down. She casts the card, which is a Mana Crypt. She casts Vampiric Tutor. She fetches up a card onto the top of her library and loses 2 life. She casts Jeska's Will. She exiles LED and 2 lands off of the top of her library. She casts Underworld Breach. She casts LED from exile. She cracks it, discards her hand, and adds 3 red. She escapes Gamble, fetching up a Brain Freeze into her graveyard since she has no cards in hand. She escapes LED, cracks it for 3 blue, then escapes Brain Freeze with all copies targeting herself. She does this over and over, milling her library. She escapes Thassa's Oracle. Oracle enters, and Alana wins the game. Matt won the Supaloni Challenge and gets to start us off. Matt draws a card for turn and plays a Marsh Flats. He cracks it, pays a life, and fetches up a Badlands onto the battlefield. He casts a Mana Crypt. He casts the Talisman of Progress. Matt passes. Nabil draws and plays a Forest. They cast an Exploration. They play a Tropical Island as their Exploration land for turn. Nabil passes. Alex draws and plays a Misty Rainforest. He cracks it, pays a life, and fetches up a Tropical Island onto the battlefield. He casts an Allosaurus Shepherd. Alex ends his turn. Mike draws and plays a Verdant Catacombs. He cracks it, pays a life, and fetches up an Underground Sea onto the battlefield. He casts a Mystic Remora. Mike passes the turn. During its upkeep, Matt wins his Mana Crypt roll. He draws and plays a Sea of Clouds. He casts his commander, Crom Ludovic's Opus. He moves to Crombat and attacks Mike with Crom. Mike takes it, and Matt ships the turn. Nabil draws and plays a Snow-Covered Island. They cast Collector Roof. They play a Boseiju, who shelters all as their Exploration land for turn. Nabil gives the turn to Alex. Alex draws and plays a Forest. He casts a Bloom Tender. He moves to combat and attacks Matt with Allosaurus Shepherd. Matt takes it, and Alex passes. During its upkeep, Mike pays to keep his Remora. He draws, misses his land drop, and passes. During his upkeep, Matt wins his Mana Crypt roll. He draws and plays a Command Tower. He casts Drannith Magistrate. The table starts to feel the pressure as Matt moves to combat. He attacks Nabil with Crom. Nabil takes it, and Matt ships the turn. Nabil draws and plays an island. Nabil passes. Alex draws and plays an Alchemist's Refuge. He moves to combat and attacks Mike with Allosaur's Shepherd. Mike takes it, and Alex passes. During his upkeep, Mike lets his Remora die. He draws and passes, discarding to hand size. During his upkeep, Matt loses his Mana Crypt roll and takes 3 damage. He draws and casts his other commander, Timna the Weaver. He moves to combat and attacks Nabil with Crom and Mike with Draneth. They both take it, and in his second main phase, Matt pays 2 life and draws 2 cards through Timna. He plays a Cavern of Souls, naming Human as it enters. Matt ships the turn. Nabil draws and casts Trade Routes. Nabil passes. Alex draws and casts Thought Vessel. He moves to combat and attacks Mike with both of his creatures. Mike takes it, and Alex passes. At the end of Alex's turn, Mike casts Vampiric Tutor, fetching up a card onto the top of his library and losing 2 life. Mike draws and plays a command tower. He casts Gilded Drake. It enters and exchanges control of Matt's Crom. Mike ends his turn. During his upkeep, Matt loses his Mana Crypt roll and takes 3 damage. He draws and plays a Flooded Strand. He cracks it, pays a life, and fetches up a Tundra onto the battlefield. He channels Otawara, Soaring City, bouncing Crom back to his hand. He moves to combat and attacks Nabil with Gilded Drake, Alex with Draneth, and Mike with Timna. They all take it, and Matt gains 2 life. In his second main phase, Matt pays 3 life and draws 3 cards through Timna. He casts Grand Abolisher. Matt passes to Nabil. Nabil draws and taps Beseju, who shelters all to help cast Beast Within, targeting Draneth Magistrate. Draneth is destroyed, and Matt creates a 3/3 beast. Nabil plays a Windswept Heath for turn. They crack it, pay a life, and fetch up a Breeding Pool into play untapped, paying 2 life. They cast Azusa, Lost But Seeking. Nabil ships the turn. Alex draws and casts his commander, Kinnan, Prodigy. He casts a Manglehorn. It enters and destroys Matt's Talisman. He moves to combat and attacks Mike with Shepherd. Mike takes it, and Alex ends his turn. Mike draws and casts Reanimate, targeting Hullbreaker Horror in his graveyard. It enters, and Mike loses 7 life. Mike passes. During his upkeep, Matt wins his Mana Crypt roll. He draws and plays a Verdant Catacombs. He cracks it, pays a life, and fetches up an Underground Sea onto the battlefield. He recasts his commander, Crom. He moves to combat and attacks Nabil with Crom, Alex with his Beast, and Mike with Gilded Drake. They all take it, and in his second main phase, Matt pays 3 life and draws 3 cards through Timna. He passes, discarding to hand size. Nabil draws and tasks Beseju to help cast their commander, Tatiova, Benthic Druid. They play a Gemstone Caverns for turn. Tatiova triggers, and Nabil gains a life and draws a card. They activate Trade Routes, bouncing Gemstone Caverns back to their hand. They play Gemstone Caverns as their first Azusa land for turn. Tatiova triggers, and Nabil gains a life and draws a card. They play Oboro, Palace in the Clouds, as their second Azusa land. Tatiova triggers, and Nabil gains a life and draws a card. They activate Trade Routes, bouncing Oboro back to their hand. They play Oboro as their final Azusa land for turn, then gain a life and draw a card through Tatiova. Nabil passes. Alex draws and casts Seedborn Muse. Alex passes the turn. Alex untaps with Mike through Seedborn. Mike draws, takes no actions, and passes. During his upkeep, Matt wins his Mana Crypt roll. He draws and plays a Scrubland. He casts Ranger Captain of Eos. It enters, and Matt fetches up an Esper Sentinel into his hand. He moves to combat and attacks Nabil with Crom and Mike with Gilded Drake. They both take it, and in his second main phase, Matt pays 2 life and draws 2 cards through Timna. He casts an Esper Sentinel. He casts Swords to Plowshares, targeting Collector Oof. Oof is exiled, and Nabil gains 2 life. Next, Matt casts Phantasmal Image. It enters as a copy of Hullbreaker Horror. He casts a Lotus Petal. Horror triggers, and he bounces Mana Crypt to his hand. Matt was ready to present a loop until Alex points out the Manglehorn on the battlefield. So Lotus Petal enters the battlefield tapped. Matt casts Mana Crypt. Horror triggers, bouncing Manglehorn back to Alex's hand. He casts Lion's Eye Diamond, bouncing Mana Crypt back to his hand. He presents a loop of bouncing and recasting LED and Mana Crypt, netting infinite colorless mana. He casts the One Ring. Hullbreaker triggers, bouncing Mana Crypt. It enters, and he gains protection from everything. He presents another loop of drawing a card through the One Ring, bouncing it with Mana Crypt, and recasting it to draw another card. He draws his entire deck. He casts Chrome Mox, imprinting Swan Song. He casts Arcane Signet. He casts Thassa's Oracle. Oracle enters, and Matt wins the game. Before they begin, Alex has a pre-game action, putting Gemstone Caverns onto the battlefield, exiling Mirage Mirror. Nabil draws and plays a Snow-Covered Forest. Nabil passes. Alex draws and plays a Forest. He casts his commander, Kinnan, Prodigy. Alex passes. Mike draws and plays an Underground Sea. He ends his turn. Matt draws and plays a Cavern of Souls, naming Human as it enters. He casts a Lotus Petal and ships the turn. Nabil draws and plays an Oboro, Palace in the Clouds, as their land for turn. They cast 3 visits. In response, Matt cracks his petal to cast Dark Ritual, adding 3 black. He taps Cavern of Souls to flash in an uncounterable Opposition Agent. Agent resolves, then Matt fetches up a tropical island from Nabil's library into exile. Nabil passes. Alex draws and plays a Homeward Path. He casts a Soul Ring. He casts an Elvish Mystic. He casts a Phantasmal Image. It enters as a copy of Opposition Agent. He moves to combat and attacks Mike with Kinnan. Mike takes it, and Alex gives the turn to Mike. Mike draws and plays a Training Center. He casts Dark Ritual, adding 3 black. He casts Wheel of Fortune. Each player discards their hand and draws 7. He casts a Mox Opal. Mike ends his turn. Matt draws and plays a Tropical Island from exile through Opposition Agent. He casts a Mana Vault. He passes. Nabil draws and casts a Chrome Mox, imprinting Veil of Summer. They cast a Lotus Cobra. They play an island and pass the turn. Alex draws and plays a Gaia's Cradle. He casts the One Ring. It enters and Alex gains protection from everything. He activates the One Ring, adding a burden counter and drawing a card. He casts Seedborn Muse. He casts Mox Diamond, discarding a City of Traders. Finished up, Alex passes. Alex untaps with Mike through Seedborn. Mike draws and plays a Luxury Suite. He passes. At the end of Mike's turn, Alex activates Kinnan. In response, Mike casts Cyclonic Rift, targeting Seedborn Muse. In response, Alex activates the One Ring, adding a counter and drawing 2 cards. Then Seedborn is bounced and Kinnan's ability resolves. Alex looks at the top 5, putting Allosaurus Shepherd onto the battlefield. The turn moves to Matt. Matt draws and plays a Bloodstained Mire. He passes. Nabil draws and plays a Scalding Tarn. Lotus Cobra triggers and Nabil adds a green. They cast their commander, Tatiova Benthic Druid. Nabil ships the turn. At the end of Nabil's turn, Alex activates Kinnan, looking at the top 5, failing to find. During his upkeep, Alex loses 2 life to the One Ring. Still in his upkeep, he activates the One Ring, adding a counter and drawing 3 cards. He draws and plays a Manamo, School at Water's Edge as his land for turn. He casts Terrastodon. It enters and Alex destroys all of Matt's lands. Matt then creates 3 3/3 elephants. Next, Alex pays 2 life to cast Phyrexian Metamorph. It enters as a copy of Terrastodon. It enters and destroys all 3 of Mike's lands. Then Mike creates 3 elephants. He casts a Mox Amber. He recasts Seedborn Muse. Alex passes. Alex untaps with Mike through Seedborn. Mike draws and plays a Watery Grave into play tapped. He passes. At the end of Mike's turn, Alex activates the One Ring, adding a burden counter and drawing 4. He activates Manamo, untapping the One Ring. He activates the One Ring, adding another counter and drawing 5. The table agrees that there isn't really anything anyone can do, concede, and Alex wins the game. Before they begin, Matt has a pre-game action, putting Gemstone Caverns onto the battlefield, exiling Savine's Reclamation. Alex draws and plays a Rejuvenating Springs. He casts a Mana Crypt. He casts a Soul Ring. He casts a Mind Stone. He casts a Mirage Mirror. After a blazing turn 1 done, Alex passes. Mike draws and plays a Luxury Suite. He casts a Soul Ring. He casts a Talisman of Dominance. He casts Imperial Seal. He fetches up a card onto the top of his library and loses 2 life. Mike passes the turn. Matt draws and plays a Mana Confluence. He taps it to cast Ragavan, Nimble Pilferer. He casts Culling the Weak, sacrificing Ragavan as an additional cost, adding 4 black. He exiles Simeon's Spirit Guide from his hand, adding a red. He casts Ad Nauseam. He reveals a March of Swirling Mist, Exotic Orchard, Final Fortune, Otawara Soaring City, Brain Freeze, Toxic Deluge, Ranger Captain of Eos, Sea of Clouds, Dark Ritual, Misty Rainforest, Plateau, Opposition Agent, Mindbreak Trap, Hallowed Fountain, Pyroblast, Felwar Stone, Scrubland, Angel's Grace, Rite of Flame, Flusterstorm, Mana Vault, Phantasmal Image, Intuition, Swords to Plowshares, Wishclaw Talisman, and Talion the Kindly Lord, deciding to stop there. Unfortunately, he did not flip into 1 piece of fast mana, and unfortunately has to pass, discarding to hand size. Nabil draws and plays an island. They cast the Soul Ring. Nabil passes. During his upkeep, Alex wins his Mana Crypt roll. He draws and plays an Alchemist's Refuge. He activates Mirage Mirror, having it become a copy of Rejuvenating Springs. He casts his commander, Kinnan Bonder Prodigy. Alex ends his turn. Mike draws and plays a Blood Crypt into play untapped, paying 2 life. He taps his Talisman to help cast his commander, Crom Ludovic's Opus. He moves to Crombat and attacks Mike with Crom. Matt takes it and dies. Mike ships the turn. Nabil draws and plays a Breeding Pool into play untapped, paying 2 life. They cast Azusa, Lost But Seeking. In response, Alex activates Mirage Mirror, making it a copy of Crom. Nabil plays an island as their Azusa land for turn, and play a Homeward Path as their second Azusa land. Nabil ends their turn. During his upkeep, Alex wins his Mana Crypt roll. He draws and activates Mirage Mirror, making it a copy of Mike's Talisman. He taps his Talisman to help cast a Whir of Invention where X equals 3. In response, Nabil hard casts Force of Negation. In response, Alex activates Mind Stone, sacrificing it, drawing a card. Then Force counters and exiles Whir. Alex passes the turn. Mike draws and taps his Talisman to help cast a Rhystic Study. Mike passes. Nabil draws and casts a Mana Vault, paying for Rhystic. They cast their commander, Tatiova Benthic Druid. Crom triggers and Mike draws. They play a Waterlogged Grove for turn. Tatiova triggers and they gain a life and draw a card. Nabil ships the turn. During his upkeep, Alex wins his Mana Crypt roll. He draws and casts As Foretold, paying for Rhystic. Alex ends his turn. Mike draws and moves to combat. He attacks Alex with Crom. Alex takes it, and in his second main phase, Mike casts Toxic Deluge where X equals 3, paying 3 life. All creatures get -3/-3, and Mike passes to Nabil. During their draw step, Nabil takes a damage from their Mana Vault. They recast their commander, Tatiova. Rhystic triggers and Mike draws. Nabil plays a Scalding Tarn for turn. Tatiova triggers and Nabil gains a life and draws a card. They crack Scalding Tarn, pay a life, and fetch up a tropical island onto the battlefield. Tatiova triggers and Nabil gains a life and draws another card. Nabil ends their turn. During his upkeep, Alex loses his Mana Crypt roll and takes 3 damage. He also puts a counter onto As Foretold. He draws and casts Llanowar Elves for free through As Foretold, paying the Rhystic tax. He activates Mirage Mirror, making it a copy of Rejuvenating Springs. He recasts his commander, Kinnan, Prodigy. Rhystic and Crom trigger, and Mike draws 2. Alex passes. At the end of Alex's turn, Mike flashes in and Orcish Bowmasters. It enters, kills Llanowar Elves, and Mike amasses Orcs 1. The turn moves to Mike. Mike draws and plays the City of Brass. He moves to combat and attacks Alex with Crom. Alex takes it, and Mike passes to Nabil. During their draw step, Nabil takes a damage through Mana Vault. They cast Collector Roof, paying for Rhystic. Nabil ships the turn. At the end of Nabil's turn, Alex casts Worldly Tutor for free through As Foretold. Rhystic triggers, and Mike draws. Then Alex fetches up a Birds of Paradise onto the top of his library. Still in the end step, Mike casts Red Elemental Blast, destroying Kinnan. The turn moves to Alex. During his upkeep, Alex wins his Mana Crypt roll. He also puts a counter onto As Foretold. He draws and casts Phantasmal Image for free through As Foretold, paying the Rhystic tax. In response, Mike casts Force of Will, paying a life, exiling a blue card. In response, Alex casts Veil of Summer. Rhystic and Crom triggers, and Mike draws 2. In response, Mike taps City of Brass to cast Swan Song, targeting Veil. Veil is countered, Alex creates a 2/2 bird, then Force counters Femage. Alex ends his turn. Mike draws and plays a command tower. He passes. During their draw step, Nabil takes a damage from Mana Vault. They take no actions and pass the turn. During his upkeep, Alex wins his Mana Crypt roll. He also puts a counter onto As Foretold. He draws and plays an Exotic Orchard. He casts a Birds of Paradise for free through As Foretold, paying for Rhystic. Alex ends his turn. Mike draws and plays an Ancient Tomb. He moves to combat and attacks Alex with Crom. Alex takes it, and Mike passes. During their draw step, Nabil takes a damage through Mana Vault. They play a Gemstone Caverns for turn. Tatiova triggers, and Nabil gains a life and draws a card. Bowmasters triggers, Mike kills Birds of Paradise, and Mike amasses 1. Nabil passes. During his upkeep, Alex loses his Mana Crypt roll and takes 3 damage. He also adds a counter to As Foretold. He draws and plays Gemstone Caverns. He casts Kinnan for free through As Foretold, paying the Commander tax. Rhystic triggers, and Mike draws. Alex passes the turn. At the end of Alex's turn, Mike casts Tainted Pact. He exiles from the top of his library until he exiles a Mystic Remora, putting it into his hand. The turn moves to Mike. Mike draws and plays a Marsh Flats. He cracks it, pays a life, and fetches up a Watery Grave onto the battlefield untapped, paying 2 life. He casts a Mystic Remora. He moves to combat and attacks Alex with Crom. Alex takes it, and Mike passes. At the end of Mike's turn, Nabil casts an Overloaded Cyclonic Rift. Rhystic and Mystic trigger, and Mike draws 2. In response, Mike casts Fierce Guardianship for its alternate cost, countering Rift. The turn moves to Nabil. During their draw step, Nabil takes a damage through Mana Vault. In their main phase, they cast Capture of Jingxiao. Rhystic and Mystic trigger, and Mike draws 2. Then Nabil gains an extra turn. Nabil taps Waterlog Grove to cast Trade Routes. Mystic, Rhystic, and Crom trigger, and Mike draws 3 cards. Trade Routes resolves, and Nabil passes the turn to himself. During their upkeep, Nabil pays 2 life to cast Noxious Revival, targeting Azusa in their graveyard. Mystic and Rhystic trigger, and in response, Mike casts Mystical Tutor. In response, Nabil pays 2 life to cast Mental Misstep. Mystic, Rhystic, and Crom trigger, and Mike draws 3 cards. Then Misstep counters Tutor, Mike draws from Rhystic and Mystic, and Nabil puts Azusa onto the top of his library. During their draw step, Nabil takes a damage through Mana Vault. They cast Azusa, Lost but Seeking, paying for Rhystic. In response, Mike casts Pact of Negation. In response, Nabil casts Swan Song. Rhystic and Mystic trigger, and Mike draws 2. Swan Song counters Pact, Mike creates a 2/2 bird, and still in response, Mike casts Mindbreak Trap for its alternate cost, exiling Azusa. Nabil activates Trade Routes, bouncing an island back to their hand. They play an island for turn. Tatiova triggers, and Nabil gains a life and draws a card. Bowmasters triggers, pings Collector Roof, and Mike amasses 1. Finished up, Nabil passes. During his upkeep, Alex loses his Mana Crypt roll and takes 3 damage. He also adds a counter to As Foretold. He draws and casts a Mox Opal. Rhystic and Mystic trigger, and Mike draws 2. Alex passes. During his upkeep, Mike lets his Remora die. He draws and plays an Exotic Orchard. He taps Ancient Tomb to help cast Diabolic Intent, sacrificing his Orc army as an additional cost, fetching up a card into his hand. He moves to combat and attacks Alex with Crom. Alex takes lethal commander damage and dies. In his second main phase, Mike casts Underworld Breach. He casts a Mana Crypt. He casts a Chrome Mox, imprinting Necropotence. He casts Chain of Vapor, targeting Collector Oof. Oof bounces, and Nabil stops the chain. Mike taps his Talisman to help cast Brain Freeze, with all copies targeting himself. He mills 18 cards. He escapes Dockside Extortionist. It enters, and Mike creates 3 treasures. He escapes Brain Freeze, with all copies targeting himself, milling 24. Mike escapes Diabolic Intent, sacrificing Crom as an additional cost, fetching up a card into his hand. He escapes Lion's Eye Diamond. He cracks it, discards his hand, and adds 3 blue. He escapes LED again, then cracks it for 3 more blue. He escapes Narset, Parter of Veils. He casts Thassa's Oracle. In response, Nabil cracks Waterlog Grove, drawing a card. Oracle enters, and with a devotion of 5 and 5 left in his library, Mike wins the game. TK won the Up-Down Challenge and gets to start us off. TK draws a card for turn and plays a Yavimaya Coast. He taps it to help cast an Elvish Mystic. TK passes. Matt draws and casts a Chromox, imprinting Rite of Flame. He plays a Misty Rainforest for turn. He cracks it, pays a life, and fetches up an Underground Sea onto the battlefield. He casts his commander, Bjorna, Nightfall Alchemist. He casts Mox Amber. Matt passes. Chris draws and plays a City of Traders. He casts Talisman of Dominance. He taps his talisman to cast Mystic Remora. Chris ends his turn. Sean draws and plays a Windswept Teeth. He cracks it, pays a life, and fetches up a Tropical Island onto the battlefield. Sean passes the turn. TK draws and plays a Scalding Tarn. He cracks it, pays a life, and fetches up a Tropical Island onto the battlefield. He taps Yavimaya Coast to help cast his commander, Kinnan, Bonder Prodigy. He casts Talisman of Curiosity. Remora triggers and Chris draws. TK ships the turn. Matt draws and plays a Polluted Delta. He cracks it, pays a life, and fetches up a Scrubland onto the battlefield. He casts his other commander, Warnog, Rider's Chaplain. Warnog enters, Chris and Sean create a clue, TK loses a life, and Matt creates 3 clues. Matt casts Wishclaw Talisman. Remora triggers and Chris draws. Matt gives the turn to Chris. During his upkeep, Chris pays to keep his Remora. He draws and casts Mox Opal. He casts his commander, Francisco, Foul Marauder. Chris passes. Sean draws and plays a Wooded Foothills. He cracks it, pays a life, and fetches up a Volcanic Island onto the battlefield. He casts his commander, Thrasios, Triton Hero. Sean ends his turn. At the end of Sean's turn, Matt activates Bjorna, sacrificing a clue, killing Elvish Mystic. TK draws and plays a Waterlogged Grove. He taps it to help cast Tezzeret the Seeker. He activates Tezzeret's second ability where X equals 3. The table braces for impact as TK fetches up a Trinisphere onto the battlefield. The table did not see that coming as TK passes the turn. Matt draws and moves to combat. He attacks Tezzeret with Warnog. Tezzeret dies, and in his second main phase, Matt pays 3 through Trinisphere to cast an Arcane Signet. Remora triggers and Chris draws. Matt passes to Chris. During his upkeep, Chris pays to keep his Remora. He draws and plays a Bloodstained Mire. City of Traders triggers and Chris sacrifices it. Chris passes the turn. Sean draws and plays a Taiga. He ends his turn. TK draws and plays an island. He taps Waterlogged Grove to help cast a Consecrated Sphinx. In response, Chris cracks Bloodstained Mire, pays a life, and fetches up an Underground Sea onto the battlefield. He casts Force of Will, paying a life, exiling a blue card, and paying 3 for Trinisphere, countering Sphinx. The table cheers from Chris's heroic save, and TK passes the turn. At the end of TK's turn, Matt sacrifices a clue and draws a card. Matt draws and plays a Badlands. He passes. During his upkeep, Chris pays to keep his Remora. He draws and plays a Volcanic Island. He passes the turn. At the end of Chris's turn, Sean sacrifices a clue and draws a card. Sean draws and plays a Bloodstained Mire. He cracks it, pays a life, and fetches up a Steam Fence onto the battlefield untapped, paying 2 life. Sean ships the turn. TK draws and plays a Manamo, School at Water's Edge. TK passes. At the end of TK's turn, Matt sacrifices a clue and draws a card. Matt draws and plays an Arid Mesa. He cracks it, pays a life, and fetches up a Volcanic Island onto the battlefield. He activates his Wishclaw Talisman. He holds priority and activates Bjorna, sacrificing Wishclaw, pinging Francisco, killing it. He then fetches up a card into his hand. He casts Thassa's Oracle. In response, Sean pays 3 to cast Red Elemental Blast. Remora triggers and Chris draws. Oracle is countered and Matt follows up by casting Imperial Seal and Chris draws again. Matt fetches up a card onto the top of his library and loses 2 life. Matt ships the turn. During his upkeep, Chris pays to keep his Remora. He draws and plays a Gemstone Caverns. Chris ends his turn. At the end of Chris's turn, TK taps Waterlogged Grove to activate Kinnan. He looks at the top 5, failing to find. The turn moves to Sean. Sean draws, takes no actions, and passes. TK draws and plays a Gaia's Cradle. He ships the turn. Matt draws and casts Savine's Reclamation, targeting Thassa's Oracle in his graveyard. Remora triggers and Chris draws. In response, TK taps Waterlogged Grove to activate Kinnan, looking at the top 5, putting Spellskite onto the battlefield. In response, Sean casts Flame of Anor, choosing 2 modes targeting Trinisphere. Remora triggers and Chris draws again. Trinisphere is destroyed and Sean draws 2 cards. Savine's resolves, and with the trigger on the stack, Matt casts Demonic Consultation. Remora triggers and Chris draws a card. Console resolves, Matt names Island Fish Jasconius and exiles his library. Oracle's trigger resolves, and Matt wins the game. Charles had the best mermaid makeover and gets to start us off. Charles draws a card for turn and plays a Snow-Covered Plains. He passes. Ashani draws a card for turn and plays a Command Tower. He casts a Rite of Flame, adding 2 red. He casts Mana Vault. He casts Wheel of Misfortune. In response, Charles casts Enlightened Tutor. He fetches up a Deafening Silence onto the top of his library. Then Wheel resolves. Everyone chooses a number, with Charles and Alex choosing 0, Peter choosing 3, and Ashani choosing 10. Then Ashani takes 10, and then Peter and Ashani discard their hand and draw 7. With nothing else, Ashani ends his turn. Peter draws and plays a Swamp. He casts a Jeweled Lotus. He pays 6 life to help cast his commander, Kirik, son of Yawgmoth. He pays 2 life through Kirik to cast Blood Celebrant. Kirik triggers and gets a +1/+1 counter. He activates Blood Celebrant 3 times, paying 9 life through Kirik, adding 3 black. He pays 4 life through Kirik to cast Final Parting. Kirik triggers and gets a +1/+1 counter. Then Peter fetches up a Grey Merchant of Asphodel into his graveyard and Chainer Dimension Master into his hand. He activates Blood Celebrant 3 times, paying 9 life, adding 3 black. He pays 4 more life to help cast Dark Petition. Kirik gets a counter, and then he fetches up a card into his hand, adding 3 black. He pays 2 life through Kirik to cast Cabal Ritual with Threshold, adding 5 black. He casts Animate Dead, targeting Grey Merchant in his graveyard. Kirik gets a counter, then Grey Merchant enters the battlefield. Grey Merchant triggers with each opponent losing 7 and Peter gaining 21. He pays 2 life to help cast Demonic Tutor. Kirik gets a counter, and then he fetches up a card into his hand. He activates Blood Celebrant 3 times, paying 9 life, adding 3 black. He pays 4 life to help cast CEDH, Undead Vizier. Kirik gets a counter, and then CEDH enters. Peter exploits CEDH, sacrificing Grey Merchant and fetching up a card into his hand. He activates Blood Celebrant, paying 3 life, adding a black. He pays 2 more life to cast Dance of the Dead, targeting Grey Merchant. Kirik gets a counter, then Grey Merchant enters the battlefield. Merchant triggers, and each opponent loses 9, and Peter gains 27. He activates Blood Celebrant 2 times, paying 6 life, adding 2 black. He pays 4 more life to cast Flesh Writher, and Kirik gets a counter. He activates Blood Celebrant 2 times, paying 6 life, adding 2 black. He pays 2 more life to cast Yawgmoth's Will, and Kirik gets a counter. He activates Blood Celebrant, paying 3 life, adding a black. He pays 2 more to cast Demonic Tutor from his graveyard. Kirik gets a counter, and then Peter fetches up a card into his hand. He activates Blood Celebrant twice, paying 6 life, adding 2 black. He pays 2 more to cast Saw in Half, targeting Grey Merchant. Kirik gets a counter, then Saw in Half resolves. Grey Merchant is destroyed, and Peter creates 2 copies. Each enter with a devotion of 12, Peter gains 48, each opponent loses 24, dies, and Peter wins the game. Alex draws and starts off by casting Chrome Mox, imprinting Tishana, Voice of Thunder. He plays a Rejuvenating Springs for turn. He casts an Elvish Mystic. Alex passes. Peter draws and plays a Swamp. He casts a Soul Ring. He casts a Lotus Petal. Peter ends his turn. Ashani draws and plays a Luxury Suite. He casts Imperial Seal. He fetches up a card onto the top of his library and loses 2 life. Ashani ships the turn to Charles. Charles draws and plays a Snow-Covered Plains. He casts Grafdigger's Cage, much to the dismay of most of the table. Charles gives the turn to Alex. Alex draws and casts a Lotus Petal. He casts Rhystic Study. Alex ends his turn. Peter draws and plays a Homeward Path. He pays 6 life to help cast his commander, Kirik, son of Yawgmoth. Rhystic triggers, and Alex draws. Peter pays 2 life through Kirik to cast Blood Pet. Kirik and Rhystic trigger, Alex draws, and Kirik gets a counter. Finished up, Peter passes. Ashani draws, plays an Ancient Tomb, and passes. Charles draws and casts Land Tax. Rhystic triggers, and Alex draws. Charles passes. Alex draws and plays a Tropical Island. He casts his commander, Kinnan, Bonder Prodigy. He casts Selvala, Heart of the Wilds. Alex ends his turn. Peter draws and starts off by paying 6 life through Kirik to cast Beseech the Queen, paying the Rhystic Tax. Kirik gets a counter, and then Peter fetches up a Demonic Tutor into his hand. He pays 2 life to help cast Demonic Tutor, paying the Rhystic Tax. Kirik gets a counter, and then Peter fetches up a card into his hand. He pays 2 life to cast Dark Ritual. Kirik gets a counter, and then Peter pays for Rhystic. Then Peter adds 3 black. Peter pays 6 life to help cast Peer into the Abyss, paying the Rhystic Tax, and Kirik gets a counter. In response, Ashani casts Dark Ritual. Rhystic triggers, and Alex draws. Then Ashani adds 3 black. He casts Ad Nauseam. Ad Naus resolves, and Ashani reveals a Misty Rainforest, Otawara Soaring City, Mana Vault, Jataxian Probe, Wheel of Misfortune, Mana Confluence, Dispel, Badlands, Mystic Remora, Windfall, Talisman of Creativity, Toxic Deluge, Brain Freeze, Chrome Mox, Snap, Underground Sea, Rhystic Study, Ranger Captain of Eos, Dockside Extortionist, Dramatic Reversal, Verdant Catacombs, Plateau, Silence, Chain of Vapor, Red Elemental Blast, Jeweled Lotus, and a Dothy Voidwalker, deciding to stop there. Unfortunately, he did not find any free interaction, and Peer resolves. Peter draws half of his library and loses half of his life, rounded up. Peter plays a City of Traders for turn. He casts a Mana Vault. He casts an Aetherflux Reservoir. He casts Mox Amber. Alex draws through Rhystic, and Peter gains 7 life through Aetherflux. Peter pays 2 life to cast Reign of Filth. Kirik, Aetherflux, and Rhystic all trigger. Alex draws through Rhystic, Peter gains 8 life, and then Kirik gets a counter. In response, Alex casts Fierce Guardianship for its alternate cost, countering Reign of Filth. Peter pays 2 life to cast Blood Celebrant. Alex draws, Kirik gets a counter, and Peter gains 9 life. He activates Blood Celebrant 4 times, paying 12 life, adding 4 black. He pays 4 more life to help cast Professor Onyx. Kirik, Aetherflux, and Rhystic all trigger. Peter pays 3 life through Blood Celebrant to pay for Rhystic. Peter gains 10 life through Aetherflux, and then Kirik gets a counter. Then Onyx resolves. Peter activates Blood Celebrant, paying 3 life, adding a black. He casts Chain of Smog, targeting himself. Kirik, Aetherflux, Professor Onyx, and Rhystic all trigger. Peter pays 3 life through Blood Celebrant to pay for Rhystic. Each opponent loses 2 and Peter gains 2 through Onyx. Peter gains 11 life through Aetherflux, then Kirik gets a counter. With no answers, Chain of Smog resolves. Peter discards 2 cards and copies the chain, targeting himself. Each time he copies the chain, Professor Onyx triggers and each opponent loses 2 life. He does this over and over until the table is dead, and Peter wins the game. Liliana had the most on-theme playmat and gets to start us off. But Alex has a pre-game action and puts Gemstone Caverns onto the battlefield, exiling Reclamation Sage. Liliana draws a card for turn and plays a Swamp. She casts Dark Ritual, adding 3 black. She casts Night's Whisper, drawing 2 cards and losing 2 life. She casts a Blood Pet and passes the turn. Skylar draws and plays a City of Brass. They tap it to cast a Soul Ring. They cast Mox Opal. They cast a Lotus Petal. They cast Ponder. They look at the top 3, don't like what they see, shuffle, and draw. They cast a Jeweled Lotus. They cast her commander, Crom, Ludovic's Opus. They move to Crombat and attack Liliana with Crom. Liliana takes it, and Skylar passes the turn. Alex draws and plays a Verdant Catacombs. He cracks it, pays a life, and fetches up a tropical island onto the battlefield. He casts a Thought Vessel and gives the turn to Sage. Sage draws and casts a Lion's Eye Diamond. They sack their Lion's Eye Diamond, discard their hand, and cast their commander, Bergi, God of Storytelling. Crom triggers and Skylar draws. All in and all through, Sage passes. Liliana draws and taps a Swamp for black, then plays Lake of the Dead, sacrificing her Swamp. She casts Sign in Blood, drawing 2 cards and losing 2 life. Liliana ends her turn. Skylar draws and plays a Misty Rainforest. They crack it, pay a life, and fetch up a Volcanic Island onto the battlefield. They cast a Mana Crypt. They cast their commander, Tevesh Zot, Doom of Fools. They activate Tevesh's first ability, creating 2 Thralls. They move to combat and attack Liliana with Crom. Liliana takes it, and Skylar ships the turn to Alex. Alex draws and plays a Forest. He casts his commander, Kinnan, Bonder Prodigy. Alex gives the turn to Sage. Sage draws and moves to combat. They attack Tevesh with Bergi. Skylar blocks with a Thrall, and Sage passes the turn. Liliana draws, takes no actions, and passes. At the end of Liliana's turn, Skylar taps their City of Brass to cast Vampiric Tutor. They fetch up a card onto the top of their library and lose 2 life. The turn moves to Skylar. During their upkeep, Skylar loses their Mana Crypt roll and takes 3 damage. They draw and tap their City of Brass to cast Displacer Kitten. They activate Tevesh's first ability. In response, Liliana casts Victim of Night, targeting Displacer Kitten. In response, Skylar casts Cut Down, targeting Alex's Kinnan. Kitten triggers, targeting itself. Kitten's ability resolves, flickering itself. Then Cut Down resolves, Kinnan is destroyed, and then Victim of Night fizzles. Then Tevesh's ability resolves, and Skylar creates 2 Thralls. Unfortunately thwarted though, Skylar has to pass. Alex draws and casts Phyrexian Revoker. It enters, and Alex names Tevesh Zot, much to the dismay of Skylar. With nothing else, Alex passes to Sage. Sage draws and moves to combat. They attack Tevesh with Bergi. Tevesh takes it, and Sage gives the turn to Liliana. Liliana draws, takes no actions, and passes. During their upkeep, Skylar wins their Mana Crypt roll. They draw and cast Imperial Seal. Kitten triggers, flickering Mox Opal. Then Skylar fetches up a card onto the top of their library and lose 2 life. They cast Wheel of Fortune. Kitten triggers, targeting Mox Opal. In response, Sage casts Deflecting Swat for its alternate cost, targeting Kitten's trigger. Bergi triggers, adding a red. Then Swat resolves, redirecting the Kitten trigger to one of Skylar's Thralls. Then Kitten's trigger resolves, flickering a Thrall, removing it entirely. Then Wheel resolves, and everyone discards their hand and draws 7. Skylar plays an Exotic Orchard for turn. They cast Deadly Rollick for its alternate cost, targeting Phyrexian Revoker. Kitten triggers, flickering Mox Opal. Then Phyrexian Revoker is exiled. Next, Skylar activates Tevesh's second ability, sacrificing a Thrall, drawing 2 cards. They cast Mox Diamond. Kitten triggers, flickering Tevesh Zot. Then Mox Diamond resolves, and Skylar discards Command Tower. They activate Tevesh's first ability, since it is now a new instance of Tevesh, creating 2 Thralls. They cast Entomb. Kitten triggers and flickers Tevesh. Then Entomb resolves, and Skylar fetches up a Brain Freeze into their graveyard. They cast Underworld Breach. Kitten triggers, targeting Mox Opal. In response, Alex evokes Endurance, exiling a green card. In response, to save their turn, Skylar casts Swansong on their own Underworld Breach. Kitten triggers, flickering Soul Ring. In response, Sage casts Pyroblast, targeting Swansong. Bergi triggers and adds a red. Then Pyroblast counters Swansong. With Endurance still in the stack, Skylar casts Ad Nauseam. Kitten triggers, flickering Soul Ring. Then Ad Naus resolves, and Skylar reveals a Spell Pierce, Steam Vents, Force of Will, Rhystic Study, Gemstone Caverns, Wooded Foothills, Mental Misstep, Fatal Push, Morphic Pool, Brainstorm, Deflecting Swat, Unsubstantiate, Demonic Tutor, Mindbreak Trap, Rite of Flame, and Athas's Oracle, deciding to stop there. Then Endurance resolves, triggers, and targets Skylar. In response, Skylar casts Deflecting Swat for its alternate cost, targeting Endurance's ability. Kitten triggers, flickering Mox Opal. Then Swat resolves, redirecting the ability to Liliana. Then the ability resolves, and Liliana puts her graveyard onto the bottom of her library in a random order. Next, Skylar casts Rite of Flame. Kitten triggers, flickering Tevesh. Then Skylar adds 2 red. They escape Wheel of Fortune. Kitten flickers Soul Ring, then everyone discards their hand and draws 7. Skylar activates Tevesh's second ability, sacrificing a Thrall, drawing 2 cards. They cast Mana Vault. Kitten triggers, flickering Mox Opal. They cast Felwar Stone, and Kitten flickers Mana Vault. They escape Brain Freeze with all copies targeting themselves. Kitten triggers, flickering Mox Opal. Then they mill the rest of their library. They escape Chrome Mox, imprinting Stern Dismissal. They escape Thassa's Oracle. Oracle enters, and Skylar wins the game. But Alex has a pre-game action and puts Gemstone Caverns onto the battlefield, exiling Nature's Claim. Skylar draws and plays a Blood Crypt into play untapped, paying 2 life. They cast a Soul Ring and pass the turn. Alex draws and plays an Island. He also casts a Soul Ring. He casts a Priest of Titania. Alex ends his turn. Sage draws and plays a Mountain. They cast Flamekin Harbinger. It enters and Sage searches their library for a Grinning Ignis, putting it on top. They exile Simian Spirit Guide from their hand, adding a red. They cast Infernal Plunge, sacrificing Flamekin, adding 3 red. They cast their commander, Bergi, God of Storytelling. They cast Mox Amber. Bergi triggers, adding a red. They cast Sensei's Divining Top, adding a red through Bergi. They activate Sensei's Top, looking at and rearranging the top 3. All through, and with an explosive turn 1, Sage passes. Liliana draws and plays a City of Traders. She casts a Soul Ring. She casts a Sensei's Divining Top. Liliana passes. Skylar draws and plays a Volcanic Island. They cast Rite of Flame, adding 2 red. They cast their commander, Crom, Ludovic's Opus. They move to combat and attack Sage with Crom. Sage takes it, and Skylar ends their turn. Alex draws and starts off by casting his commander, Kinnan, Bonder Prodigy. He casts Bloom Tender. Crom triggers, and Skylar draws. He casts Sylvan Library. Alex gives the turn to Sage. At the end of Alex's turn, Liliana activates Sensei's Top, rearranging the top 3. Then Liliana pays 4 life to cast Dismember, targeting Bergi. In response, Sage activates Sensei's Top, rearranging the top 3. They activate Top, drawing a card and putting Top on top. They cast Deflecting Swat for its alternate cost, targeting Dismember. With no responses, Swat resolves, redirecting Dismember to Kinnan. Kinnan dies, and the turn moves to Sage. Sage draws and casts Sensei's Divining Top. Bergi triggers and adds a red. Sage activates Top, rearranging the top 3. They move to combat, attacking Alex with Bergi. Alex takes it, and Sage ships the turn to Liliana. Liliana draws and floats mana from City of Traders. She plays a Swamp, sacrificing City of Traders. She pays 6 life to cast her commander, Kirik, son of Yawgmoth. She casts Mox Amber. Crom triggers, and Skylar draws. Liliana passes. Skylar draws and plays a Bloodstained Mire. They crack it, pay life, and fetch up an Underground Sea onto the battlefield. They cast Dockside Extortionist. Dockside enters, and Skylar creates 7 treasures. They cast Desperate Ritual, adding 3 red. They cast Vampiric Tutor. They fetch up a card onto the top of their library and lose 2 life. They cast Brainstorm, drawing 3 and putting 2 back on top. They cast Displacer Kitten. They cast Geist Wave, targeting their Soul Ring. Kitten triggers, targeting Dockside. In response, Liliana pays 4 life to cast Snuff Out, targeting Dockside. Kirik triggers and gets a +1/+1 counter. In response, Skylar casts Brain Freeze with all copies targeting themselves. Kitten triggers, targeting Dockside. In response, Liliana activates Sensei's Top, looking for an answer. She looks at and rearranges the top 3. Then she activates Top, drawing a card and putting Top on top. Then, with no other answers, Kitten's ability resolves. Dockside flickers, creating 6 treasures. Then Brain Freeze mills some of Skylar's library. Then Snuff Out and the first Kitten trigger fizzles. Then Geist Wave resolves, Soul Ring bounces, and Skylar draws a card. Skylar recasts Soul Ring. Kitten triggers, flickering Dockside, creating 6 more treasures. They cast Talisman of Dominance, and Kitten flickers Dockside again. They cast their commander, Tevesh Zot, Doom of Fools, flickering Dockside through Kitten. They activate Tevesh's second ability, sacrificing Crom, drawing 3 cards. They cast Underworld Breach. Kitten triggers, flickering Tevesh Zot. Skylar presents a loop of escaping Brain Freeze, triggering Kitten, flickering Dockside, creating treasures, and milling their entire library. They escape Thassa's Oracle. Oracle enters, and Skylar wins the game. Sean won the Tortilla Challenge and gets to start us off. Sean draws a card for turn and plays a Hallowed Fountain, into play untapped, paying 2 life. Sean passes. Ashani draws and plays a Tundra. He casts an Esper Sentinel. In response, Sean casts Enlightened Tutor. He fetches up a Mana Crypt onto the top of his library. Esper Sentinel resolves, and Ashani passes. Alex draws and plays a Treasure Vault. He casts a Mox Opal. Esper triggers, and Alex pays. He casts a Chrome Mox, imprinting Green Sun Zenith. He casts his commander, Kinnan, Bonder Prodigy. Alex ends his turn. Anthony draws and plays a Bloodstained Mire. He cracks it, pays a life, and fetches up a Badlands onto the battlefield. He casts Imperial Seal. Esper triggers, and Ashani draws. Then Anthony fetches up a card onto the top of his library and loses 2 life. Anthony passes to Sean. Sean draws and plays a Rejuvenating Springs. He casts a Mystic Remora. Esper triggers, and Ashani draws. Sean casts a Mana Crypt and gives the turn to Ashani. During his upkeep, Ashani casts Enlightened Tutor. Remora triggers, and Sean draws. Then Ashani fetches up a Grafdigger's Cage onto the top of his library. He draws and plays a Manamo, School at Water's Edge as his land for turn. He casts a Grafdigger's Cage, and Sean draws from Remora. Alex sighs, and Ashani ends his turn. Alex draws and plays a Forest. He casts Lurking Predators. Esper and Remora trigger, and Ashani and Sean draw. Alex moves to combat and attacks Anthony with Kinnan. Anthony takes it, and Alex ships the turn. Anthony draws and casts a Mana Crypt. Esper and Remora trigger, and Sean and Ashani draw. Lurking Predators triggers, and Alex reveals a Cyclonic Rift, leaving it on top. He casts a Dockside Extortionist. It enters, and Anthony creates 8 treasures. He casts his commander, Timna the Weaver. He casts Goblin Engineer. It enters and Anthony fetches up a Relic of Legends into his graveyard. He casts his other commander, Dargo the Shipwrecker. All finished up, and with a crazy turn 2 complete, Anthony passes. During his upkeep, Sean pays to keep his Remora. Also in his upkeep, he wins his Mana Crypt roll. He draws and plays a Volcanic Island. He casts Llanowar Elves and ends his turn. Ashani draws and plays a Sea Gate Reborn into play untapped, paying 3 life. He casts a Grim Monolith. Remora triggers and Sean draws. Ashani passes. Alex draws and plays an island. He casts an overloaded Cyclonic Rift. Esper and Remora trigger and both players draw. In response, Ashani casts Force of Negation for its alternate cost, exiling a blue card targeting Rift. Lurking Predators triggers, Alex reveals a Nyx Blue Ancient, but cannot put it onto the battlefield due to Grafdigger's Cage, so he leaves it on top. In response, Alex casts Force of Will, paying a life and exiling a blue card targeting Force of Negation. Remora triggers and Sean draws. In response, Sean casts Mana Drain targeting Force of Will. Force of Will is countered and Cyclonic Rift is countered and exiled. With nothing else and his turn thwarted, Alex ships the turn to Anthony. During his upkeep, Anthony loses his Mana Crypt roll and takes 3 damage. He draws and moves to combat. He attacks Sean with Dockside, Ashani with Tymna, and Alex with Dargo. Everyone takes it, and Anthony gains 2 life. In his second main phase, Anthony pays 3 life and draws 3 cards through Tymna. He plays an Ancient Tomb for turn. He activates Goblin Engineer, sacrificing a treasure, returning Relic of Legends to the battlefield. He casts Florian, Voldarian Scion. Anthony passes. During his upkeep, Sean loses his Mana Crypt roll and takes 3 damage. He also lets his Remora die. He draws, and in his first main phase, he adds 5 colorless through Mana Drain. He casts Eladamri's Call, paying the Esper tax. Lurking Predators triggers, and Alex reveals Nyx Blue Ancient, putting it on bottom. In response to Eladamri's Call, Ashani casts Silence. Lurking Predators triggers, and Alex reveals a Talisman of Curiosity, putting it on bottom. In response, Sean casts an Offer You Can't Refuse, targeting Silence. Predators triggers, and Alex reveals a Thorn Mammoth, putting it on bottom. Offer counters Silence, and Ashani creates 2 treasures. With Eladamri's Call still on the stack, Ashani hard casts Fierce Guardianship. Predators triggers, and Alex reveals an island, putting it on bottom. Then Guardianship counters Eladamri's Call. Next, Sean plays a Sea of Clouds for turn. He casts Aven Mind Sensor. Predators triggers, and Alex reveals Lawan, Cephalid Empress, putting it on bottom. Mind Sensor resolves, and before Sean passes, Ashani flashes in an Archivist of Ogma. Predators triggers, and Alex reveals a Tropical Island, putting it on bottom. Sean passes the turn. Ashani draws and casts a Mana Crypt. Alex reveals Pact of Negation onto the bottom through Predators. Ashani casts Torpor Orb, and Alex reveals Exotic Orchard onto the bottom through Predators. Ashani gives the turn to Alex. Alex draws, takes no actions, and passes. During his upkeep, Anthony wins his Mana Crypt roll. He draws and moves to combat. He attacks Sean with Dargo and Alex with Florian. Both take it, and in his second main phase, Tymna and Florian trigger. Anthony looks at the top 10 cards of his library, exiling Altar of Dementia. He then pays 2 life and draws 2 cards through Tymna. He casts Altar of Dementia from exile through Florian, and Alex reveals Wooded Foothills onto the bottom through Predators. Anthony activates Altar of Dementia, sacrificing Dargo, milling Alex for 7. He sacrifices Dockside to Altar, milling Sean for 1. He sacrifices Goblin Engineer to Altar, milling Ashani for 1. He recasts Dargo, reduced through his sacrificed creatures. Alex reveals Allosaurus Shepherd through Predators, and Dargo resolves. Anthony activates Relic of Legends, tapping Dargo, adding a red. Anthony presents a loop of sacrificing Dargo to Altar, milling opponents, recasting it using his floating mana, then tapping Dargo through Relic for additional mana. He does this over and over until the entire table has milled their entire library. Anthony passes. One by one, each opponent attempts to draw from an empty library, loses, and Anthony wins the game. Ashani draws and plays an Arid Mesa. He cracks it, pays a life, and fetches up a Tundra onto the battlefield. He casts Sensei's Divining Top and passes the turn. Alex draws and plays an island. He casts Lotus Petal. He cracks his petal to help cast his commander, Kinnan, Bonder Prodigy. Alex passes. Anthony draws and plays a Verdant Catacombs. He cracks it, pays a life, and fetches up a Bayou onto the battlefield. He casts a Mana Crypt. He casts a Jeweled Lotus. He cracks his Lotus to help cast his commander, Tevish Zot, Doom of Fools. He activates Tevish's first ability, creating 2 Thralls. Anthony gives the turn to Sean. Sean draws and plays a Taiga. He casts a Mana Crypt. Sean passes. Ashani draws, plays a City of Brass, and passes. Alex draws and plays an island. He casts a Felwar Stone. He moves to combat and attacks Tevish with Kinnan. Tevish takes it, and Alex ends his turn. During his upkeep, Anthony wins his Mana Crypt roll. He draws and activates Tevish's second ability, sacrificing a Thrall, drawing 2 cards. He plays a Command Tower for turn. He casts his other commander, Helana, Kessig Ranger. Anthony ships the turn to Sean. During his upkeep, Sean wins his Mana Crypt roll. He draws and plays an Exotic Orchard. Sean passes. At the end of Sean's turn, Ashani flashes in an Archivist of Ogma. In response, Alex casts Worldly Tutor, fetching up a Phyrexian Metamorph onto the top of his library. Archivist resolves, and the turn moves to Ashani. Ashani draws and plays a Hallowed Fountain into play untapped, paying 2 life. He casts Azoria's Signet. He taps its City of Brass to help cast Cursed Totem. Ashani ships the turn to Alex. Alex draws and casts Phyrexian Metamorph. It enters as a copy of Mana Crypt. Alex passes. During his upkeep, Anthony loses his Mana Crypt roll and takes 3 damage. He draws and activates Tevish's second ability, sacrificing a Thrall, drawing 2 cards. He plays a Mana Confluence for turn. He casts Finehorn Elves. He casts Deathrite Shaman. Anthony gives the turn to Sean. During his upkeep, Sean wins his Mana Crypt roll. He draws and plays a Tropical Island. He casts his commander, Bruised Taro, Boorish Herder. Sean passes the turn. Ashani draws and plays a Mana Confluence. He casts his commander, Shorkai, Genesis Engine. Ashani ends his turn. During his upkeep, Alex wins his Mana Crypt flip. He draws and plays a Gemstone Caverns. He casts Consecrated Sphinx. In response, Ashani taps his Mana Confluence to activate Sensei's top, looking at and rearranging the top 3. He then taps his City of Brass to activate Shorkai, drawing 2, discarding 1, and creating a pilot. Then Consecrated Sphinx resolves. Alex passes to Anthony. During his upkeep, Anthony loses his Mana Crypt trigger and takes 3 damage. During his draw step, Alex draws 2 through Consecrated Sphinx. Anthony plays an Overgrown Tomb into play untapped, paying 2 life. He casts Final Parting. He fetches up a card into his hand and an Exotic Orchard into his graveyard. Archivist of Ogma triggers and Ashani draws a card and gains a life. Consecrated Sphinx triggers and Alex draws 2. Anthony activates Tevish's first ability, creating 2 Thralls. Anthony gives the turn to Sean. During his upkeep, Sean wins his Mana Crypt trigger. During his draw step, Alex draws 2 through Sphinx. Sean plays a Volcanic Island for turn. He moves to combat and attacks Tevish with Bruised Taro. Bruise triggers, giving itself double strike and lifelink until the end of turn. Anthony blocks with a Thrall and Sean gains 3 life. With nothing else, Sean passes the turn. During Ashani's draw step, Alex draws 2 through Consphinx. In his main phase, Ashani casts Grand Abolisher. He casts Mox Diamond, discarding a Plains. He casts Imposter Mech. It enters as a copy of Consecrated Sphinx. He activates Shorkai, drawing 2, discarding 1, and creating a pilot. Alex's Consecrated Sphinx triggers, and Alex, knowing what happened last time 2 Sphinxes were on the battlefield, declines to draw. Ashani passes to Alex. During his upkeep, Alex wins his Mana Crypt flip. During his draw step, Ashani draws 2 through Consphinx. In his main phase, Alex plays a Yavimaya Coast. He casts Phantasmal Image. In response, Ashani casts March of Swirling Mist, exiling a blue card, targeting Grand Abolisher and Consecrated Sphinx. In response, Alex casts Whir of Invention, where X equals 3. He fetches up a Basalt Monolith onto the battlefield. Archivist triggers, and in response, Alex taps Basalt for 4 colorless through Kinnan, then uses 3 to untap Basalt. He repeats this loop, generating infinite colorless mana. Then the Archivist trigger resolves, and Ashani gains a life and draws a card. Consecrated Sphinx triggers, and Alex draws 2. Then March resolves, and the 2 creatures phase out. Then Phantasmal Image resolves and enters as a copy of Halana, Kessig Ranger. Next, Alex casts Lodestone Golem. He casts Mirage Mirror. In response, Sean casts Lightning Bolt, targeting Lodestone Golem. In response, Alex casts Pact of Negation, countering Bolt. Then Mirror resolves. Alex uses his infinite colorless mana to activate Mirage Mirror, targeting Tropical Island. He holds priority and activates Mirror, targeting Basalt Monolith. He does this over and over, adding hundreds of thousands of these onto the stack. Each time Mirror becomes Tropical Island, he taps it to add either blue or green. Each time Mirror becomes Basalt Monolith, he uses its colorless mana to untap Basalt. Using this loop, he generates infinite green and blue. Alex casts Hullbreaker Horror. He casts Nyx Bloom Ancient. Hullbreaker triggers, bouncing Cursed Totem. He activates Kinnan over and over until he puts Thrasios, Triton Hero, onto the battlefield. He activates Kinnan over and over again until he puts Thassa's Oracle onto the battlefield. Oracle enters, and with a trigger on the stack, Alex activates Thrasios over and over, drawing his entire deck. Oracle's trigger resolves, and Alex wins the game. Dante was voted the most likely to succeed in his high school yearbook and gets to start us off. Dante draws for turn and plays a Mana Confluence. He passes to Mike. Mike draws and plays a Forest. He casts a Mox Opal. He casts a Mana Vault. Mike attempts to put a damper on this game and casts Damping Sphere. In response, Zach casts Force of Will, paying a life, exiling a blue card, countering Damping Sphere. With nothing else, Mike ships the turn. Sean draws and plays a Misty Rainforest. He cracks it, pays a life, and fetches up a Volcanic Island onto the battlefield. He casts a Jeweled Lotus. He sacrifices it to help cast his commander, Myra the Magnificent. He ends his turn. Zach draws and plays an Ancient Tomb. He taps it to help cast an Arcane Signet. He casts a Lotus Petal. He then sacrifices it to help cast his commander, Thrasios, Triton Hero. He passes the turn. At the end of Zach's turn, Dante taps his Mana Confluence to help cast Enlightened Tutor, fetching up a Mana Crypt onto the top of his library. Dante draws and plays a Sunbaked Canyon. He casts a Mana Crypt. He taps Mana Confluence to help cast his commander, Malcolm, Keen-Eyed Navigator. He gives the turn to Mike. Mike draws and casts a Finehorn Elves. He plays a Seagate Reborn into play tapped. Mike passes the turn. Sean draws and plays a Shivan Reef. He casts a Mox Diamond, discarding an island. He casts Ride of Flame, adding 2 red. Myra triggers and Sean opens an attraction, putting Storybook Ride onto the battlefield. He casts Galazeth Prismari. Galazeth enters and Sean creates a treasure. He moves to combat and attacks Dante with Myra. Dante takes it and Sean ships the turn to Zach. Zach draws and plays a command tower. He casts his commander, Rograk, son of Roga. He taps his Ancient Tomb to help cast Windfall. In response, Dante casts Fierce Guardianship for its alternate cost, countering Windfall. All through, Zach ends his turn. During his upkeep, Dante wins his Mana Crypt roll. He draws and plays a Fiery Islet. He taps Sunbaked Canyon and Fiery Islet to help cast Glenhorn Buccaneer. Dante moves to combat and attacks Mike with both Malcolm and Glenhorn. Mike blocks with Finehorn Elves and takes the rest. Malcolm triggers and Dante creates a treasure. Dante then presents a loop of activating Glenhorn, pinging his opponents, drawing and discarding, and creating treasures through Malcolm. He does this until the table is dead, and Dante wins the game. Mike draws and plays the Yavimaya Coast. He taps it to help cast Moonsnare Prototype. He casts a Lotus Petal and passes the turn to Sean. Sean draws and plays a Steam Vents into play untapped, paying 2 life. He casts a Soul Ring. He casts an Arcane Signet. He casts a Jeweled Lotus. He sacrifices Lotus to help cast his commander, Myra the Magnificent. Off to a magnificent start, Sean ships the turn to Zach. Zach draws and plays a Mana Confluence. He casts his commander, Rograk, son of Roga. He casts a Mana Crypt. He taps his Mana Confluence to help cast Proteus Staff. The table groans, knowing that this threat needs to be answered right away. So in response, Sean casts Force of Negation, exiling a blue card, targeting Proteus Staff. Myra triggers, Sean opens an attraction, putting Drop Tower onto the battlefield. Then Force resolves, countering and exiling Proteus Staff. Crisis averted, Zach ends his turn. Dante draws and plays a Polluted Delta. He cracks it, pays a life, and fetches up a Volcanic Island onto the battlefield. He casts a Soul Ring. Dante gives the turn to Mike. Mike draws and plays a Waterlogged Grove. He taps his Yavimaya Coast and Waterlogged Grove to help cast his commander, Kinnan, Bonder Prodigy. He casts Grim Monolith. He sacrifices Lotus Petal to help cast Green Sun Zenith, where X equals 5. He fetches up a Seedborn Muse onto the battlefield, shuffling Green Suns back into his library. Everyone gets worried, and Mike passes the turn. Mike untaps with Sean through Seedborn. Sean draws, and in his first main phase, he rolls for his attractions and loses. He casts Ponder. Myra triggers, Sean opens an attraction, putting Hall of Mirrors onto the battlefield. Then Ponder resolves, he looks at the top 3, rearranges, and draws. He casts a Lotus Petal. He casts Windfall. Myra triggers, and in response, Mike taps Yavimaya Coast and Waterlogged Grove to help activate Kinnan. He looks at the top 5, putting Wandering Archaic onto the battlefield. Then Myra's ability resolves, Sean opens an attraction, putting Kitty Coaster onto the battlefield. Then Windfall resolves, everyone discards their hand and draws 6. Sean plays a Bloodstained Mire for turn. He cracks it, pays a life, and fetches up a Volcanic Island onto the battlefield. He casts a Mana Crypt. He casts Rhystic Study. He moves to combat and attacks Zach with Myra. Zach takes it, and all through, Sean passes the turn to Zach. Mike untaps with Zach through Seedborn. During his upkeep, Zach wins his Mana Crypt roll. He draws and plays a Flooded Strand. He casts a Simic Signet, and Sean draws through Rhystic. Zach cracks his Flooded Strand, pays a life, and fetches up a Tropical Island onto the battlefield. He casts his commander, Thrasios, Triton Hero, and Sean draws through Rhystic again. Zach ships the turn. At the end of Zach's turn, Mike taps Yavimaya Coast and Waterlogged Grove to help activate Kinnan. He looks at the top 5 and fails to find. Mike untaps with Dante through Seedborn. Dante draws and plays a Sunbaked Canyon. He casts a Mana Vault. Rhystic triggers, and in response, Mike taps Yavimaya Coast and Waterlogged Grove to help activate Kinnan. Mike looks at the top 5 and puts a Phantasmal Image onto the battlefield. Image enters as a copy of Wandering Archaic. Then Sean draws through Rhystic. Dante casts Arcane Signet, and Sean draws again. He taps a Sunbaked Canyon to help cast Felwar Stone, and Sean draws. He casts Talisman of Creativity, and Sean draws again. He casts a Phantasmal Image, again not paying for Rhystic. Image enters as a copy of another Wandering Archaic. The table laughs at how ridiculous things have gotten, and Dante ends the turn. Mike draws and plays a Windswept Teeth. He cracks it and pays a life. In response, Sean sacrifices his Lotus Petal to help cast March of Swirling Mist, exiling 2 blue cards as an additional cost, targeting both Phantasmal Images, Wandering Archaic, and Kinnan. Myra, all 3 Wandering Archaics, and both Phantasmal Images trigger. The images are sacrificed, and then Mike and Dante both decline to copy with their Archaics. Myra's ability resolves, Sean opens an attraction, putting Ferris Wheel onto the battlefield. With March still on the stack, Mike taps Yavimaya Coast, Waterlogged Grove, and Kinnan through Moonsnare Prototype to hardcast Force of Negation, targeting March, paying for Rhystic. It resolves, countering and exiling March. Then Mike fetches up a Tropical Island onto the battlefield. He casts a Mana Vault, and Sean draws through Rhystic. Mike moves to combat and attacks Sean with Wandering Archaic and Seedborn Muse. Sean takes it, and Mike gives the turn to Sean. Mike untaps with Sean through Seedborn. During his upkeep, Sean wins his Mana Crypt roll. Sean draws, and in his first main phase, he rolls to visit his attractions. He rolls a 4, visiting Ferris Wheel and Hall of Mirrors. Hall of Mirrors fizzles, and Ferris Wheel targets Wandering Archaic. In response, Mike taps Yavimaya Coast to help activate Kinnan. He looks at the top 5, putting Void Winnower onto the battlefield. Then Ferris Wheel resolves and phases out Wandering Archaic. Sean plays an Exotic Orchard for turn. He attempts to cast a Felwar Stone, but is reminded that he can't even through Void Winnower. He casts Temporal Manipulation. Myra triggers, and in response, Zach casts Swan Song, targeting Temporal Manipulation. Rhystic triggers, and Sean draws. In response, Sean flashes in a Dualcaster Mage. Dualcaster enters and copies Temporal Manipulation. The copy resolves, Swan Song counters the original, and then Sean creates a 2/2 bird. Myra's trigger resolves, Sean opens an attraction, putting Costume Shop onto the battlefield. He moves to combat and attacks Dante with Myra. Dante takes it, and Sean moves to his extra turn. Mike untaps with Sean through Seedborn. During his upkeep, Sean wins his Mana Crypt roll. Sean draws, and in his first main phase, Sean rolls to visit his attractions. He rolls a 2, visiting Costume Shop, Drop Tower, and Kitty Coaster. Sean's creatures get +1/+0, Myra gains flying until the end of turn, Costume Shop fizzles, and then Wandering Archaic phases back in through Ferris Wheel. Sean plays an island and passes the turn. At the end of Sean's turn, Mike taps Yavimaya Coast to help activate Kinnan. He looks at the top 5, failing to find. Mike untaps with Zach through Seedborn. During his upkeep, Zach loses his Mana Crypt roll and takes 3 damage. He draws and plays a Polluted Delta. He tries to cast Lion's Eye Diamond, but is reminded that 0 is an even number through Void Winnower. With nothing else, Zach ships the turn. At the end of Zach's turn, Mike taps Yavimaya Coast to help activate Kinnan. He looks at the top 5, but fails to find. Mike untaps with Dante through Seedborn. During his draw step, he takes the damage through his Mana Vault. In his main phase, he casts Wheel of Fortune. Wandering Archaic triggers, and Mike decides not to copy. Rhystic triggers, and in response, Sean channels Ottawara Soaring City, targeting Void Winnower. In response, Mike taps his Yavimaya Coast to help activate Kinnan. He looks at the top 5, putting Consecrated Sphinx onto the battlefield. Then Ottawara bounces Void Winnower back to his hand. With Rhystic still in the stack, Sean activates Myra, exiling Solve the Equation and putting a midway counter onto Costume Shop. Sean then flashes in a Dress Down. It enters, and Sean draws. Mike, wanting his Consecrated Sphinx to draw him like 42 cards off of this wheel, channels his own Ottawara Soaring City, targeting Dress Down. In response, Zach cheekily casts Chain of Vapor, targeting Sean's Rhystic Study, paying the Rhystic tax. Rhystic gets bounced, and Sean sacrifices Exotic Orchard to copy Chain of Vapor, bouncing Consecrated Sphinx. Then Mike stops the chain. Then Ottawara bounces Dress Down, and Sean draws through Rhystic. Wheel resolves, and everyone discards their hand and draws 7. Dante plays a Command Tower for turn. He taps his Sunbaked Canyon to help cast Ranger Captain of Eos. It enters, and he fetches up an Esper Sentinel into his hand. He casts Esper Sentinel. Dante passes the turn to Mike. During his draw step, Mike takes the damage through his Mana Vault. He plays a Gaia's Cradle as his land for turn. He casts Mox Amber, paying for Esper. He casts a Felwar Stone. He casts Nezahal, Primal Tide. Mike ends his turn. Mike untaps with Sean through Seedborn. During his upkeep, Sean loses his Mana Crypt roll and takes 3 damage. Still in Sean's upkeep, Mike activates Kinnan, looking at the top 5 and putting Kozilek, the Great Distortion, onto the battlefield. Mike activates Kinnan again, looking at the top 5 and putting Nyx Bloom Ancient onto the battlefield. Things have just seriously gotten out of hand. Mike taps Gaia's Cradle for 18 green mana and then activates Grim Monolith's untap ability. In response, Dante taps Talisman of Creativity to help cast March of Swirling Mist, exiling a blue card targeting Kinnan and Nyx Bloom Ancient. Wandering Archaic and Nezahal trigger. Mike draws through Nezahal and then copies the spell through Archaic, phasing out Dualcaster Mage and Myra. Still in response to the march, Mike activates Grim Monolith's untap ability again. It resolves, and he demonstrates a loop of tapping and untapping Monolith through Nyx Bloom Ancient, creating infinite colorless mana. Mike activates Kinnan. He looks at the top 5, putting Clever Impersonator onto the battlefield. It enters as a copy of Thrasios. Mike then activates Kinnan 7 more times, putting Sphinx of the Second Sun, Phyrexian Metamorph, Jin-Gitaxias Progress Tyrant, Thrasios Triton Hero, Endurance, Hullbreaker Horror, and a Birds of Paradise onto the battlefield. Metamorph enters as a copy of Nyx Bloom Ancient, Clever Impersonator is sacrificed due to the legend rule, and then Endurance shuffles Mike's graveyard onto the bottom of his library. Still in Sean's upkeep, Mike activates Thrasios, scrying 1 and revealing a Pact of Negation, Mana Drain, Fierce Guardianship, Flusterstorm, Thorn of Amethyst, Springleaf Drum, Snap, Arcane Signet, Force of Will, and a Worldly Tutor into his hand. Still in response, Mike casts Worldly Tutor. Hullbreaker triggers, and Mike attempts to bounce Dante's Ranger Captain of Eos. In response, Dante activates Ranger Captain, sacrificing it. In response, Mike casts Snap, bouncing Endurance back to his hand, untapping 2 lands, including Gaia's Cradle. Mike then taps Cradle for 108 green. He activates Thrasios until he finds a Cyclonic Rift. He casts an overloaded Cyclonic Rift. It resolves, and Mike continues his reign of terror. With Ranger Captain's ability still in the stack, Mike presents a loop of activating Kinnan, putting Terrastodon onto the battlefield, destroying his opponent's lands, casting a spell to bounce Terrastodon with Hullbreaker, then discarding Hullbreaker to Nezahal, and in response to Nezahal's ability, he flashes in Endurance to shuffle Terrastodon back into his library. He does this until all of his opponent's lands are now elephants, and then overloads a Cyclonic Rift again to clear the board. Once the board is clear, Ranger Captain's ability resolves. Then Worldly Tutor resolves and Mike fails to find. In response to March, Mike activates Kozilek the Great Distortion, discarding Rhystic Study to finally counter March of Swirling Mist. Accepting his fate, Sean draws and ends his turn. Nezahal phases back in and Sean discards to hand size. Mike untaps with Zach through Seaborn. Zach draws and plays a Scalding Tarn. He casts a Mana Crypt. Zach, overwhelmed by Mike's board state, doesn't remember Jin-Gitaxias. Mana Crypt is countered through Jin-Gitaxias, and wanting no more of this game, Zach passes the turn to Dante. Mike untaps with Dante through Seedborn. Dante draws and waves the white flag, giving the turn to Mike. At the end of Dante's turn, Mike activates Kinnan until every creature from his library is on the battlefield. Mike draws and moves to combat. He attacks everyone with every creature he owns, and Mike wins the game. Alan draws and plays a City of Brass. He casts a Chrome Mox imprinting Assassin's Trophy. He taps the City of Brass to cast a Tinderwall. All set up, he passes the turn. Jay draws and plays a Bloodstained Mire. He cracks it, pays a life, and fetches up a Volcanic Island onto the battlefield. He casts a Mox Diamond, discarding Verdant Catacombs. He ships the turn to Travis. Travis draws and plays a Command Tower. He casts his commander, Rograk, son of Roga. He casts a Soul Ring. He casts a Lotus Petal. He gives the turn to Kevin. Kevin draws and plays an island. He casts a Mox Diamond, discarding a forest. He casts an Arcane Signet. He casts a Lotus Petal. He pays 2 life to cast Gitaxian Probe, targeting Jay. He looks at Jay's hand and draws a card. He passes. At the end of Kevin's turn, Alan casts a Worldly Tutor. In response, Jay casts Swan Song. Tutor is countered, and Alan creates a 2/2 bird. The turn moves to Alan. Alan draws and plays an Undergrowth Stadium. He sacrifices his Tinder Wall, adding 2 red. He taps the City of Brass to help cast his commander, Corvold, Vaker's King. Corvold enters, Alan sacrifices his bird, Corvold triggers, gets a counter, and Alan draws. He passes the turn. Jay draws and plays an Exotic Orchard. He casts Dockside Extortionist. It enters, and Jay creates 6 treasures. He casts his commander, Crom, Ludovic's Opus. He moves to Crombat and attacks Travis with Crom. Travis takes it, and Jay ships the turn. Travis draws and plays a Mana Confluence. He taps it to help cast his commander, Thrasios, Triton Hero. He casts a Training Grounds. Crom triggers, and Jay draws. In response, Kevin pays 2 life to cast Mental Misstep, countering Training Grounds. Jay passes the turn to Kevin. Kevin draws and plays a Misty Rainforest. He cracks it, pays a life, and fetches up a tropical island onto the battlefield. He casts his commander, Kinnan, Vonder Prodigy. He casts a Mystic Remora. Crom triggers, and Jay draws. Remora resolves, and Kevin ends his turn. Alan draws and plays a Spire Garden. He casts a Dark Confidant. He passes to Jay. Jay draws and plays a Spire of Industry. He taps it to help cast his commander, Timna the Weaver. He moves to combat and attacks Travis with Crom and Kevin with Dockside. He holds priority and casts Swords to Plowshares, targeting Kinnan. Kinnan is exiled and Kevin gains 2 life. Then they both take it, and in his second main phase, Jay pays 2 and draws 2 through Timna. Feeling good, Jay ends his turn. Travis draws and plays a Windswept Heath. He cracks it, pays a life, and fetches up a tropical island onto the battlefield. With nothing else, he ships the turn to Kevin. During his upkeep, Kevin pays to keep his Remora. He draws and cracks his Lotus Petal to help recast his commander, Kinnan. Kevin passes. During his upkeep, Alan reveals a Demonic Tutor through Dark Confidant. He draws and casts Diabolic Intent, sacrificing Dark Confidant as an additional cost. Corvold triggers, gets a counter, and Alan draws a card. He fetches up a card into his hand. He taps the City of Brass to cast Dockside Extortionist. Crom triggers, and Jay draws. Dockside enters, and in response, Travis taps his Mana Confluence to cast Chain of Vapor, targeting Corvold. Remora triggers, and Kevin draws. Corvold bounces, and Alan doesn't continue the chain. Dockside enters, and Alan creates 7 treasures. He casts Demonic Tutor. Mystic triggers, and Kevin draws. Alan fetches up a card into his hand and then gives the turn to Jay. Jay draws and moves to combat. He attacks Alan with Crom, Kevin with Timna, and Travis with Dockside. Travis blocks with Thrasios, they all take the rest, and then Jay gains 2 life. In his second main phase, he pays 2 life and draws 2 cards through Timna. He plays a Morphic Pool for turn. He casts Mnemonic Betrayal. In response, Travis activates Thrasios, scrying 1 and revealing a Gamble into his hand. In response, Alan casts Ad Nauseam. Remora triggers, and Kevin draws. In response, Jay casts Miscast, and Kevin draws again. With nothing else, Ad Nausea is countered, and Mnemonic Betrayal resolves. Each opponent then exiles their graveyards. Jay exiles Simian Spirit Guide from his hand, adding a red. He casts Demonic Tutor from exile. Remora triggers, and Kevin draws. He fetches up a card into his hand. He casts Underworld Breach, and Kevin draws from Remora. He casts Lion's Eye Diamond, and Kevin draws again. He cracks his LED, discards his hand, and adds 3 blue. He escapes Brain Freeze with all copies targeting himself, milling some of his library. He escapes Chain of Vapor, targeting his Dockside. Remora triggers and Kevin draws. Dockside bounces and he doesn't continue the chain. He escapes LED and Kevin draws again. He cracks it for 3 red. He escapes Dockside Extortionist. It enters and Jay creates 5 treasures. He escapes Brain Freeze and Kevin draws. He mills more of his library. He escapes Chain of Vapor, bouncing Dockside, and Kevin draws through Remora. He casts Dockside, creating 5 treasures. He escapes Grand Abolisher. It resolves, locking out opponents this turn. Jay casts Chain of Vapor from exile, bouncing Dockside. He recasts Dockside, creating 5 more treasures. He presents a loop of escaping LED, cracking it for blue, then escaping Brain Freeze, milling out his opponents. He passes, sacrificing Underworld Breach. One by one, each opponent attempts to draw from an empty library, loses, and Jay wins the game.